First year, the Hogwarts Express. Remus rubbed his scalp again, then his nose, which kept running. It had been bothering him since the last full moon when he had smashed it. He had a black eye as well, which was throbbing. Everyone at the new school would think he was a werewolf. Well, he was a werewolf. He stood with his parents in the huge ticket hall at King's Cross staring at two platform numbers. There was number 9 and number 10. I'm not running at anything, Remus said. Remus had only half believed his father when he'd explained how to access platform 9 and 3/4. His parents, who usually didn't have much money to spend on him, had been generous over the past month. Packages had started arriving for him, delivered by owls and containing books and clothes and oddments like quills and parchment. All these were things he would need for Hogwarts. Much of it had come from the second-hand supplies at his new school. As scared as he was to run into solid stone, Remus was willing to believe almost anything his father said. Lyle Lupin always took extra measures to be as kind as possible after his son had been bitten by a werewolf on behalf of one of his passionate and vocal political opinions. Lyle had been the only one at the Ministry of Magic to recognize signs of lycanthropy in Fenrir Greyback when he came in for questioning pretending to be a simple muggle tramp. Out of anger at everyone else's ignorance, Lyle had flown into a rage and said that every werewolf was a monster that deserved nothing but death. As punishment, Greyback had broken into the Lupin's home and attacked his son. Since a werewolf bite caused the person bitten to also become a werewolf, Lyle's views were forced to change. Remus was still scarred by the memory of a ferocious beast breaking into his bedroom. He had not had a peaceful night's sleep since. It had been 7 years ago, when he was only 4, and the memory was burned into his mind, never quite disappearing. Even with all his parents' kindness, Remus had never owned so many possessions before. Now they were all crammed into a battered charity shop suitcase which he had to hold in a very particular way so it didn't fall apart. He ran his hand across the bottom to make sure nothing was dropping out. "We'll come with you, Remus," said Lyle encouragingly as he took his son by the hand. They ran at the barrier at full pelt. Remus squeezed his eyes shut tight as he approached the metal turnstiles. But he didn't hit anything. The atmosphere changed, and he opened his eyes to find himself on a completely different platform, surrounded by wizards. The Hogwarts Express was huge, scarlet, and old-fashioned. Remus clutched his suitcase with both hands, running his tongue across his teeth out of habit. He was paranoid they would still be pointy fangs. There were lots of other children, his own age and older, some of them crying as they were hugged and kissed by their parents. He felt suddenly nauseous, the way he did after transformations, and thought it best to hurry and get on the train. Inside he couldn't reach the luggage rack to stow away his things, so he chose an empty carriage and set the suitcase on the seat beside him. He watched the people on the platform through the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass to cool down. He wondered if any others came from half-blood families. He wondered if any of them had episodes like he did. He didn't think so, none of them seemed to have scars. He couldn't be sure, because a lot of them were wearing long dark robes and tall pointed hats. Some had owls or cats carried in baskets. He saw one girl with a tiny lizard perched on her shoulder. Remus grew even more nervous, his stomach roiling as he realized that despite everything his family and Dumbledore had said about being among his own kind, he would always have a disability that nobody else did. Just then, he noticed someone staring back at him from the platform. It was another boy, his own age. He was tall and slim. He had dark hair that reached his shoulders. Seeing Remus staring, the other boy acquired a show-offish expression and yelled, "What are you looking at?" Remus stuck his tongue out, and pulled an ugly face. The other boy smirked slightly, then gave an approving grin. "Sirius, come here at once." A severe-looking witch with the same angular eyebrows yanked her son away from the window. The boy's mouth opened in a groan, but he obeyed, and they disappeared further up the platform. Remus sat back in his leather seat inside. He was always extra hungry the day after transforming, so he hoped the journey wasn't too long. He could hear shrieking and laughter and owls hooting. He felt locked away from everyone else. He worried once he got to Hogwarts they'd force him to sleep alone in the dungeon since he was a werewolf. There was a sudden rap at the door, a short, cheerful tune, and it opened once more. A friendly-faced boy with messy dark hair and large round glasses entered, grinning. He held out a hand to Remus. "First year?" "Me too, I'm James." He nodded his head back to a short boy who had followed him in. "This is Peter." Remus shook James' hand. It felt easy and comfortable. For the first time, the tight coil in his stomach began to unwind. "Remus, can we sit here? Everywhere else is full and Peter's getting train sick." "I am not," Peter murmured, taking a seat opposite Remus, eyeing him warily. He did look a bit green. He rubbed his hands together in his lap and stared at the floor. "Know what house you'll be in?" James asked Remus, looking into his eyes boldly. Remus shook his head. "What were your parents in?" James persisted. He clearly liked to talk. "Did they go to Hogwarts?" Remus nodded, slowly. "My dad did. He was in Gryffindor." Peter looked up suddenly. "You're a half-blood." Remus shrugged. "As if it matters." James threw the boy next to him a chastising look. The door opened yet again. It was the boy who'd yelled to him in the station. He glanced about, furtively. "None of you are related to me, are you?" he asked. "Don't think so." James replied, grinning again. "I'm James Potter." He held out a hand again. The other boy shook it, easily. "Oh good, a Potter. Dad told me not to talk to you." He sat down next to Remus, acquiring a similar grin to James. Sirius Black. That was how a group of close friends assembled for the first time. First year, the sorting. Remus was standing in an enormous stone hall, the size of a cathedral. It was full of students in black robes and ties. The hall was lit by candles. Not just any candles, these candles were floating. When he looked up he almost yelled. There was no ceiling, just the vast night sky hanging above them, pendulous grey clouds and glittering stars. Kids, including a red-haired girl, who Remus assumed must have had muggle parents, seemed especially interested. Remus had on his uniform now, and felt a little better since it hid his scrapes. All the students sat at long banquet tables under their house banners. James had excitedly explained the differences between each house, much to the chagrin of Sirius and Peter, both of whom were convinced they'd end up in the wrong place. Remus didn't know whether to be nervous or not, and wondered if being a werewolf would affect his position. Professor McGonagall, a thin, stern-faced witch who had led all of the first years into the hall, was standing beside a stool, holding a mangy brown hat. This was the test James had told them about. They had to put on the hat, then somehow they would each be sorted into one of the houses. Remus looked up at each of the banners. He thought he might end up in Ravenclaw. He liked reading and being clever. He didn't think much of the one with the badger. They weren't exactly exciting animals, especially compared to lions. He liked the color red, too, if it came down to picking a type. James and Peter were also both keen on Gryffindor, and seeing as they were the ones who'd been the most friendly so far, he wouldn't mind going with them. Sirius Black was the first of their group to go, and he looked queasy as he approached the stool. There was some noise from the Slytherin table. Some of the older students were calling to him. Two girls, one with masses of dark curls and one with light blonde hair and the same high cheekbones, waved at Sirius, who was now trembling on the stool. The hall was quiet for a few moments as the hat came to rest on Black's head. Then the hat screeched, Gryffindor. A few moments of stunned silence before the clapping came this time. McGonagall gently lifted the hat from Sirius' head and gave him a begrudging smile. He looked utterly horrified, casting a desperate look at the Slytherin table, where the two girls started heckling and hissing. He got up and walked slowly over to the Gryffindors, where he was the first new student to take his place under the red and gold banners. The sorting continued. The red-haired muggle-born who was named Lily Evans was also placed in Gryffindor, and sat smiling next to a miserable-looking Sirius. When it was finally his turn, Remus pushed to the front, doing his best to ignore the eyes watching him. He sat on the stool with McGonagall looking at him through her spectacles. She lowered the hat over his eyes. Everything went dark. The peace and quiet was a relief. A soft voice spoke in his ear. It was the hat. Remus tried not to cringe as it purred. What shall we do with you? Perhaps Ravenclaw? There's a good brain in here. But then, the hat considered, you might go further, much further, if we put you in Gryffindor. Remus ripped the hat from his head as soon as it had sorted him, not waiting for McGonagall to remove it. He hurried over to the Gryffindor table, barely registering the cheering and clapping as he passed. He sat opposite Lily and Sirius. Lily shot him a pleased smile. By the time the PS came around, Remus had somewhat recovered from his surprise and delight and was able to watch with some interest as the small, pudgy Peter hurried towards the sorting hat. The boy had a perpetually nervous, twitchy look that made him look good to beat up. Remus was surprised that James, who was the polar opposite of Peter, relaxed, brimming with confidence, was being so kind to someone like him. The hat took a very long time over Peter. Even the teacher seemed to be getting nervous, as the minutes ticked by. Finally, he was sorted into Gryffindor. Then much more quickly so was James, who strode over to the table with a huge grin on his face. How great is that? He addressed the three other boys. We all made it. Sirius groaned, his head in his arms on the table. Speak for yourself, he replied, slightly muffled. My father's going to kill me. I can't believe it, Peter kept saying, eyes wide. Though he clearly got what he wanted, he kept wringing his hands and shooting looks over his shoulder as if someone might come over and ask him to try again. McGonagall did come over, but she only placed a bony hand on Remus' shoulder. Mr. Lupin, she said, quietly, but not so quietly that the other boys couldn't hear. If you would come to my office after dinner. It's next to the Gryffindor common room, one of the prefects can show you. Remus nodded, mute, and she left. What was that about? James asked. McGonagall wants to see you already. Even Sirius looked up now, curious. Remus shrugged, as if he didn't know either, although he had a pretty good idea. Sirius was looking at his cuts and bruises again. Fortunately, the food appeared at that moment, distracting everyone. And it really had appeared the previously empty places were suddenly laden with a feast. Golden roasted chickens, piles of crispy roast potatoes, plates of steaming carrots, peas swimming in butter, and an enormous jug of rich dark gravy. If the food was going to be like this all the time, then Remus wondered if he could even forget being a werewolf. At least during the moments when that was possible. He paid close attention as one of the Gryffindor prefects, who introduced himself as Frank Longbottom, led the first years to their common room in one of the towers. Remus hated getting lost, and tried hard to cement the journey into his mind as they went. He made a mental note of the size and shape of every door they entered, each portrait they passed, and which staircases moved. He was so tired and full of good food and the excitement of making new friends that even the moving portraits and staircases didn't seem out of place. Once they reached the right corridor, Remus saw McGonagall's office, marked with a neat brass plaque, and decided to get the meeting over with. He paused outside the door and was just about to knock when James appeared. Want us to wait for you, mate? Why? Remus asked, eyeing the dark-haired boy suspiciously. James shrugged. So you don't end up on your own. Remus stared at him for a moment, not used to having friends. Thanks. He knocked. Enter. A voice came from within. Remus pushed open the door. The office was small, with a neat fireplace and rows of books against one wall. McGonagall sat behind an immaculately tidy desk. She smiled thinly and motioned for Remus to sit down in the chair opposite. He did, sniffing and rubbing his nose. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Lupin, the teacher said in a reedy Scottish accent. Her hair was grey, pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore deep green robes secured with a golden clasp shaped like a lion's head. I'm even more pleased to have you in Gryffindor House of which I am the head. Remus didn't say anything. He felt too shy and awkward. Your father was in Ravenclaw, you know. McGonagall told him. Anyway, I thought it best to speak with you as soon as possible about your condition. Her voice lowered, and I feel it is my duty to let you know that people with your particular problem do face some prejudice. It may be prudent for you to exercise caution. I wasn't going to tell anyone, Remus replied. As if he would want anyone to know. Well, quite. McGonagall nodded. That brings me to my next point. Arrangements have been made for the full moon which next occurs this Sunday, I believe. If you could report to me after dinner, I shall show you where to go. Perhaps you could tell your friends that you are visiting someone at home. Remus rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed. Yet. Can I go now? Professor McGonagall nodded, frowning slightly. Outside, Remus found James still standing there, waiting. He smiled at Remus. You missed Longbottom giving us the password. Didn't want you stuck out here all night. Men. James led him to the end of the corridor, where hung a painting of a voluptuous woman wearing pink. Glitter shins. James said, and the portrait moved away, swinging out like a door. They entered the common room. The Gryffindor common room was warm, comfortable and cozy. There were huge squashy-looking sofas and armchairs, a thick maroon rug in front of the blazing fire, and even more paintings adorning the walls. We're up here, James said, leading Remus to a winding staircase in one corner. At the top, there was another door which opened into a bedroom. There were 4 beds, all enormous, hung with thick red velvet curtains with gold-trimmed tassels. There was another fireplace, and each boy had a heavy mahogany trunk and set of shelves by their beds. Remus saw his sad little suitcase propped up against one of the trunks. He moved over, assuming it was his bed. Peter was rifling through his own things, pulling out clothes, magazines, and books, making a terrible mess. I can't find my wand, he wailed. Mum made me pack it so I wouldn't lose it on the train, but it's not here. Peter, James grinned, your mum asked me to look after it, remember? James and Peter, Remus had learned since the train, had grown up as neighbors and knew each other well. The two boys couldn't be any more different, and Remus still didn't understand why James didn't want to beat Peter up. Sirius was sitting on his bed, his trunk still packed. Cheer up, mate, James said, going to sit next to him. You didn't want to be in Slytherin anyway, did you? 500 years, Sirius replied, stonily. Every black at Hogwarts has been sorted into Slytherin for 500 years. Well, it's about time someone tried to be different, James slapped him on the back jovially. Remus opened his trunk. Inside there was a large pewter cauldron, another item Dumbledore had gotten from the second-hand bin. There was also a long thin box at the bottom, with a note on top. He unfolded the note and stared at the elaborate swirly script for a long time, trying to make sense of it. He only recognized the word father, and guessed that it was also from Dumbledore, but had belonged to his father as a boy. Opening it eagerly, he found a long, polished stick. It was a wand. He hadn't thought about wands yet, but he took it in his hand and squeezed the wood firmly. It was warm to the touch, like his own flesh, supple as he turned it in his hands. It felt good. Sirius had finally started to unpack, pulling book after book out of his trunk. Those that didn't fit on his shelf he stacked beside his bed. James stared, having just finished pinning a poster next to his own bed. It showed a lot of little people zooming about on broomsticks, throwing balls to each other. Remus wasn't very good at sports. You know, James said to Sirius, still stacking books, there is a library here. Sirius smirked. I know, but these are mostly Muggle books. My uncle Alphard left them to me, and Mum would set them all on fire if I left them at home. Remus' ears pricked at that. What was wrong with Muggle books? Not that he had any with him. He didn't think about it for too long though, because all at once, his exhaustion caught up with him and a vague dizziness he often felt the week before a full moon. He fell onto his bed behind the curtains. You'd think he'd try harder to make friends, Peter whispered loudly to the other two boys. Especially if he's only a half-blood. Are you sure the hat wasn't supposed to put you in Slytherin? Sirius snapped, shutting him up. Remus was thankful for that. First year, full moon. As the week went by, Remus realized his roommates were what could be called well-bred. Sirius and James especially seemed to come from money. He could tell from the way they talked about their homes, as well as the way they spoke every vowel and consonant clearly pronounced. Remus enjoyed the liberty at Hogwarts. It seemed there was nowhere students couldn't go, and he was determined to investigate every inch. They'd been provided with maps to help them find their classrooms, but Remus found his sorely lacking and overly simplified. It did not list, for example, a secret passageway he had found which led from the dungeons to the first floor girls' loose. He had no idea why on earth anyone would need to get between the two, and the first time he used it he was accosted by a particularly irritating ghost who squirted him with hand soap. It would also have been helpful, Remus reasoned, to animate the map in the same way the paintings were, then at least you could keep track of the moving staircases. He was sure one of the rooms moved as well, it never seemed to be in quite the same place. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled around, Remus was dreading Monday, which would not only be the first day after the full moon, but the first day of lessons. After dinner which Remus spent alone, a few seats away from Sirius, James, and Peter, he made his way quickly to McGonagall's office. She was waiting for him, along with the school nurse, who he'd been introduced to already. She was a kind, pleasant sort of woman, if a little fussy. Good evening, Mr. Lupin, McGonagall said and smiled. Thank you for being so prompt. Come along. To Remus' relief, the two women led him not to the dungeons, as he'd thought they would, but outside the castle, towards a large twisted tree. The Whomping Willow was a recent addition to the grounds. Dumbledore had explained in his speech at the beginning of the year that it had been donated by an ex-pupil. Remus thought that whoever had donated it must have really hated the school, because the tree was not only terrifying in every aspect, but mindlessly violent. As they approached, Professor McGonagall did something so incredible that Remus almost cried in shock. She seemed to vanish, shrinking down suddenly, until she was no longer there at all. In her place was a sleek yellow-eyed tabby cat. Madame Pomfrey gave no sign that she was surprised, as the cat ran towards the tree, which was flailing its branches like a child having a tantrum. The cat was able to run right up to the trunk of the tree, escaping injury, and pressed a paw against one of the knots in the bark. The tree fell instantly still. Remus and Madame Pomfrey then walked into a hollow beneath the tree which Remus hadn't noticed before. Inside, McGonagall was waiting for them, a witch again. The passageway was dimly lit by torches giving off a greenish glow, and at the very end was a door. This opened into a small cottage, which looked long abandoned. The windows were boarded up and the doors bolted. Here we are. McGonagall tried to sound pleasant in the grim place. Now I hope you understand that we cannot stay with you, but would you like Madame Pomfrey to wait outside until the transformation is complete? Remus shrugged, uncomfortable. But then, it was getting to that point in the evening when everything made him uncomfortable. His hair itched, his skin felt too tight, his temperature rose. I'll be okay. How do I get back in the morning? I'll pop by as soon as the sun rises, Madame Pomfrey assured him. Patch you up and have you off to your lessons before anyone even notices you're gone. She smiled, but her eyes looked sad. You'd better go, Remus said, quickly, retreating into the bare room. There was a cot against one wall with clean sheets. It looked as though it had been put there for him. The two women left, locking the door heavily behind him. He heard McGonagall muttering again and wondered what sort of spell she was placing on the house. Whatever they were, they would probably be better than the awful silver plating he'd had to use at home. He sat on the bed for a moment, then got up again restlessly. He paced the room. Sometimes it felt as though the wolf crept into his mind before it got hold of his body, and as darkness fell outside his senses became sharper. The hot swell of hunger started in his belly. Remus removed his clothes quickly, not wanting to rip them. A throb started up in his joints and he lay down on the bed. This was the worst part. His heartbeat was thudding in his ears, and he could swear he heard his tendons creaking as they stretched, his bones and teeth grinding against each other as they elongated, his skull splitting and reshaping. He groaned and hissed until the pain grew too much, then he screamed. He could only hope he was far enough from the school that no one could hear him. He estimated it took about 20 minutes though he'd never actually timed it. Things became foggy afterwards. He couldn't always remember what happened once he became a wolf. That first night at Hogwarts was a blur, and he woke up with less injuries than usual. He suspected he had sniffed around the unfamiliar territory, testing its boundaries. He must have tried to throw himself at the doors or windows at some point, because he had a patchwork of bruises down his left side for days afterwards. Transforming back was just as unpleasant, a crushing, tightening feeling all over which left him breathless and aching. He wiped the tears from his eyes and crawled into the cot, grateful for a quiet hour of sleep before the sun rose completely. Madame Pomfrey returned, as promised. She lay her cool hands on his brow, she said, as he opened his sleepy eyes. It's madness, thinking you can start a full school day like this. You're exhausted. She made him drink something before letting him get up. It was cold and metallic, but he felt better afterwards. He hurried up to Gryffindor Tower to get his uniform on as fast as possible. He didn't want to miss breakfast. He was famished. Where were you? James accosted him as soon as he burst into their room. The three other boys were all up and dressed, looking immaculate apart from James' hair, which always stuck up at the back. Nowhere. Remus pushed past to get to his things. Are you okay? Sirius asked, glancing away from the mirror where he was smoothing down his own hair. Yeah, James added, watching Remus carefully. You look a bit weird. Remus didn't know what to say, so he scowled at them. It's none of your business. We're just being nice, Peter said, hands on his hips. The three of them stared at Remus, who was about to remove his t-shirt when he remembered his wounds. What? He growled. Are you all gonna watch me get dressed? He marched into the bathroom with his clothes and slammed the door. After a few moments he heard Peter whining that he was hungry and they all left. First year, potions. By the end of his first week of lessons, Remus had gotten 10 house points, learnt one spell, and gained another cut, this time on his chin. The first few lessons were okay, they were introductory, and while the Muggle-born girl Lily Evans spent each class furiously scribbling down pages and pages of notes, nobody else seemed too bothered. They were set a few simple pieces of homework, which Remus didn't have trouble getting through quickly. Charms was the most exciting. The tiny professor enchanted a pile of pine cones to whiz around the room, to everyone's delight. After a few goes at the spell themselves, Lily had levitated her pine cone at least 3 feet in the air, and Sirius got his to spin like a top until it got out of control and smashed the window. James, Peter, and Remus had less luck, but Remus was sure his had jumped once or twice. Transfiguration was just as interesting, but much more serious, as it was led by Professor McGonagall. There would be no practical work at all during the first week, she explained, but she would be setting lots of homework in order to gauge their ability levels. History of magic was dire, and the less said about it the better. Remus struggled not to fall asleep as the ghostly Professor Binns floated up and down the aisles, reeling off dates and names of battles. He too set homework, 2 chapters of reading from the set text. Sirius rolled his eyes at this and muttered to James, surely everyone's already finished A History of Magic when they were kids. James nodded, yawning. Remus decided then to read it as fast as possible. He'd been looking forward to potions, wondering if he'd see anything blow up. Unfortunately, they had to share the class with the Slytherin first years. The professor leading potions was overly cheerful with a big white mustache and took almost half an hour just to read the register. Black, Sirius, aha, there you are. Quite surprised at the sorting, my boy, quite surprised. I've had every one of the blacks in my house since I started teaching. Shan't take it personally, young Sirius, but I shall be expecting great things. Sirius looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him up. Professor Slughorn continued calling out names. A Potter and a Pettigrew, well, along with Mr. Black here, this class has quite the pedigree, hey? Let me see. Lupin. I knew your father, not one of mine, but a great duelist. Nasty business. Remus blinked. He wondered if Slughorn knew he was a werewolf. Finally Slughorn wanted to get them started on practical work. Best thing is to just get stuck in. He smiled. Now, if we all work to a cauldron, you can. I'll take it in turns to follow the steps. Everyone clamored to pair up. James, Sirius, and Peter immediately claimed the cauldron at the very back of the room. Remus decided he would wait until everyone had grouped off and see if he could get away with just hovering at the back for the rest of the lesson. Remus. You can join us. Lily grabbed his wrist and pulled him over to a cauldron she was sharing with Severus Snape, her greasy long-nosed friend who resembled an ill-tempered bat. Lily chattered away, laying out all the ingredients and heating the cauldron carefully. She was looking at Severus' book, which already had notes scribbled all over the margins. Here are the desiccated snail eye stems. Lily shook a tiny jar. I think we need a quarter of an ounce. You can be fairly liberal with them, Lily, they don't add much overall, Severus said quietly. He sounded bored. Lily measured them out anyway and tipped them into the bubbling brew. She stirred for 5 minutes, taking instruction from Severus on how fast to go and in which direction. Then it was Remus' turn. Lily gave him the book. He stared at the page, but a wave of nausea crashed over him. Sometimes this happened after his transformations. His vision blurred and he could barely focus on the words. He could see that they were instructions, he could make out maybe half the letters. Every time he thought he had a grasp on it, the letters seemed to shift on the page and he was lost all over again. His cheeks grew hot and he felt even more sick. He shrugged, looking away. Oh hurry up, Severus snapped. It's not difficult. You're so rude, Sev. Lily turned red. The book's covered in your notes, no wonder he can't find his place. Here. She flipped open her own potions book. But it was no good. Remus shrugged. Why don't you do it, if you're so clever? He glared at Severus. Oh, Merlin. Severus' lips curled. You can't read, can you? I mean, even Muggle schools teach that, surely. I'm not Muggle-born, said Remus hotly. I'm a half-blood, and I have a migraine. Lily looked hurt. What's wrong with being Muggle-born? She asked, and the smug dark-haired boy got very quiet. When his head cleared and Severus wasn't looking, Remus scribbled, I am a long-nosed git, in the boy's potions book. In one of the notes, he noticed a spell that said, obfuscate, obscures objects temporarily. Must wave wand in little circles. James, Sirius, and Peter were waiting for Remus outside after the lesson was finished, despite him having snapped at them earlier. He felt a prick of appreciation. What did you write in Severus Snape's book? Asked James, glancing at Lily and Severus curiously. When Remus told him, he grinned and said, bloody brilliant, approvingly. Sirius grinned. Come in, it's dinner soon, are you hungry? Just then, Severus turned around, and declared loudly to the room at large. You must be starving, Remus. After your transformation into an illegal animagus. First year, revenge. So, James said on Sunday evening, how are we going to get them back? Get who back? Peter asked without looking up, searching through his notes for something. They were in the Gryffindor common room, trying to do their homework for McGonagall. 14 inches on the basic laws of transfiguration. Sirius and James had finished theirs, Peter was at least 6 inches in, and Remus hadn't started. The Slytherins, James hissed. Keep up, Peter. Not all of the Slytherins. Peter asked, worried. Only Snape, right? Although the teachers had made it clear that Remus Lupin was not, in fact, an illegal animagus, rumors and suspicions were still spreading around the school about his disappearance and bruises, thanks to Snape. The extra attention when he had a real secret was stressful. Not to mention, the fact that Remus didn't know exactly what the slimy Snape did know or how. Sirius appeared from under the desk they were sharing, and presented a piece of parchment. This what you were looking for? Thanks. Peter grabbed it, relieved. I've nearly finished. Have you done it, Remus? Sirius looked over. Remus had opened his book, but hadn't so much as looked at it. He'd considered cloistering himself away in the library one evening and trying to read it properly. His head was aching badly from banging it when he was a wolf. However, the opportunity hadn't presented itself, and if he was honest, he just didn't want to. Ever since the potions lesson, the 4 boys had become real friends, and Remus wanted to be with them. Nair, he shrugged in response. Got a headache. You can copy mine if you want. James pushed his homework across the desk. Remus circled back to the original subject. We could put itching powder from Zonkos in their beds, he offered. A cousin had done that to him once. He had a rash for a full week, and on the night of the full moon had torn at his skin more than usual. Or on their clothes, if we could figure out who does the laundry, anyway. This had been a matter of great concern to Remus. Their dirty laundry appeared to just vanish and then resurface, cleaned, and folded in their trunks. He'd never caught anyone else in their room, and Q1DNT understand it at all. I like it, James replied, chewing his quill. Anyone got any itching powder, though? The 3 boys shook their heads. Could order some from Zonkos, Sirius put in. If you let me borrow your owl, James, Mum confiscated mine after the sorting. I suppose, James said. Wish we could do it sooner, though. You know, strike while the iron is hot. We don't need to buy itching powder, Remus said, suddenly, having a brainwave. Do you reckon they have rose hips in the greenhouse? Yep, Peter said, head still bowed over his homework. For healing potions arthritis, I think. The hairs inside make you itch really badly, Remus explained excitedly. My mum, she grows them, and when I got in trouble she made me seed them. His fingertips itched just thinking about it. Good idea. Sirius grinned. You're so smart you could be a professor. Next break, we'll go and get a load of them. Then we can seed them with gloves on and put them in the Slytherin's bed sheets. Excellent. How are we going to get into the Slytherin dorms? Peter asked, finally finishing his work. Leave that to me. James smirked. Getting the rose hips was easy. They sent Peter, who was small and good at going unseen. He crept into the greenhouse during morning break and returned red-faced and gleeful, with a jar full of rose hips under his cloak. Then they all locked themselves away in their shared bathroom to seed all the buds. Under Remus' close instruction, they all wore their heavy dragon hide gloves to do this, taking extra care not to touch the seeds or find little hairs. I can't wait to see the looks on their faces, Sirius was laughing, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to James. Remus watched, sitting on the edge of the bathtub while James and Sirius' 2 dark heads bowed over the work. They had so much in common being raised. As purebloods, growing up wealthy, both being mad about Quidditch. In addition, it was clear that after only 3 weeks James and Sirius had managed to secure a reputation as joint kings of the first years. Everyone listened to them when they spoke. Everyone laughed when they were funny. No one even got annoyed if they lost house points. I still don't know how we're going to get into the Slytherin dorms, even Peter isn't that sneaky. Sirius glanced at James. He'd been trying to get him to reveal his plan ever since his bespectacled friend had mentioned it. Let me worry about that, was all James said. The seeds and hairs were then decanted into another jar, while the boys ended up eating the leftover rose hips over the course of the week. It was Tuesday evening when they finally had their chance. James decided that they would have to do it before everyone went to bed. He also decided they ought to go to the Slytherin dorm separately, to avoid being seen together and discovered. Remus personally thought this was overkill, but went along with it, not wanting to ruin the other boys' fun. They ate dinner much more quickly than usual that evening, before getting up from the table one at a time and leaving the hall. Peter looked so nervous Remus thought he might panic at the last minute and give them all away. He made sure to stay close to the smaller boy, just in case he had to cover his mouth or pull him back at some point. Sirius and James went first, heading towards the girls' loo on the second floor which Remus had told them led to the dungeons. He'd thought about keeping that particular passageway to himself, but as he'd already found a few other good hiding places by then, reasoned that letting them know about this one wouldn't hurt. After all, how often would he want to get to the dungeons? The ghost who lived in the toilets was fortunately in a quiet mood, though Remus could hear her sobbing softly in the last stall. Lead the way then, Lupin. James gestured grandly, once Remus and Peter arrived. Sirius grabbed his arm. Wait, show us what you're planning, first. Oh, okay then, here, hold this. James thrust the jar of rose hip seeds into Sirius' hands, pulling back his robes. He produced a long, voluminous cloak, woven from the strangest looking fabric Remus had ever seen, silvery grey and shimmery. No, Sirius gaped. You haven't, Potter, you bloody haven't. James was grinning so broadly now that Remus thought his face might split in two. James winked at them all, then, with a flourish, swept the cloak over his head, so it covered him top to toe. He vanished. You Gemma-git. Sirius hooped, how come you never told me? You never told me, either. Peter squeaked. And I've known you forever. Where did you get it? James pulled the hood of the cloak down, so that his head appeared to float in midair. It made Remus a bit queasy. Been in the family for years, he said, triumphantly. Dad let me bring it, as long as I don't tell Mum. Lucky crap, said Sirius, grabbing for some of the invisible material and rubbing it between his fingers. My parents would do anything for an invisibility cloak. I reckon we can all fit under it. James demonstrated, pulling it apart and raising his arms like a bat. Come in, let's all get nice and cozy. They all shuffled underneath the cloak, then tried waddling up and down the room a few times until they were able to walk comfortably together. Finally, trying not to giggle or whisper too much, the 4 invisible boys made their way to the dungeons. Remus showed them which tiles to tap in order for the floor to open up in the third stall from the left. How'd you find this, Remus? James whispered. It's genius. You come out behind one of the rugs they hang on the walls, in the dungeons, Remus replied. I just looked behind it. Do you mean a tapestry? Peter asked. Right. I wasn't raised rich, Remus snapped at the smaller boy, who, for some reason, tended to annoy him. Shut up, Sirius agreed. Remus felt a sharp kick hit the back of his ankle. Oi, he hissed. Sorry. Sirius yelped. Meant to get Pete, not you. Be quiet, all of you, James said. We're almost there. They waited quietly on their side of the tapestry, listening for footsteps in the corridor outside. Once James was satisfied that it was quiet, they all clambered out of the passage. The dungeons were cool, dimly lit and cavernous. There was a strange dripping sound coming from somewhere, perhaps the pipes. Where's the entrance? Sirius murmured. Behind that wall. Remus pointed, hoping they could see where he was aiming. It was a plain brick wall. How'd you know? I've seen them go in before, Remus said, hurriedly. He wasn't going to tell them that he knew there were 200 Slytherins on the other side because the scent of their blood and magic was so strong he could almost taste it. Do you know the password? No. Great. It's not curfew yet, let's just wait. So they did, rather uncomfortably. Though the corridor was dank, it was unnecessarily warm underneath the cloak, especially with all 4 of them so close together. Fortunately, 2 7th years came hurrying through in the next few minutes. Unfortunately, Sirius knew them. Let's see the ring again, Bella. Narcissa Black pleaded with her elder sister. Remus felt Sirius stiffen, pressing himself backwards into the wall. Bellatrix screamed, extending a long, ivory arm. On her bony finger was an enormous, ugly silver and emerald engagement ring, which she'd been flashing about since the start of term. Everyone in the school knew that she would be marrying Rodolphus Lestrange, some wizard politician, as soon as she completed her newts. Sirius had to go to the wedding. Narcissa squealed when she saw it, though she'd probably seen it more than anyone else. Gorgeous, she gushed. Oh, I can't wait to get married. Wait your turn, Bellatrix replied, with a voice like nails on a chalkboard. Once Lucius has a better position with the ministry, I'm sure Mummy and Daddy will agree to the match. The 2 young women were standing before the brick wall now. They didn't look alike at all. Bellatrix was the taller of the 2 with black curly hair. She looked more like Sirius, with the same bone structure. Her sister was fair with long blonde hair and more petite. Mundus sanguine, Bellatrix yelled. The wall slid aside to let them in, and the 4 boys hurried after, as fast as possible before it closed. Not for the first time since he had been at Hogwarts, Remus was truly glad he had been placed in Gryffindor. The differences between their warm, comfortable common room and that of the Slytherins was stark. It was built like an enormous banquet hall, rather than a sitting room. The walls were richly decorated with more elegant tapestries, the fireplace was huge and ornately carved, and a ghoulish green pallor hung over everything. More than that, the place felt somehow wicked. Remus tried not to shudder. The other boys seemed as uneasy as he was, and they all froze until James prodded them forward, up a flight of stairs which they all hoped led to the boys' dormitories. On their way they passed Severus, sitting alone in a corner, hunched over his potions textbook. At the top of the stairs, they entered the first open door which was, thankfully, a bedroom. James threw off the cloak. Keep a lookout, Deputy, he said, hurrying into the room. Reckon one of these is Snape's bed. This one might be. Sirius pointed. Sheets look breezy enough. All 4 boys snickered. Quick then, lads, gloves on, James whispered, unscrewing the jar. Remus and Sirius pulled on a dragonhide glove each, grabbed a handful of seeds and scattered them underneath the bedclothes. They'll see them, James said, distressed. It was true, the bright red little seeds stood out clearly against the white sheets, even in the dark. Well, they'll still get it on them trying to brush them out, Sirius offered. Hang on, Remus pulled out his wand, bit his lip and waved it gingerly over the bed he had just scattered with seeds. Obfuscate, he whispered. And just like that, the seeds were gone. Well, he knew they were still there, but no one would be able to see them now. Blimey. James stared. How'd you do that? Flitwick hasn't taught us that charm yet, has he? Was it in the reading? No, Remus shrugged. I saw it written in Snape's potion book. Sirius and James immediately attempted it themselves, over the seeds. It Didn't work the first time, or the second, but after the third, James had managed to vanish most of his. You'd better do it, Lupin, or we'll be here all night, James decided. Yes, please hurry up. Peter hissed from the doorway, white with fear. Sirius tried a few more times before giving up and letting Remus take over. You're going to show me exactly how to do that as soon as we're back on neutral territory, he said. Next room, James announced, pulling them back to the entranceway. Do we have to? Peter asked, hopping from foot to foot. Isn't that enough? Not even close. Sirius laughed, tossing his head. What if we haven't even got Snape's bed yet? We have to get them all, Peter. Are you with us or not? We have to get all the boys, anyway, James said, as they entered the next bedroom. I don't fancy our chances getting into the girls. Remember what happened to Dirk Cresswell last week. They worked quickly and managed to get every single boys' room, including the last one, which had 3 sleeping students in its 6th years. Even Sirius had begged off going in there, but Remus was giddy with the excitement of the prank now, and threw on the invisibility cloak to go in himself. He did so and scattered the rose hips over the pillows of the sleeping boys. By the time they finished, it was getting late and more Slytherins were heading upstairs for bed. Barely able to contain their glee, the 4 Gryffindors hid under the cloak and slowly crept back down the stairs. They flattened themselves against the wall anytime someone was coming, then through the enormous stately common room and out through the wall they'd come in. As James had instructed, they all kept as quiet as possible until they were within spitting distance of Gryffindor Tower, and it was finally safe to remove the cloak once more. Wittershins. They all chanted at the fat lady, who swung open for them. It was bliss to be back in the warm, bright Gryffindor common room. They threw themselves into the nearest available sofa, grinning inanely at each other. Frank Longbottom called to them from his desk, where he was tidying up revision notes. Cutting it fine, lads, been somewhere interesting. Peter looked uncertain, but James just waved a hand. Library, obviously. Frank shook his head, though he was smiling. I'm sure I'll hear about it soon enough. I wish I could be there when it all kicks off. Sirius whispered, his eyes shining with joy. And I wish even more we could have got my cousins. It's just the beginning, Sirius mate, James said, slapping the other boy's knee. Between the 4 of us I reckon we could go even bigger next time. Excellent first mission, men. Peter whimpered, first mission. First year, Marauders. The next morning James and Sirius could barely contain their excitement and hurried their dorm mates down to breakfast before any of the other Gryffindors. They were the first students to reach the Great Hall, other than a few Ravenclaws bent over their new revision books with huge mugs of hot pumpkin juice. Perfect. Sirius beamed at the empty benches. Front row seats. Bet no one shows up for hours, Peter groaned, half asleep, propped up on his elbows. Oh cheer up. James poured them all large mugs of tea. Don't want to see the fruits of our labor. Not at 6 in the morning, Peter replied, slurping his tea. Sirius winced at the sound and pushed a plate towards him. Have some toast and stop whinging. Remus took some toast too and cut it into 4 pieces. He spread marmalade onto 1/4, jam onto another, butter on the third, and lemon curd on the last. He ignored the looks of amusement James and Sirius were giving him. Remus had never had so much choice before, and was determined to make the most of every meal. Fortunately, they did not have to wait too long before the other students began to trickle in for breakfast. The first Slytherins arrived just as Remus was finishing his toast. 3 boys and 2 girls, 3rd years. They walked over to their table, unaware of the 4 eager Gryffindors watching intently. For a few moments, it was as if nothing was different. Sirius sighed with disappointment. But then, the tallest boy shuffled slightly in his seat, rubbing his arm. Another seemed to be looking for something in his pocket, but from Remus' viewpoint he was clearly scratching his leg furiously. The third kept using his wand to rub behind his ear. It worked. James whispered, breathless with excitement. Even Peter looked cheerful now. As more Slytherins filtered in, their problem became more obvious and more hilarious. By 7 o'clock the Slytherin table was full of squirming, writhing, scratching boys, and horrified girls. Amicus Carrow, a burly 6th year, eventually ripped off his robes, his school jumper and even his tie to claw at his chest which Remus could see was already red raw. He felt slightly sorry for them. Then Snape came in. Whether it was justice or sheer luck, Severus seemed to have reacted particularly badly to the rose-hip seeds. He walked in with his head bowed, hair falling over his face, but his nose was still visible and tomato red. Oh Merlin. Sirius wheezed, laughing so hard he was holding his stomach. Tell me we got his face. Oi, Snivellus. James yelled. Snape spun around, and his hair parted. The left side of his face was covered in an angry red rash, from his temples all the way down to his neck, disappearing under his uniform. His left eye was red too, the lid swollen. Looking good. Sirius crowed, and all 4 boys dissolved into laughter as Snape stormed out of the room. By the time breakfast was over, the entire castle was buzzing with rumors about what exactly had come over the Slytherin boys. Sirius and James looked as though all of their Christmases had come at once, and even Peter had forgotten about whining. He reminded them all that he had kept lookout. After all, making the entire venture possible. It was all Lupin's idea, though, Sirius returned, slapping Remus heartily on the back. What shall we do to celebrate, lads? Exploding snap? Raid the kitchens. Remus shook Sirius off, smiling politely. Come in, he said. It's defense against the dark arts first, thought you two loved that. Later that day, Remus ran into Lily Evans, who smiled and fell into step with him. Hey Remus. Did you hear what happened to the Slytherins? Yet. Everyone had heard it was all they'd been talking about all day, even during lessons. Fortunately no one had a clue who'd done it. It had been a good idea, attacking the entire house at once. Who could guess who the target had been? Crazy, isn't it? Lily continued. Sev was allergic to whatever they used. Madame Pomfrey gave him a sleeping draft while the swelling goes down. Remus sniggered, without thinking. He glanced at Lily, who was looking back at him with reproachful green eyes. Look, I know he wasn't very nice to you the other day in potions. He's a bit of a snob, okay. Remus snorted. But I wanted to say sorry, Lily pressed on. I need to stand up to him more. Shouldn't let him get away with it. He's actually a really nice person when you get to know him. If you say so. Remus stopped walking. They were passing Pinaggle's office now. The door was closed, and there were raised voices on the other side. Horace, whoever it was, they must have been a Slytherin. It was Professor McGonagall. Who else has the password? Why would a Slytherin attack their own house, Minerva? The potions master sounded frustrated. You did say it was only the boys' dorms affected. Perhaps it was one of the girls. Really? Well, who else? Peeves? He never enters the common rooms, doesn't enter the dungeons, either. Come to that, too frightened of the Bloody Baron. We ought to place a ban on all Zonko's products. From what Poppy says, it wasn't a Zonko's product. Rosehip, from the greenhouses. Lupin felt a trickle of fear run down his spine. If they knew that much, would they be able to find out who'd done it? Rosehip, Very clever. Slughorn sounded impressed now. McGonagall sighed. I suppose you'd like to blame the Ravenclaws now. I just wish I knew who'd done it. He sighed, heavily. Perhaps the truth will out. I suppose it does seem more likely that it was one of the Slytherin girls than a gang of malicious marauders creeping into the dungeons under the cloak of night. Remus could hear Slughorn's chuckle at that. Yes, quite. Now, I must be going, McGonagall was saying, her footsteps approaching the door. You will let me know if you catch the culprit. The door swung open. Remus and Lily stepped back, guiltily. McGonagall looked down at them through her spectacles. What are two Gryffindors doing so far from their tower? Please, Professor, Remus and I were. We were just going there, said Remus. Well, I suggest you get a faster start. Remus and Lily looked at each other, then were down the hall just as Slughorn came out mumbling about inquiries he had to make. Soon they climbed through the portrait hole into the common room where Remus found his three roommates waiting for him. Peter and James were engaged in a very serious game of chess. For some reason, one of the knights was doing an Irish jig. Sirius was laying on a couch chewing a sugar quill. Sirius looked up, smiling broadly. He pulled himself up, leaned back, and folded his arms under his head. That prank is just the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it? Snape was allergic and everything, said Remus, smirking. That ginger girl said he's been in the hospital wing all day. Sirius laughed even louder. Which ginger girl? You know, the annoying one. Evans. James looked up suddenly. I don't think she's annoying. Checkmate. Peter cried. Remus shrugged. Let's not talk about her. Sirius rolled his eyes. This might be the most important day of our lives. This is the day we became legends, the day our friendship was forged in the fire of itching powder. They don't know it was us, do they? Peter asked, nervously, tidying away his chess set. Remus shook his head. Slughorn reckons it was a Slytherin girl. Or a gang of marauders. Marauders. Sirius cried. Raise your glasses, boys. We don't have glasses, James replied. You do, said Sirius. The rest of us will just pretend. From this day forward, we are the Marauders. He let out a long dog-like howl of laughter. James smacked his face and grinned. Peter glanced around, not quite understanding what was going on. Remus burst out laughing. What sort of Ponzi gang name is that? First year, secrets. The next full moon passed much as the first had. This time the wolf had clearly grown restless, because Remus awoke with a number of deep scratches. They heal fast with a bit of antiseptic, he advised Madame Pomfrey, who fussed over him in the chill morning light. And faster still with magic, she said smiling, with a flourish of her wand. The cuts closed up instantly, and Remus felt strong relief. His parents hadn't known as efficient of healing spells as the Hogwarts nurse. Can you get rid of the scars, too? He asked, eagerly. She shook her head sadly. No, Remus, not these ones. I'm sorry. Okay. He sighed, dressing for school. This time he'd brought his change of clothes with him and left them in the tunnel just outside the shack to avoid having to go back to the tower. He'd meet the other boys in their first lesson, and let them wonder where he'd been. You don't have to go to school today, Madame Pomfrey was saying, not if you are too tired. I can write you a note. I want to go, he replied. It's not that bad, honestly. Madame Pomfrey looked at him with serious eyes. Not that bad for now. I'm afraid the transformations may start to take their toll as you grow up. Have you looked after other kids like me, then? He'd been wanting to ask for ages, but wasn't sure how. No, dear, you're the first Hogwarts student that I know of who's been bitten. Who's been bitten, she accepted, gratefully. But I promise I know what I'm doing. I've done plenty of reading on the subject. You mean there are books? About people like me? Well, yes, she sounded surprised. She sat down on the bed as he finished dressing. You could borrow one of them, if you like. Remus wasn't sure what to think of this. Thanks, he said. He didn't like thinking about being a werewolf more than he had to. I'll consider it. They had transfiguration first that morning. McGonagall didn't give Remus detention for not bringing his homework. She had obviously decided to be more lenient around the full moon. She did make him promise to bring it with him next time, and he agreed. James, Sirius, and Peter spent half the lesson trying to get his attention, but he steadfastly ignored them until McGonagall threatened to separate all four of them. In the halls on their way to Charms, Remus knew there was no escape. It was a good 5-minute walk. So, where were you? Sirius blurted out, walking on his left-hand side. Nowhere, he replied, hurrying on. Oh, go on, James pleaded, coming up on his right side. Tell us. Was it the same place you went last month? Maybe. Were you in detention? Asked Peter, struggling to keep up. Remus cursed himself for not having thought of that. Detention would have been the perfect cover. Now he didn't have time to invent a whole story about how he'd gotten in trouble. Nope. Then where? Watch it, Half-Blood. Remus had been too busy evading questions to look where he was going, and had run smack into Snape, who was coming around the corner. Already wound up, Remus squared his shoulders and attempted to push past, roughly. Watch yourself, Snivellus. Snape didn't move, and pushed him instead. A Slytherin called Mulciber appeared at his left shoulder, looming over the other boys. I know it was you that broke into our dorms the other night, Snape hissed. All of you. Yet? Prove it. James smirked, folding his arms. Snape's lips curled. I can't, yet. But I will. I'll get you back too, I promise. We're quaking in our boots, Sirius replied, leaning against the wall, boredly. Now would you kindly move it? Your idea, was it, Black? Snape drawled, or yours, Potter? Had to have been one of you. Pettigrew doesn't have the guts and Dear Lupin here clearly hasn't got the brains. Remus clenched his fists. He could see Snape's hand on his wand. Severus probably knew all sorts of curses and hexes, judging by the notes in his potions book. Move along now, gentlemen, a sharp voice suddenly rang through the corridor. It was Professor Flitwick, stepping out of his classroom to see what the holdup was. Severus, you are clogging up the halls, and you four are supposed to be in my class. Come along. Remus felt overheated and agitated for the rest of Charms, which was usually his favorite lesson. He often did better than even James and Sirius. Finding it difficult to calm down, he kept shooting his cushions across the room like missiles rather than guiding them carefully through the hoops Flitwick had hung from the ceiling. They'd been working on levitation charms for a few weeks now, and Peter was the only one still struggling. In Remus' opinion, Peter's problem was a lack of imagination. James and Sirius were both unerringly confident, and he found confidence was all that was really needed to complete most basic spells. Remus himself generally felt able to complete any task if it looked simple enough. Peter, on the other hand, worried about everything. He read and reread his textbooks, trying to copy the complicated diagrams rather than just what Flitwick showed them. I expect you all to be able to levitate this book by the end of the week, Flitwick said at the end of the lesson. The book was enormous, about half the size of the tiny professor, and looked as though a fully grown man might have trouble carrying it very far. So come prepared for a quick test of your abilities. Peter groaned as they collected their things to leave. Remus had managed to calm down by lunchtime, but still had trouble controlling his magic later in the afternoon. He was glad they only had herbology and history of magic. He always had a lot of energy after a transformation. Now his wand buzzed in his hand like static. He tried a quick lumos, hiding in a toilet cubicle between lessons, and nearly burnt his retinas out. Perhaps the book Madame Pomfrey had mentioned might tell him more about it. There might be other books in the library, but he hadn't checked. It was the word werewolf that scared him. Remus lived in fear that if he read it, wrote it down, or said it out loud, then somehow everyone would find out his secret. And it was just better to keep stuff like that in your head. That Thursday they were finishing their homework in the Gryffindor common room while James was finishing Remus' homework, having completed his own. He'd offered to do it in return for Remus teaching him the obfuscate spell, and, despite his conscience, Remus had acquiesced. James was rather good at imitating other people's handwriting. Sirius was completing his own essay, and had already written 3 inches extra on the uses of lacewing flies in transformative drafts plus diagrams. There were books strewn all over the table they claimed for themselves, along with inkwells and scrunched up rolls of parchment. Peter was trying to levitate an apple and get it into a waste paper basket 4 feet away. So far he could get it up in the air, but then it wobbled and fell back down again. Frazzled, Peter ran his fingers through his hair again and consulted his text. You'll get it, Pete, don't worry, James murmured, not looking up from Remus' paper. Keep at it. I'm trying, Peter whined. I'm sure it's the movement I'm getting wrong. The book says to use a smooth, serpentine action, but I'm not sure. He swirled his wand in the air. Remus tut. It's not like that, he said, sharply. It's like an S shape on its side. Look. He performed the spell, effortlessly, lifting the apple into the air and sending it sailing into the bin neatly. An S shape, are you sure? Peter frowned. He aimed his own wand at a scrunched up ball of paper from the table. Wingardium Leviosa, he chanted, waving his wand in the same way Lupin had. Sure enough, the paper flew shakily upwards then flew with slightly less grace into the bin, bouncing off the sides as it fell to the bottom and landed beside the apple. Peter stared wide-eyed. I did it, he gasped. An S shape, why didn't it just say that in the book? Well done, Peter, James said, taking his eyes off the essay and smiling. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You should be a teacher, Remus. Lupin snorted, looking away bashfully. James continued, I'm nearly done with this, just need to check something. Can you pass me magical theory? That one with the werewolf illustration. Remus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Trying not to panic, he looked down at the pile of books James was pointing to. One of them definitely had an illustration of a werewolf. James' expensive edition had one next to a cauldron and other iconography on the cover. It wasn't that significant, but a clear enough detail. The gold and silver lettering of the title seemed to shift and swirl before Remus' eyes. For a moment, he felt an urge to pretend he thought James meant a different book. He glanced back at James, who was reading over what he'd written. Peter was too busy levitating more balls of paper to notice Remus' turmoil. Remus looked down again. Sirius cleared his throat and leaned across the desk. He picked up the big black leather tome, and handed it to James. Cheers, mate, James said, absent-mindedly, returning to his work. Sirius carried on as if nothing had happened. Remus felt unreasonably as if he had just given away his secret. First year, scars. If Remus hadn't hated history of magic so much, then flying would have been his least favorite subject. 20 minutes into their very first lesson with Madame Hooch he had learnt that he was afraid of heights, and the rest of the classes had been miserable for him. James was the star of the class, of course, and even the other Marauders found him insufferable as he flitted around the Quidditch pitch, throwing loops and feints as if he was born on a broom. Sirius was excellent too, and most of the other kids in the class had grown up playing on broomsticks. Even Peter was competent. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft and muddy. They changed out of their usual lace-up shoes and into thick boots and scarlet flying kits before squelching onto the pitch. They picked up their brooms and awaited instruction. The brooms were provided by the school. First years weren't allowed to bring their own, but James would tell anyone who stopped long enough to listen that he had a top-of-the-line model at home. Right, mount your brooms, please, ladies and gentlemen, Hooch bellowed at the group. Nice strong wind today, so I want you all to take good care. Potter, no showing off. Remus clambered onto his broom, swallowing hard. If he could manage not to be sick, then it would be a victory. I'd like 5 clean laps around the pitch, then a good landing back here from each of you. Mind the puddle and remember to lean into the wind where possible. Use it to your advantage. 5 points to whoever's back first. And with no warning, the silver-haired witch blew her whistle hard. Remus and Lily were the last off the ground. Once Lily was in the air, however, she streaked ahead with ease. Bit higher, Lupin. Come on now. Hooch boomed from below through a megaphone. He wanted to ignore her, but there was no escape. He pushed himself higher, trying to look ahead and not down, trying to think about anything other than the empty space between himself and the ground. He could see Lily's bright red plate flashing ahead like a fox's tail and Peter's shiny blonde hair somewhere towards the middle of the group. Though he couldn't see that far ahead, he knew James and Sirius were almost neck and neck. Remus plowed on grimly, not wanting to go any faster. Who cared if he was last, if he didn't break his neck getting there? As he rounded a corner at the end of the pitch, the wind hit. He leaned forward, trying not to slow down too much. It was cold, and the grey morning air battered his face. The second lap was as bad as the first. By the third, he noticed James had taken to circling each of the towers in the empty spectator stands, despite Madame Hooch's admonishments. On the fourth lap, Remus had company. Having fun. Sirius cruised along beside him. He looked so comfortable, as if he could raise both hands over his head, spin upside down and fly backwards all at the same time without any trouble. Remus frowned. Are you trying to lose? James is gonna win. Sirius shrugged. Might as well let him have his moment. Thought I'd hang out with you. Why? Remus replied, through gritted teeth. Thought you might want a friend. We're about to land, and I know you hate landing. Remember to stick your legs out and lean back, then bend your knees as you hit the oi. Remus had grabbed the tail of Sirius' broom and given it a hard yank. You're being a know-it-all. Sirius righted himself, then flew back to Remus' side and gave him a hard shove back. Remus shook, but held on tight, making his descent. It was much smoother than before. He leaned back, then twisted quickly to push Sirius again. Out of my way, he yelled, going faster. You can be the last down for once. Oh no you don't. Sirius now grabbed Remus' broom tail, tugging him backwards. This was a step too far, as they were both quite close to the ground now. The two boys tumbled towards earth, brooms flying from beneath them. They crash-landed into a muddy puddle, skidding and rolling forwards, soaking their robes in the process. Madame Hooch marched over to the two boys sprawled in the mud. The other Gryffindors gathered around, giggling and pointing. Sirius leapt to his feet and pulled Lupin up roughly. They both looked up at the teacher, blinking water droplets from their eyes. What did I say about minding the puddle? Madame Hooch couldn't hide a smile. She usually saw the fun in things. A point each from Gryffindor. You'd better go and wash off in the showers. Off you go. They both waddled towards the Quidditch changing rooms, holding out their heavy, waterlogged robes. Bloody ridiculous kit, Remus grumbled as they stepped into the squat littler stone building. How are we ever going to dry these? The house elves will take care of that, Sirius replied, shaking his off and dumping it in a pile in the corner. Remus kicked away his boots, then entered a shower cubicle. At least he'd gotten out of 40 more minutes of flying. What's that? Sirius said, suddenly when he came out. Remus looked up, then back down. Sirius was pointing at a long stripe which stretched from the left half of his collarbone diagonally across his chest. He fumbled with his buttons, trying to close the shirt faster. A scar, he muttered. He barely noticed them anymore. Did it happen to you at home? Is it from an animal? Remus didn't answer. They stared each other down for a full minute, then it broke. Shall we go and watch James making a prat of himself? Sirius asked. Remus nodded again, and they both stepped back out into the cold autumn air. They took their seats on the hard benches in the spectators' stands and watched the rest of the class flitting back and forth across the pitch, red robes fluttering behind them. Lily, though lacking James' formal technique, was giving him a run for his money when it came to speed, beating him in 2 out of 3 races between goalposts. Remus, Sirius said, suddenly, as their classmates came in for their final landing. Yet. Did you get attacked by a werewolf? Remus sighed. Nah, was all he said. I won't tell anyone. Cheers. First year, sweets and fur. James and Peter were waiting for them at the Gryffindor table in their usual seats. How was the rest of practice? Sirius asked, after draining a goblet of pumpkin juice. Cracking, James answered cheerfully, spearing a sausage on the end of his fork, then using it to scoop up some mashed potato. As they finished their dinner, James regaled them with a blow-by-blow account of the Quidditch practice, listing every player on the team, their strengths and faults, their techniques and what he would do to improve them. Peter interjected occasionally with his own opinions, which barely differed from James. Pudding was millionaire shortbread, which neither Sirius nor James liked. Remus thought they were mad. He'd have eaten theirs too, but Peter got there first, scoffing the lot. I've got some sweets, the smaller boy offered, digging in his robe pockets and withdrawing a bulging brown bag. Mum sent them, help yourself. Cheers, Pete. They dug in, munching their way through fizzing whizbees, chocolate frogs, and flavor-changing gobstoppers happily. Remus helped himself to a few as well, until they all felt quite sick. What homework do you have left? James asked, scratching his chin, distractedly. I think I finished everything for the week. I'm just behind on history. Sirius was scratching too, near his collarbone. Watching them made Remus start to itch. The back of his hand tickled as if a small insect was crawling over him. He suddenly thought of the itching powder and looked down. He nearly screamed. The back of his hand was growing thick dark hair at an alarming rate. He was transforming. It wasn't anywhere near a full moon. How could this be happening? He stood in sudden panic, nearly falling backwards. He had to get out of there fast. What's up, Lupin? James asked, startled. Remus looked back at him, then Sirius. They were both growing hair. 2 dark curls sprouted from their faces, their hands, and arms, every bit of exposed skin. He gaped, speechless. He ran his tongue over his teeth. They weren't getting any longer. Oh, bloody hell, James said, looking down at himself, then at the other 2 boys. What's going on? Peter, Sirius growled, his face now almost covered in hair. Are you sure your mum sent those sweets? Peter, who hadn't had any sweets yet, stared at them both, and turned red, spluttering. Well, I thought they were from her. They arrived this morning. Peter. James roared. People were looking at them now, turning and nudging each other. Soon, the entire dining hall was whispering and pointing at the 3 incredibly hairy boys at the Gryffindor table. Plenty of people were giggling, too, but of course no one was laughing louder than Severus Snape over at the Slytherin benches. Come on. Sirius stood up, sticking his furry nose into the air. Let's get to the hospital wing. We can plot our revenge later. As they left to howls of laughter from the rest of the Great Hall, Remus cringed in shame, covering his face with his hands. Every inch of him was now covered in the same glossy black hair. It was too close to the scenario that always played out in his worst nightmares about becoming a furry animal in public. He found the prank even less funny than James and Sirius. I told you they'd strike back, Sirius muttered. First year, birthdays and books. Fortunately, Madame Pomfrey was able to undo the hex with a few flicks of her wand. She still lectured all of them on misuse of dangerous magic. As if we all wanted to look like Bigfoot. James complained as they left the hospital wing, skin still tingling from the hair growth. It had to be Severus. He coated the sweets in one of his potions. I know it, Sirius ceded. Yeah, we all know it, mate. James said. Don't worry, we'll get him back. I'm so sorry. Peter wailed, for about the 100th time. I really thought they were from my mum. It's fine, Peter. James patted his shoulder. Just wish you'd given them to us first thing on a Monday, then we could have at least bunked off Transfiguration. James pushed his glasses up his nose. Don't suppose you've got any other brilliant ideas, Remus? Sorry. Remus shook his head. Not at the moment. I'll help you, James, Peter piped up. I'll do anything, I won't be scared this time, They were just turning the corner which led to Gryffindor Tower when somebody behind them called, Sirius. All 4 boys turned. Sirius made a small shock noise. It was Bellatrix Black. What you want? He asked, looking down and scuffing his shoes on the flagstone floor. James stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his friend. Come here and address me properly, the 7th year witch snapped. Sirius didn't move. Bellatrix withdrew her wand. Something in her expression frightened Remus more than anything he'd seen at Hogwarts yet. Come here, she said, in a low voice, or I'll make you. And it won't be a childish little hair growth charm, I promise. Sirius walked forward, shaking his head at James, who tried to follow. They all watched the cousins speak in quiet voices at the end of the hallway for a long, uncomfortable stretch of time. Sirius stared at the ground the whole time. Finally, she patted him on the head like a dog, turned on her heel and left. They all exhaled. Sirius walked back to them slowly. All right, Sirius. James asked, first. Yet. He nodded, paler than usual. She wanted to invite me for tea. On my birthday. I think my mother must have made her, probably held a family conference. To try to bring me back into the fold. Just because you're in a different house. And the company I'm keeping. He smirked at them. So when's your birthday? 2 weeks. The 3rd. I have to go to this tea, though. Bella's not joking about knowing some really vile curses. We'll do something afterwards, then. Something good, yet. Peter and Remus nodded enthusiastically, but in the back of Remus' mind he remembered that the 3rd was the night of the full moon. Sirius turned 12 and Remus wasn't there to celebrate it, though he didn't think anyone minded. James was Sirius' best friend, after all, and Peter still liked to think that James belonged to him a little bit, too. So Remus would have been the odd one out, even if he hadn't been locked away in a shack trying to tear himself apart. Madame Pomfrey tried giving him a sleeping draught this time, before the moon rose, but it had no effect. What was worse, he managed to give himself his biggest scar yet right across his back. Madame Pomfrey made him stay in the hospital wing all day afterwards, which was fortuitous. It meant he could just tell his friends he'd been suddenly taken ill. He wouldn't have enjoyed the birthday, at least, that was what he told himself. James talked to Madame Hooch and arranged a lunchtime flying session for the 4 of them. After dinner, before Sirius had to go and change for tea with his cousins, James and Peter led the Gryffindor table in a round of happy birthday, followed by for he's a jolly good fellow. According to the students Remus heard from afterwards, they had sung and so say all of us, over and over, getting louder each time until Professor McGonagall had to threaten them with detention if they didn't stop. It all sounded a bit embarrassing. As November marched on, the days grew shorter and the castle darker. The Marauders spent less of their time outside, and more of it huddled by the fire in the common room, playing card games and plotting revenge against Snape. The first term was drawing to a close, and the teachers piled on more homework than ever. Sirius still found time to hang up posters of Muggle motorcycles he'd remembered about at the bottom of his trunk. They'd been a gift from his cousin Andromeda, the family's first black sheep or white sheep in this case who'd married a muggle. What is that? Asked James, looking at the unmoving pictures dubiously. They're a type of muggle transportation almost as cool as riding a broom, explained Sirius. I really want to get one someday. Remus had heard of them before, but thought the contraptions in Sirius posters looked even more complicated and confusing than broomsticks. Peter threw a gobstone across a board on the floor. They'd been playing a lazy game off and on for the past few days, trying to teach Remus the rules. It rolled into one of Sirius' stones and knocked it out of the ring, immediately, squirting out a disgusting smelling liquid, which Sirius barely dodged in time. Peter grinned. Ha, take that, muggle lover. Sirius punched him on the back, and left to change his clothes. First year, Christmas 1971. Lupin, perhaps you can tell me what are the transfigurative properties of Lapis Philosophorum? McGonagall asked towards the end of their lesson one day. She gave him a very pointed look. She had just asked James, Sirius, and Peter the same question to no avail. She knew she could count on Remus to get it right. Well, Remus racked his brain. I think that's the one that turns stuff into gold. If you use it right, and Cleopatra the alchemist used it to turn lead into silver, I think. Correct. McGonagall sounded as if she was trying to mask her delight. 5 points to Gryffindor. And another 5 for making the connection to Cleopatra the alchemist. She's not mentioned in Transfiguration for beginners. Did you read that in your history text? Remus nodded, aware that everyone was looking at him. Well, excellent. Some of my third-year students are incapable of cross-referencing their studies like that, so I'm pleased to see you taking such an interest. She addressed the class, and we will begin discussing alchemy after Christmas. Which reminds me, with the holidays approaching, I'd like to ask any students planning to remain at Hogwarts over the break to let me know by the end of next week. Thank you, you're dismissed. The class stood up to leave. A few people patted Remus on the back as they passed. Mr. Lupin, if you have a moment. McGonagall said when he passed her desk as the rest of the class filtered out. When the classroom was empty, she walked over and shut the door, right in James' face, and turned back to Remus. Well done today, Remus, McGonagall said, kindly. You've really been doing well lately. She laughed. Don't look so surprised. I'm very impressed. Professor Slughorn and Professor Flitwick have said the same. I wanted a quick word with you about Christmas. As you know, the full moon will occur twice in December the 2nd, that was next week, and the 31st. New Year's Eve. Your mother and father seem to be of the opinion that you would be better off remaining at Hogwarts over Christmas for this reason. They will, however, come to visit for a short time. I hope you aren't too disappointed. Remus shrugged. It's all right. He hadn't seen his family for a long time, and none of his good friends were staying at Hogwarts. He knew he couldn't be contained in his old bedroom as a werewolf anymore. He was getting hurt these days even in the Shrieking Shack. He wondered what it was like to be a normal student who could go home for the holidays. Even having a serious disease would be better than being a werewolf. Professor McGonagall nodded. Seriously. I shall add your name to the list, then. I'll see you next week, Remus. James invited Sirius and Remus to visit him over the break, knowing that neither of them were facing a particularly merry Christmas otherwise. He believed Remus was staying at Hogwarts because his parents were traveling abroad. Remus was forced to decline even if he hadn't been incredibly shy about visiting James' home and meeting his parents. He didn't want to risk transforming outside Hogwarts. The thought terrified him. Sirius, who would have loved the opportunity to spend 2 weeks mucking about with James, racing their brooms and eating chocolate, also had to refuse. His family had made it clear they didn't approve of him visiting the Potter family under any circumstances. Bellatrix, that devil, has been feeding my parents information, he explained, darkly. Apparently, I've disgraced them enough already. If I go to your house then it'll only get worse. Sorry, mate. Remus went to the edge of the grounds with the other Marauders to wave them off on the last day of term. We'll send you owls. James promised. See if you can come up with our next plan of attack on Snape. Remus grinned and promised he would try. He was the only Gryffindor first year staying behind for the break, and trudged a lonely path back up to the castle. The next day he enjoyed sleeping until 10 o'clock, when Frank Longbottom poked his head around the door. Come on Lupin, you'll miss breakfast at this rate. Remus liked Frank. He had a broad, friendly face and easygoing manner. He felt solid and dependable, like an older brother. He seemed to have picked up on Remus struggling to join in when he experienced feelings of illness, and always tried to include Remus wherever possible. After breakfast Frank disappeared to the Oloy and Remus sat glumly in the common room, feeling the next 2 weeks stretch before him, empty and lonely. He considered a walk around the grounds, but it had started to rain heavily. He stared at serious motorcycle posters and flipped through a stack of magazines some 4th years had left behind. They were mostly just fashion mags of pretty, glamorous witches and handsome wizards. The next few days passed in much the same way. Frank would get him up in the morning, he'd eat all his meals with the remaining Gryffindors in the Great Hall, but otherwise he was left to his own devices. Remus was so bored he'd already finished all the homework he'd been set. He tried to read for a while, but after attempting a paragraph from his herbology text gave up. He copied out a few of the diagrams instead. Remus didn't mind drawing, he liked the freedom of it. Every day he walked around the castle for a few hours, with his map. The other boys had long since discarded theirs, having learned all the classroom locations after the first week or so. Remus hung on to his, still bothered by its incompleteness. He'd begun marking it up, adding points of interest, hiding places, and the secret passageway he'd found. He wasn't the only student left in the school, but most of the others were 6th and 7th years, who generally stayed in the library revising hard for exams, or working on their coursework. Slughorn was holding special extra potions classes in the dungeons, but Remus hadn't been invited and probably wouldn't have gone anyway. He practiced a few spells, and entertained himself for a good few hours trying to see how many objects in their dorm room he could levitate at once. He made a game of it, throwing various objects, books, gobstones, decks of cards up in the air, and trying to stop them before they hit the ground. He had to stop that, eventually, when Frank knocked on the door and told him irritably to keep the noise down. On Christmas Eve, Remus was woken earlier than usual. It was still quite dark. Heavy rain pelted the thick glass window panes, the sound of it loud enough to echo through the empty dorm room. However, that wasn't what had disturbed him. The door was creaking open, and someone stepped inside. Sitting up and peering through the gloom, Remus expected to see Longbottom telling him to get up for breakfast. It wasn't Frank though. It was a very soggy, very disheveled boy with long hair, Sirius. Remus leapt out of bed, overjoyed. Sirius pushed his wet hair out of his eyes. He'd clearly been out in the rain. He pulled off his heavy traveling cloak, dropping it in a pile on the floor. All right, Lupin. He grinned. Freezing, isn't it? He pointed his wand at the fireplace. Incendio. What are you doing here? Had enough, he said simply, pulling off his boots, which were caked in mud. Got into an argument with Dad, then the whole family got into it. All the usual stuff. Called me a blood traitor, the shame of the family, etc., etc. He flopped down on his bed. So I left. Wow. Remus rubbed his eyes. How did you get here? Full of powder. Sirius shrugged. To the pub in the village. Then just walked up. Wow, Remus repeated. I'm starving. They sent me to bed last night without dinner. Come on, get dressed. Breakfast. McGonagall was not as pleased to see Sirius as Remus was. The two boys attempted to take their seats at the table as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but she appeared at their side almost immediately. Mr. Black, she said, a note of warning in her voice. What is the meaning of this? I missed you too, Professor. He smiled up at her. The corner of the old witch's mouth twitched, but she kept her composure. You were seen walking onto the grounds from Hogsmeade at 6 o'clock this morning. Do you care to explain yourself further? Sirius shook his head. Not really, Professor. That's pretty much all there is to it. McGonagall sighed, shaking her head slightly. Very well, Mr. Black. I shall have to contact your parents, of course, so that they know where you are. No need, Sirius replied, nodding at the flock of owls which had just swooped into the room. The largest of these birds, a huge, stately eagle owl, dropped a thick red envelope onto Sirius' plate. He looked down at it, then up at McGonagall with a wry smile. He picked up the ominous envelope, and, without breaking eye contact with McGonagall, ripped it open. Immediately, the letter shrieked. The ear-splitting voice filled the hall, causing heads to turn. McGonagall winced. It was the voice of Sirius' mother. Sirius Orion Black, it shrieked, how dare you defy your father in this manner? Remus covered his ears. Sirius remained perfectly still, looking up at McGonagall. Consorting with half-breeds and blood traitors. Turning your back on your family. If your grandfather was alive he'd have disowned you the moment you were sorted. You will remain at school until the end of the year and think about the shame and dishonor you have brought to your noble title. Don't think we won't disinherit you. You are not our only son. With that, the letter burst into flames, curling and shriveling into a pile of chalk-white ash. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring. Sirius reached for some toast, put it on his plate, then ladled scrambled eggs onto it. He glanced at McGonagall again. You can send Mother an owl if you like, Professor, but I doubt she'll read it. Very well, Black. McGonagall nodded. Just, try to keep out of trouble, will you? With that, she walked stiffly back to the teacher's table at the far end of the hall. Christmas morning at Hogwarts was pleasant. Remus was touched to find that his parents hadn't forgotten him after all the post had arrived overnight, and at the end of his bed he found a card, as well as a lumpy package which contained a bag of nuts, a box of pumpkin pasties, and a tin of biscuits. To his amazement, James had also sent a present, his very own set of gobstones. Peter had even sent a box of chocolate frogs. Merry Christmas, Sirius yawned, opening his own gifts. He had nothing from his parents, as far as Remus could see, but he didn't mention it. James had sent him an annual of his favorite Quidditch team, the South End Scorchers, and he had a box of frogs from Peter too. Merry Christmas, Remus replied. I didn't get anyone any presents, he admitted guiltily. I didn't know they would. He didn't want to say he didn't have as much money as James, Peter, and Sirius. Don't worry about it, Sirius replied, on his way to the bathroom. No one expected you to. This troubled Remus, but he tried not to think about it. While Sirius was in the loo, another owl flew in the window and dropped a long, lumpy package on his bed. When Sirius came out and saw it, his eyes lit up and he ripped it open, eagerly. It's from Andromeda, he explained, pulling the Nimbus 1500 from its paper wrappings. He howled with excitement, and leapt onto the seat. Book pages rustled as he whipped around, making a circuit of the room twice. Then he fell with a crash over his four-poster bed. Frank burst in, then. What's the ruckus? Merry Christmas, lads, come on. Breakfast. When he popped away, Sirius beamed at Remus. It's the latest model, he said. Andromeda is my favorite family member by far. She always gives the best gifts when I'm least expecting it. Someday I'll be like her. I'd like to surprise someone with a brand new broom just when they're really depressed. They dressed quickly and went down to the dining hall. The great hall had been decorated beautifully by the teachers' glittering ropes of tinsel in red, green, and gold sparkled from every rafter, hanging down like festive jungle vines. 12 enormous trees twinkled with lights in every color imaginable, and baubles the size of footballs hung from every branch. After breakfast, the boys ran back upstairs to look at the broom again. For the rest of the day they played gobstones in the common room, ate their way through the chocolate frogs, pasties, nuts, and biscuits, and played rowdy games of exploding snap. Meals at Hogwarts were always spectacular, and Christmas dinner was no different. By the time night had fallen, Remus had eaten so much he thought he might never be hungry again. Though he didn't say it to Sirius, who, after all, had been forced to run away from home for the first if not the last time, it was Remus' best Christmas ever. First year, Lectiuncula Magna. With Boxing Day over and done with, Remus and Sirius found themselves caught in those strange nowhere days between Christmas and New Year's Day, as they awaited their friend's return. Sirius was keen to plan their revenge on Snape. In fact, he was no longer interested in attacking all of the Slytherins anymore, wanting to focus his energies on one single nemesis. Remus was inclined to agree. He had been too furious with Snape to think clearly about it for the past few weeks. He couldn't shake the feeling that Severus had somehow hit upon the exact hex that would cause him the most upset. He didn't know quite how the Slytherin boy had managed it, and it was very likely just a clever guess, but he didn't care. We should just get James' cloak, follow him around till he's alone, then beat him, Remus growled uncharacteristically, as they sat in the empty common room one evening. He gripped the arm of the settee as he said this, the leather creaking under his grasp. It was getting close to the full moon and his temper was closer to the surface than usual. Sirius was carrying in a pile of books he'd brought from the library. You're thinking like a muggle. If we're going to get him, we're going to get him with magic. Sirius plopped down beside him, an enormous tome in his arms. He opened it, and it was so big that his upper body couldn't be seen behind the cover. So what's this one about? Remus asked. Hexes and jinxes. A lot of them are really complex, though. I mean, we're good, you, me, and James, anyway, but I still think we should stick to the basics. Simplicity is key. Okay, Remus agreed, dully. Sirius didn't seem in the mood to hear other opinions. So I thought we could brainstorm about all the stuff we can do, and see if that lends itself to any good jinxes, Sirius continued. I'm really good at transfiguration, I got the best marks even after you started catching up. Right, Remus said. And James is a bit better than me at defense against the dark arts, which you'd think would be helpful when dealing with a slimy creep like Snivellus, but we haven't really learned any good spells yet, except disarming stuff, and that's no use. He chewed the nib of his quill, considering. It wasn't a new quill, and left a dark mustache-like stain on Sirius' top lip. Remus didn't say anything. Sirius carried on. James is good at flying, too, obviously, but I don't know how that's going to be any help. Then there's Peter, good at sneaking around in grunt work, I suppose. Remus thought that was rather unfair. Peter was never top of the class, but he usually got a satisfactory mark. He lacked the competitive edge though, and seemed to have no desire to prove himself. It was enough just to be friends with cleverer, more confident people. He got a bit of their shine with none of the pressure. Peter's good at herbology, Remus pointed out. And potions. Both useless, Sirius sighed. You were the one who came up with the rose hip thing, and we're never going to best Snape at potions, I hate to admit it, but the kid's too good. Anyway, then we've got you, you're probably best at charms. Not best, Remus said, hurriedly. I'm good at levitation, I suppose, but that's it. This is no time for modesty, Lupin. Sirius waved an impatient hand. You pick up spells quicker than anyone. If we find a sufficiently hideous hex in here, then I'm counting on you to figure out how to do it. Remus squirmed. It was the full moon, he told himself. He felt fidgety and too hot by the fire, He vaguely hoped that dinner would be red meat, something he could taste the iron in. It has to be something big, Sirius murmured, flipping all the way to the back of the book. Remus let out a yelp as the full weight of it thudded against his thighs. Sirius ignored this, running a finger down the index. Something much worse than the hair thing. Remus shuddered at the thought of Snape's prank. Rage surged through him again. Or was it hunger? He shook his head, pushing the book away and getting up, pretending he just had to stretch. His joints ached already as his body prepared itself for the coming transformation. I don't know why you think I'll be any help, Remus yawned. He scratched his head, racking his brain. Can't think of anything bad enough, he said. We could take a bucket of water and prop it up over a door which you have to leave a bit ajar, you know, then when someone walks through they get soaked. Someone did that to my dad at the ministry once. Are you hungry? Can we go down for dinner yet? Yeah, I suppose. Sirius closed the book. We could get a bucket pretty easily, but it seems like there's a lot of room for error. And it's really tame. I don't know if it would really strike fear into his heart the way we want it to. We're Marauders, we should be setting certain standards. They climbed through the portrait hole. Oh well, cause I just thought Snivellis could do with a good wash. Sirius laughed, then froze and gripped Remus' shoulder. Oh, you genius. You bloody genius. What? Remus asked, shocked. A good wash. That's what we'll do. It's easy, I bet. It'll be in one of those books. Wait here. He disappeared back through the portrait. Remus sighed, hungrily, and waited. So wait, explain it to me again. Remus whispered, as they finished their plates. He used the remains of his roast potato to mop up what remained of the gravy. He might have seconds he ate like a horse on the nights before the moon. It sounds complicated. It isn't. Sirius shook his head. I reckon it's easy. Weather spells are hard on a grand scale, but this only needs to be a cloud the size of this plate. He tapped the porcelain in front of him. Would it be like the ceiling? Remus asked, jerking his head up at the charmed rafters. It was raining, as it had been all Christmas, but the downpour vanished before it reached them. A bit, Sirius replied, but smaller. And without whatever charms are stopping us from getting wet. But, couldn't he just step away from it? Not if we combine it with a binding spell. But, we can't mix spells yet. Well, I can't. Can you? He looked up at Sirius, who was nodding vigorously. Yeah, I've been having a go at it. It's actually not too hard, you just have to concentrate. We'll practice, Sirius said, firmly. We'll practice loads, before James and Peter get back. They'll be dead impressed. There was no time for seconds after that, so Remus had to satisfy himself with the remainder of his Christmas biscuits as Sirius looked up weather charms. Once he'd found what he wanted, they both took it in turns, Sirius reading out the directions several times before they understood them. Though it was daunting to begin with, Remus quickly understood how the wand movement ought to flow and twist, while Sirius was best at pronunciation. It did take a lot of concentration, and it was nearly midnight by the time either of them had produced anything at all. Finally, Remus managed to cast a small grey cloud. It poured from his wand like smoke, then hovered between them for a few moments before bursting like a bubble, leaving only a faint trace of condensation. Sirius grinned, broadly. This is going to work. It was hard to shake off Sirius on the night of the full moon. Remus even told him he was feeling sick, but then Sirius wanted to accompany him to the hospital wing. Eventually Remus managed to convince him that he ought to stay behind and keep practicing the rain cloud charm. We've basically got it now, though, Sirius complained. It was true, they both managed to produce satisfactory miniature rainstorms. The bathroom had almost flooded in the process. It was just a matter of maintaining concentration and perfecting the binding aspect now. Find something else to do, then, Remus snapped, halfway out the door, skin crawling, stomach growling. I'll see you tomorrow. How do you know she'll keep you over knee? Remus had escaped before having to answer any more questions. He was getting careless, he thought to himself as he knocked on McGonagall's office door. Eventually he'd have to think of a decent excuse for all his absences. His friends were sure to connect the nights he vanished to the full moon. Eventually they all did astronomy together. That night the shack was cold, the walls damp from relentless rain. Remus wished he'd brought his wand. He'd learned to cast a good fire charm now. He supposed it would be no good if there was a fire blazing when he turned into a wolf. He might burn the whole place down. The transformation came on more suddenly than usual. Ever since Madame Pomfrey had told him they would get worse, he seemed to feel it more. Though he fought not to scream, his howls eventually echoed off the walls of the tunnel. The next day, Remus could barely get up after he changed back. He pulled a blanket around himself instead, and lay on the floor waiting for Madame Pomfrey to arrive. Every inch of him hurt, more than ever. His head pounded as if a troll had stomped on it. Every tooth in his jaw ached, and the tendons in his shoulders felt as if they'd been stretched so far they had snapped. He'd broken almost all of his fingernails, and there were huge claw marks in the wallpaper. At this rate, Remus didn't know how much longer he would be able to hide his secret. First year, the prank. Brilliant. James exclaimed, slamming his hand on the bathroom counter. Completely brilliant. You're so clever. Peter gushed. The four of them were crammed into the small shared bathroom. Sirius was standing in the bath, fully dressed, holding an umbrella over his head, while Remus pointed his wand at a grey storm cloud hovering just above that. It was pouring rain. Sirius shuffled up and down the bathtub, but the cloud stayed firmly above his head, following his every move. James and Peter had arrived back from their Christmas holidays only 2 hours ago, and as soon as dinner was over Remus and Sirius had dragged them upstairs for a demonstration. Lupin gave me the idea, but I looked up the charms to do it. Sirius beamed, proudly. He won't know what's hit him. When can we do it? James was jumping up and down, ready to explode with excitement. First thing tomorrow? Breakfast? Potions? Dinner? Sirius shook his head. More of an audience. Yes, dinner. James nodded, wisely, as if the idea had been his own. Seriously, you two, I'm so bloody proud. Sirius smiled. Then he looked at Remus. Lupin? You can stop now. My feet are getting wet. Sorry. Remus shook off the charm, seeing that he had produced more rain than the ancient flood hole could manage. Sirius was ankle deep in water, the bottom of his robe soaked. It's fine, Sirius laughed, stepping out of the bath and squeezing out his robes. Just make sure you do the same to Snape. So Lupin's doing this one? James asked. Sirius shrugged. He's better at it. I can do it too though, if we get interference. The first day of lessons after Christmas was a strange one. James, Sirius, and Peter were full of nervous energy in anticipation of the practical joke. Remus was looking forward to it too, though somewhat anxious, as it was he who had to pull it off. His magic was still slightly wonky following the full moon, liable to overreach and go off if he concentrated too hard. It didn't seem like a good idea to turn his wand on anything he didn't have to until the moon waned enough and he had more control. Even still, he was the first in the class to get his Brit to bounce even before Lily Evans, who was usually the top charm student. It was in the afternoon, during potions, that things began to go awry. It began with Slughorn returning their essays on the 12 uses of dragon blood. Remus had completed his before Christmas. As usual, Snape got the highest mark and earned 5 points for Slytherin. Lily was second and got a point for Gryffindor. She had only beaten Sirius by a few marks. None of this was out of the ordinary, but the tension of anticipation had grown too much for Sirius, and he couldn't resist getting a shot in. Wonder if it's worth cozying up to Snivellis just for one measly house point, he grumbled, loud enough for Lily and Snape to hear. Lily spun around, 2 bright pink patches on her cheeks. Oh, shut up, Black, she said. No one likes a sore loser. Hardly losing when your boyfriend lets you copy his work, Sirius whispered back. I do not copy him, and Severus is not my boyfriend. Lily's face was getting redder. You're blushing, Evans. Sirius smirked, pleased with himself. He nudged James. Isn't that sweet? James snickered, nodding along. Ignore them, Lily, Snape whispered, without turning his head. They're just jealous. Jealous of what, Snivellis? James jumped in, still trying to keep his voice down. Jealous of a slimy greasy git like you? Keep dreaming. Sirius laughed, pleased to have drawn James in. Peter laughed too, so as not to be left out. Slughorn was still oblivious with his back to the class as he scribbled instructions on the blackboard. Severus finally turned in his chair. He turned his beady black eyes on Sirius. I hear you had a very quiet Christmas, Black, he said, his voice low and full of danger. Your family couldn't stand to have you around for more than a few days before packing you off back to school, is that right? He smiled, cruelly. All of the pureblood families are talking about it, the Black's black sheep. Shut your face, Sirius growled through gritted teeth. Yeah, watch it, Snape. James was frowning. You'd better be careful what you say. Never know what might happen. Is that a threat, Potter? Snape asked, sounding bored. Going to set Looney Lupin on me again. Remus, who had been half listening to the posturing and half listening to Slughorn's instructions, flinched involuntarily. He raised his wand, but Sirius grabbed his wrist and pushed it down on the desk. Not yet, he muttered. Remus clenched his jaw and looked back at the blackboard, seething internally. Fear that Snape knew something about his secret turned into anger, like most of his emotions at this time. Snape chuckled and turned away. Remus heard Lily whisper angrily, there's no need to be so horrid to him. Sirius kept murmuring, we'll show him. Under his breath, throwing dark looks in Snape's direction. By the time dinner rolled around, Remus' annoyance had festered. He barely ate a thing, and it was shepherd's pie, one of his favorites. He glared at Snape from across the room. This did not go unnoticed, and Severus nudged the boys around him, pointing at the Marauders and laughing. James and Sirius frowned at them. Lily noticed too. You lot just leave Sev alone, okay, she said. This stupid fight is going to go on forever if none of you can. Give it a rest, Evans. James rolled his eyes. Bad enough you have to be friends with the tosser, now you are trying to defend him? Where's your house loyalty, Ed? This has nothing to do with houses, she snapped. It's a ridiculous spat over nothing. He insulted Remus. You pick on him all the time. He started it. Oh yeah, so you have to finish it, right, Potter? She stood up abruptly, picking up her bag. You're so full of yourselves. She walked away, her patent shoes clicking angrily on the flagstones. Loves a fight, that one. James grinned. There was a yelp of laughter from the Slytherin table and Remus decided he had had enough. He stood up, pulled out his wand, and pointed it at Severus. Ligaire pluvium. It was instantaneous and glorious. The ring cloud shot from Remus' wand with the speed of a bullet, so no one could even see where it had come from. It rested over Snape's head, thick, grey, and heavy. There was a low roll of thunder, and the downpour began. He didn't know what was happening at first, covering his head with his hands and looking up. The students sitting either side of Snape stood up and backed away, not wanting to get wet. Snape stood up, trying to dodge the cloud, but it followed him, hovering persistently with rain bucketing down. People were laughing now, and pointing. Everyone was looking around, trying to find who had done it, but no one had seen Remus cast it, except his friends. He sat down, but kept his wand trained on Severus, grinning as the boy tried to run away from the mini-storm. Yes. Sirius hissed in his ear. Bloody yes, Lupin, it's a beauty. The immense satisfaction Remus felt was compounded by the laughter echoing around him. Snape was such a nasty, spiteful boy, even some of the Slytherins looked pleased to see him get what he deserved. The more Remus thought about it, the more he wanted to punish him, and the harder it rained. The cloud darkened and swelled. Snape was soaked now, his hair plastered to his head, getting in his eyes. His skin was pale and his robes shining with water, a puddle forming beneath him. Remus grinned as Severus looked more and more like a drowned rat. Stop it. Lily was screeching at James. I know it's you. Stop it now. James kept laughing and held up his hands to show that he wasn't doing anything. Lily looked close to tears. Severus made to run, arms over his head to stop the rain pelting him, but his robes were so heavy and waterlogged he half tripped, half slid onto the floor. Remus would have laughed, but his concentration deepened. The rain fell harder still, until it was difficult to see Severus through the grey sheets. The cloud was bigger too, crackling with thunder and lightning. It had never done that when he'd practiced on Sirius. But then, he hadn't been angry at Sirius. Stop it. Please. Lily was sobbing now. James had stopped laughing. He touched Remus' arm. Remus? He's had enough, mate. Snape wasn't getting up. Remus realized that no one was laughing anymore, and a few people were screaming. Finite. A voice boomed through the dining hall. At once, the rain stopped. Everyone was silent. Dumbledore stood in the entranceway. Remus hadn't seen him since Halloween. He looked perfectly calm, despite the chaos. The headmaster swept into the room, vanishing all the water with a wave of his wand. He bent over Severus. Remus put away his wand and shrank into his seat, watching Dumbledore whispering over Snape's body. Lily ran to stand beside Dumbledore, trembling. Everybody to your dormitories, please, Dumbledore spoke quietly, but was somehow heard by everyone in the huge hall. Miss Evans, please fetch Madame Pomfrey. Lily ran from the room, and the other students began to file out, obediently. James, Sirius, and Remus all shot nervous glances at each other before hurrying to join the rest of their house. First year, aftermath. Most of the Gryffindors hung around in the common room, gossiping, all wondering who could have done it. The Marauders, usually keen to be at the center of any debate, crept upstairs, pale-faced with guilt. Remus sat on his bed, staring at the floor. He had gone too far, he knew that. It had felt good. Too good. Was he turning into a monster? The others were looking at him oddly. He knew Dumbledore would find out somehow, if Lily didn't tell. Everyone as soon as she got back to the common room. What happened? James asked, carefully. Did you lose control of it? That was really strong magic. It was amazing. Sirius said. He'll think twice about crossing us again. But, I mean, we didn't want to hurt him, did we? James grimaced. He's fine, he was just pretending, to get us in trouble. Will we get in trouble? Peter asked, wringing his hands. We didn't all do it, did we? It was only. Sirius slapped him around the back of his head. You rat, he said. We're Marauders. All for one and one for all. Whatever that means, Peter muttered sulkily, rubbing his head and going to sit on his own bed. I did it, you lot shouldn't get in trouble, Remus said, not looking up. It was half my idea. Sirius said. I did the research. Don't worry, Lupin, I bet you anything he's fine. Well, that would be no thanks to me. Remus met James' brown eyes. They were more serious than usual. I didn't mean to hurt him. James held his gaze, and nodded slightly. There was a knock at the door, diffusing the tension. It was Frank Longbottom. You four are to come to McGonagall's office, now, he said, gravely. They followed Frank down the stairs and through the common room, where everyone stared at them. Remus kept his eyes on his feet the whole time, but heard the chatter go quiet as they walked through. It didn't matter what happened next, everyone would know they were responsible. McGonagall was not alone. Dumbledore stood beside her desk, his hands folded in front of him. He smiled pleasantly at the four boys who stood in a line before him. Good evening, gentlemen, he said. Good evening, headmaster, they chanted back. You may be interested to know that young Mr. Snape is quite well, though his pride has been rather wounded. The Marauders said nothing. Remus didn't look up. He seemed to think that you four had something to do with his misfortune, Dumbledore continued, as if he was just passing the time of day. Particularly you, Mr. Potter. James looked up, opened his mouth, then closed it again and looked down. Remus couldn't bear it. He only had 3 friends in the world, and he wasn't going to lose them now. He stepped forward. It was me, sir, I did it. He said some stuff to me earlier, and I was angry with him. I wanted to teach him a lesson. He forced himself to look up into Dumbledore's pale blue, piercing eyes. The old man nodded. I see. You acted alone. Yes. Remus pulled out his wand. Look, I can prove it. No need. Dumbledore said, hurriedly. I believe you, Mr. Lupin. It wasn't just him, sir. Sirius burst out. I looked up the spell, I learned how to do it too. It's just as much my fault. You mean you planned this, Black? McGonagall said, sharply. You planned an attack on another pupil? 10 points from Gryffindor. Each. Sirius winced. And detention for all of you, for a month, she continued. I find it very hard to believe that any of you acted alone. All 4 of them hung their heads. You may go, gentlemen, said Dumbledore. I have no doubt you will all take the time to apologize to Mr. Snape, of course. Sirius made an indignant noise, and James elbowed him roughly. They turned to leave. Mr. Lupin, just a moment. Remus froze. He should have known he wouldn't get away that easily. He stood still as the others left the room, McGonagall following them out to make sure they didn't loiter. Once the door closed, a still silence fell. Dumbledore didn't speak immediately, and finally Remus raised his head to meet the headmaster's eyes. He didn't look angry, or disappointed. He wore his usual cheerful expression tinged with curiosity. How have you been finding Hogwarts, Remus? That wasn't the question he had anticipated. Okay, I suppose. You seem to have had no problem making friends. That wasn't the question, so Remus didn't answer it. He shuffled his feet. Am I getting expelled? He asked. Dumbledore smiled. No, Remus, no one is getting expelled. I can see that you are sorry for what you've done. The thing that concerns me is how you did it. That was a very strong spell for a first year to accomplish. You must have been very angry. Remus nodded. Passion is an important quality in a wizard, Remus, said Dumbledore. It directs our magic, and strengthens it. But as you learned today, if we do not exercise control then we endanger everyone around us. He looked more serious now. The twinkle in his eyes had turned to a steady flame. I don't wish to frighten you, Remus. When we first met, I told you that I sympathized with you. The hand you have been dealt is not one I would wish on anyone. But you must be more careful. You are a gifted wizard. Don't waste your skill. Remus nodded for what felt like the 100th time, wanting more than anything for the conversation to be over. The worst part was that Dumbledore was right. He had let his anger towards Severus influence the spell he'd used. He just wasn't used to having that kind of strength. I'm sorry, Professor, he said. Is Severus okay? Yes, he's perfectly fine. I think he was hoping that if he simply stopped struggling then whoever was casting the spell would stop. He's been dried off and won't suffer any long-term effects. Oh, said Remus. Good. Now. Dumbledore's eyes were twinkling again. Off you go. I've kept you long enough and have a feeling that Mr. Potter is waiting outside for you to tell him everything. Dumbledore had given Remus a lot to think about. And he had plenty of time to think McGonagall was serious about their detentions, and even went so far as to split the 4 of them up. Sirius was tasked with scrubbing cauldrons in the dungeons, Peter with polishing the trophies in the awards room, and James with reconfiguring every astronomy telescope in the tower. Remus was given the worst task of all, mucking out the Oi. Of course, none of them were permitted to use their wands and every night they had to begin all over again. Cruel and unusual is what it is, Peter complained at the end of the first week as they fell into bed, filthy and exhausted. To know what you are moaning about, Sirius grumbled. I'd love to polish trophies. Who knows what I've caught scraping out crusty potions from the bottoms of those bloody cauldrons. James just groaned, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. Remus didn't complain, because he didn't feel he deserved to. He felt terrible for getting all of his friends into trouble, but even more terrible for what he had done. He was getting behind on homework not only because of his punishment, but the extra reading he'd been doing. Remus had finally gathered up the courage to visit the library and borrow a book from one of the magical creature shelves. Every night, after they had served their detentions, Remus would draw the curtains around his bed, light his wand, and read the same chapter over and over. There were entire books written on his particular problem, but he was terrified someone would become suspicious if he started checking them out. Plus, he wasn't sure he wanted to know any more. The things he'd read so far were bad enough. He thought about the book almost constantly in his lessons, at mealtimes, during detention. Words like monstrous, deadly, and darkest of creatures flashed in his mind like fireworks. He'd known he was dangerous. He'd known he was different. He hadn't known he was hated. Hunted, even. Apparently, his teeth were worth thousands in certain parts of Eastern Europe. His pelt was worth even more. There were legislative details too, things he didn't fully understand, but which sounded horrible. Employment laws and registries and travel restrictions. He understood why Dumbledore had told him to be careful. It was clear that if anyone at Hogwarts found out what Remus was, he might be in real trouble and expulsion would be the least of his concerns. Frustratingly, nothing he read was relevant to his daily experiences. There was no account of a wizard actually living with the condition, how they had managed, what to expect, whether they had been able to hold down a job, or even just avoid hurting others. He'd assumed it was normal that he could smell blood and hear heartbeats, but how could he know for sure? Was it normal that his magic was stronger when the moon was rising? Sometimes he thought he could feel the sheer power of it, fizzing in his veins like a shaken potion, filling him up and spilling over until it burst from his fingertips. And then there was his temper. How much of that was him, and how much of it was the monster? He lay awake most nights after reading, too restless to sleep. His mind whirred with worry and fear. How simple everything had seemed before Hogwarts. No learning magic, no homework, no agonizing moral dilemmas. And, of course, no friends. If anything stopped Remus from just giving up then, it was that. It was James, who had an ego the size of the lake, but a heart to match it. Peter who, granted, was weird and a bit clueless, actually had a wicked sense of humor and could be unfailingly generous. And of course Sirius. Sirius could keep secrets, had a mean streak but never directed it at his friends, was the most gifted student in the year but spent all his time coming up with pranks instead. Remus wasn't going to give up any of that, not if he could help it. Even if he had to be the swattiest student in the school, if he had to force himself to read every book, complete every assignment, follow every rule. He'd be so good they wouldn't know what hit them. So good they'd have to make him a prefect. He'd do it all, if it meant staying at Hogwarts and keeping his friends. There was nobody to talk to about any of these things. Nobody who would understand. As far as Remus knew, only Dumbledore, McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey knew about his condition. McGonagall was too severe to approach with questions like that. Remus still wasn't sure that Dumbledore was entirely sane, and anyway he had no idea how to make an appointment with the headmaster. So it had to be Madame Pomfrey, in the end. He waited until the next moon, which came at the end of January. It was a Sunday, so after dinner, he separated himself from the Marauders and headed to the hospital wing earlier than usual. Remus. The nurse smiled at him, surprised. I didn't expect you until nightfall. I wanted to ask you some stuff, he said, shyly, eyes darting around the room. There were a few students lying in beds, most of them sleeping. Fortunately Madame Pomfrey was very discreet. Certainly, shall we pop into my office? It was much nicer than any of the teachers' offices Remus had been in so far. The walls were lined with hundreds of neat and orderly bottles of potions and tonics. It was light and airy. She didn't have a desk, and instead of wooden seats there were comfortable armchairs seated on either side of the fireplace. How can I help, dear? She asked, settling in, gesturing that he sit down. Well, he swallowed, not sure how to begin. I had a few questions about my problem. She smiled kindly at him. Of course you do, Remus, that's perfectly natural. Is there something specific you would like to know? Yet. I did a bit of reading, I know there isn't a cure or anything. Not yet, she said, quickly. Advancements are being made all the time. Oh, okay. But, for now, I suppose I just want to know more about it. I don't remember anything when I wake up, just that I get really hungry. You'd like to know more about the transformation? No, not just that. Stuff like, does it change who I am, the rest of the time? Does it make me? He looked down at his hands, at a loss. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, and there was a hard lump in his throat. Remus, Madame Pomfrey said. This is a condition you have, it isn't who you are. I get angry, sometimes, he said, staring into the fire rather than looking her in the face. I get really, really angry. Everyone has emotions, they're perfectly natural. We just learn to control them, over time. He nodded, taking this in. He couldn't tell her the rest. When I change, it's getting worse. Harder. Yes, she replied, solemnly. I did read that it can get worse with the onset of puberty. Oh. Remus nodded. There was a long pause. How much worse? I couldn't say. You really are the first of your kind that I've treated. Another silence. Remus felt no better than he had before, no less confused. Would you like to borrow that book I mentioned? He nodded, finally bringing himself to look at her. Madame Pomfrey's book, Furtive Fangs, Caring for Magical Half-Humans was moderately more helpful than some of the others Remus had read so far. There was still a lot he couldn't understand, advanced healing magic and complicated potion recipes, more details on legislation, and even more terrifying, trials and persecution. Conversely, there was a lot he already knew. He had been bitten, and mustn't be allowed to bite anyone else during a full moon. Silver hurt him, there was no cure. The book did indeed say that with the onset of puberty his transformations would increase in intensity, and that he would become more dangerous afterwards. It didn't mention changes in abilities, magical or otherwise, and there was nothing solid referring to changes in mood or temper. He didn't consider it particularly interesting or important to know that he had a shorter snout than real wolves or that his tail tufted. He'd rather not think about having either, but was curious to discover that he was only a threat to humans, particularly wizards. Apparently other animals were in no danger from him. He amused himself thinking that Mrs. Norris was safe, at least. It didn't go unnoticed that Remus had withdrawn from the Marauders since the attack on Snape. Where have you been? They'd ask, every evening as they all dressed for bed. Homework, he'd say with a shrug, or sometimes, detention, though he hadn't had another detention since the prank. The truth was, he was always as far away from other people as he could get. He tried to stay out of their room until it was time to sleep, and avoided the common room if he could. He felt that until he could control his magic, he'd better not get involved in any more of James and Sirius schemes. And they were scheming, he knew that for sure. Sometimes at night Remus could hear them sneaking into each other's beds, then whispering furtively before casting a silencing charm. Other times they crept out with Peter, under the cloak. They always tried to wake Remus, but he ignored them. During the day he hid away at the back of the library, or else in one of his secret places. He'd found places all over the castle that were small enough to climb inside and go undiscovered for hours at a time. Windows that had been long bricked over, but retained high, broad ledges, small, empty chambers like priest holes concealed behind tapestries, the fifth-floor girls' bathroom. There he could curl up and read for hours. Sometimes he actually did his homework, other times he forced himself to research his condition. He had another reason to hide. Since the incident, Snape's hatred towards the Marauders had intensified, and he went everywhere with Mulciber, using him as personal protection. If they crossed paths in the hallways Remus always had to be ready with a shielding charm. Mulciber knew more hexes than Sirius and James combined. One afternoon, Remus was deep into a book on ancient battle magic. There was a chapter on the Ulfhebner, Germanic wolf warriors who fought the Romans. He was sitting high up on his favorite window ledge and couldn't be seen from the floor unless someone was really looking. He'd climbed up using a rope charm they'd learned a few weeks ago. He was just about to climb down and go for dinner, when he made a wrong move and knocked the heavy book off the ledge. He winced as it plummeted to the hard stone floor with a deafening thud. Who's there? A voice came from further up the corridor. He heard footsteps, and with a sinking feeling, Remus realized he knew who it was. It's just a book, Mulciber said, sullenly. Yes, but where did it come from? Snape asked, suspicious. Mulciber huffed. The library. Snape muttered under his breath, exasperated. Remus pressed as hard as he could against the stone wall. Who's up there? Snape called in his nasal, spiteful voice. Silence. Hominum revelio. Remus felt an odd tugging sensation in his stomach and before he knew it, was pulled from the ledge by an unseen force. He yelped, scrambling for something to hold onto, and ended up dangling from the ledge by his fingertips. Snape and Mulciber were laughing below. Well, Snape purred. If it isn't Looney Lupin, where are your little friends, Put you up there and forgotten about you. Get out of here, Snape, Remus hissed, losing purchase on the stone. He hoped he wouldn't break his ankles when he finally dropped. Ignis got them. Snape smirked, pointing his wand. A thin rope of fire shot towards Remus, forcing him to kick off from the wall. He landed on his back on the floor, hard. He blinked, winded, but quickly climbed to his feet, withdrawing his own wand. Okay, he said, back sore from the fall. You got me. Now go away. Why on earth would we do that? Severus asked, facing him and raising his wand. Expelli. Expelliarmus, Snape roared, beating him to it. He clutched Remus' wand, gleefully, then added, Galesco. Remus felt his feet fuse with the ground, sticking him in place. He groaned. He was stuck now. It might be worth calling for help, but the corridor was a quiet one, and he didn't want to look like a coward. He stared at them both and set his jaw. Mulcyber, Snape turned to his troll-like companion. Weren't we just saying the other day that you need to practice a few hexes? I feel like this might be the perfect opportunity. Mulcyber grinned, licking his lips. He raised his own wand, not quite as elegantly as Severus, but with the same malicious intent. Lapidosis. Nothing happened for a moment, and Remus felt a surge of relief before out of nowhere, a cloud of tiny stones like gravel appeared floating in midair. It hovered between Remus and Mulcyber for a few moments, before flying at Remus's face, like a swarm of angry bees. He raised his arms to protect himself, but Severus was too quick. Incarcerus, he said, yawning as if bored. Remus found himself bound tightly by rope, hardly able to move at all. The stones kept pelting themselves at him and all he could do was shut his eyes. He struggled, knowing it wouldn't help, but needing to do something. He didn't want to cry, even when he felt a hot trickle of blood slide down his temple. What's going on, Severus? A girl's voice came from the end of the hall. Finite incantatum, Snape whispered, hurriedly. The stones stopped at once, the rope vanished, and Remus' legs came unstuck. He wobbled and staggered backwards to lean against the wall. Remus looked up in time to see his savior, Lily, hurrying towards them. She stopped when she saw Remus, who was quickly trying to wipe the blood from his face. She looked at Snape and frowned. What are you doing, Sev? Nothing. He scuffed the toe of his shoe on the flagstones. Just chatting. With Lupin, weren't we, Mulcyber? Mulcyber shrugged. Lily looked at Remus, who looked away, embarrassed. He snatched his wand from Severus, turned and walked away as fast as he could. Wait. Remus. Lily ran after him. He didn't stop for her, but she was quick on her feet, and caught him up. She was clutching his battle magic book in one arm, and grabbed hold of him with the other. Please, she huffed. He stopped, sighing heavily. He wanted his book back. What? He scowled. What were they doing to you? Sev won't tell me, and I know it was bad. It's fine, Remus said, taking his book. You're bleeding. Leave off, Evans. Remus pushed her away, trying to get away. She kept hurrying alongside him. I told him to stop picking on you, I don't know why he does it. I mean, you don't even go around with Potter and Black anymore, I told him that. Why would that matter? They're the ones he really wants to annoy. If he knows that you've got sick of them too, then... Wait. Remus stopped, and Lily nearly collided into him. Are you saying that you'd be okay with it if Mulcyber and Snape were cursing James and Sirius instead of me? Well, Lily flushed, I mean, it would be a fair fight at least. And, you know, they do bring it on themselves, acting the way they do. Remus felt even more uncomfortable now. She thought James and Sirius had attacked Severus both times. She had no idea it was him. Did everyone in the castle think he was as pathetic as Peter? You're wrong. Remus frowned. Now leave me alone, will you? First year, astronomy. Great to have you back, Lupin. Sirius grinned, pulling back the invisibility cloak as they entered the, previously locked, defense against the dark arts classroom. What do you mean? Remus asked, watching James climb the ladder in the corner of the room to reach the highest shelf, where stood a cage of sleeping pixies. I haven't been anywhere. Come on, mate, Peter said, holding the ladder for James. It hasn't escaped our notice that you've been avoiding us like the plague. I haven't. Remus twisted his mouth. Just been busy. You know, studying and stuff. Well, I hope you're over that phase now, James laughed, slowly climbing down, clutching a huge cage in both hands. I'd really appreciate it if you stopped working so hard. It makes me have to work hard, you see, and I'm not used to the competition. Oh, do one, Potter, said Sirius, rummaging through drawers and inside desks. Remus had decided that this prank wouldn't be too bad. It didn't require him to use any magic, anyway. If he was completely honest with himself, he had really missed their mischief. Being a swot was all well and good, but it wasn't half boring. No wonder Evans was always frowning. How are we going to get them into the dining hall, he asked, bending down to gaze at the little blue creatures, still sleeping, curled up at the bottom of the cage. There must have been 50 of them, which Remus felt was rather cruel. Much better to liberate them. Under the cloak, James replied, spreading it wide now so that they could all get under. Come on, Sirius. He rolled his eyes at the long-haired boy who was now on his hands and knees under the teacher's desk. What are you even looking for? Peter asked, muffled under the cloak. One of the Ravenclaws told me there was a trapdoor under here. Sirius sighed, getting up and dusting off his knees. Liar. This is Black's newest obsession, James explained to Remus as he closed the cloak over them and they headed for the exit. Finding secret doors. Hogwarts, a history says there are loads of undiscovered passages. Sirius said. Like that one you found, Lupin. There are definitely more. I want to find at least one before we leave. There's also supposed to be a monster hidden somewhere in the castle, James whispered back, as they made their way along the halls towards Gryffindor Tower. Peter shuddered. A risk I'm willing to accept, said Sirius, and Remus could hear the grin in his voice. Wolf face, dog face. The next evening at dinner, James was grinning like someone trying to look like he wasn't hiding 50 sleeping pixies underneath the table. Peter, who was good at astronomy, was busy checking over the other Marauders' homework, which was to label every star on their chart. Honestly, Peter groaned, scribbling something on Sirius. You'd think you'd get your own bloody star right. Sirius laughed. What can I say? I'm hopeless. You have your own star. Remus never paid attention in astronomy. He knew the phases of the moon and that was plenty. Sirius, Peter replied. Come on, Lupin, we've done this. It's the brightest star in the sky. The dog star. He sighed, looking at Remus' work now. Yep, you've missed it too, he groaned. Remus shrugged. I just thought it was his name. The noble and most ancient house of Black has always been a bit loopy with its naming conventions, Sirius mused. Half of us have astronomical names. There's Bellatrix, of course, my dad's Orion, my brother's Regulus. Mum isn't a star, I think she's an asteroid apt, if you've ever seen her in a bad mood. Then there's good old Uncle Alphard, Uncle Cygnus. Andromeda's named after a whole galaxy. Blacks are weird, Remus said. Remus, James said, you do know that Lupis is a constellation too, don't you? The wolf. Remus nearly choked on his dinner. Sirius slapped him hard on the back, deftly changing the subject. If you're nearly finished telling us all how stupid we are, Pete, can we get on with releasing the you-know-whats? My lovely cousins have just started eating, so I call that perfect timing. It really was perfect. James gave the cage a sharp kick to wake the pixies before sweeping away the cloak and whispering a quick unlocking charm on the cage. There was an explosion of noise, color, and chaos. Remus hadn't really known what to expect from the pixies. They'd seemed harmless all night and day while they'd been locked up sleeping under James' bed. Now he could see exactly why Sirius and James had been so excited. They burst like a firework from under the table in all directions, chattering in high-pitched gibberish and zooming across the great hall. The pixies leapt into plates of mashed potato, squealing with delight, grabbed plates and cutlery out of students' hands and flung them across the room. They pulled ponytails and tore parchment. Quick. James ducked under the table, where they all crouched under the invisibility cloak, watching the anarchy. Brilliant. Sirius kept saying. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Come in, Remus said, nudging the other boys forward. Their plan had been to observe for a while, then sneak out of the hall as quickly as possible without getting caught. All four of them navigated their way out from under the table, which was made awkward by other students attempting to dive for cover. Fortunately, pixies couldn't see through invisibility cloaks, so they didn't interfere. In the uproar, no one else noticed them either. Girls were screaming and boys shouting. Everyone was trying to cover their heads, protect themselves from dive-bombing pixies, or struggling to grab back their stolen items. Oh yes. Sirius burst into fitful laughter. Remus turned and saw Bellatrix, screaming at the top of her lungs, her wild hair being yanked from side to side by tiny blue pests. One fluttered above and was waving her wand at her, zapping blue lightning. Get off me. You filthy disgusting UARG, she wailed. Narcissa was cowering under the table, clutching her own wand tightly. Things escalated further when Peeves the poltergeist entered the room, zipping about gleefully and causing just as much havoc. He seemed to be directing the pixies, lifting tablecloths, and screeching, "Under here, piskies. Lots of ickle firsties down here." Stifling laughter, the Marauders fled from the room when they heard McGonagall's shrill voice cry, "Petrificus totalis." "She's definitely going to know it was us," Peter said, as they made their way back to the tower under the cloak. "Nah," James said. "I bet she blames it on the Pruitts, they always do big stuff like that. Something to aspire to." At this rate, Lupin thought, their aspirations would be fulfilled in no time. First year, 12. Remus' 12th birthday fell on a Friday that year. Usually on Fridays after lessons James would force them all to go and watch the Gryffindor Quidditch practice, and Remus would read quietly to himself. Sirius, however, had managed to convince James that he could miss just one practice, especially as he wasn't even on the team yet, and that Remus might actually want to do something different on his birthday. He was woken early in the morning by his 3 dorm mates piling onto his bed, shouting, "Happy birthday, Lupin." At breakfast, James and Sirius marched ahead, pushing other students out of the way as they approached their usual seats, loudly announcing, "Out of the way, please. Birthday boy coming through. Move along, nothing to see here." Remus wanted to hide under the table by the time they'd reached it. His 3 friends made a huge show of serving him his breakfast, rather than letting him get anything for himself. Peter poured his tea, and James loaded his plate while Sirius buttered his toast. "Do you have to?" Remus asked. "Absolutely," James said. "Definitely," Peter nodded. "Unquestionably," finished Sirius. Remus shook his head, blushing at his food. When he had finished, which took a while, because he had been served double portions of everything, they all stood up with devious expressions. "What?" he asked, twitching. Peter and James each put a hand on his shoulder, forcing him to sit down again. Sirius pulled a pitch pipe from his robes and blew a long note. Remus squeezed his eyes shut. "Hey, PPY birthday to you," the 3 boys bellowed at the tops of their voices. "Hey, PPY birthday to you. Hey, PPY birthday dear Muse." Now the rest of the hall joined in. "Hey, PPY birthday to you. Hip hip." James yelled, standing on his chair. "Hooray, the Gryffindors chorused back. "At least that's over and done with," Remus muttered, his face burning as they finished cheering. Peter looked at him with pity. "Sorry mate, but they're planning to do the same at lunch and dinner." They still had to sit through potions as their last lesson of the week. Remus had found that even when he did all his homework and understood all the texts he still had no natural talent for potion making. On top of that, it was a boring subject, and when Slughorn began to bang on about the 5 key components of sleeping drafts Remus began to doze off himself. Snape didn't bother him. Actually, Snape hadn't so much as glanced in Remus' direction since the incident in the corridor. Lily flashed him a smile and wished him happy birthday, before rolling her huge emerald eyes as James and Sirius attempted to convince Slughorn not to give them any homework out of respect for the occasion. At dinner Remus endured what he hoped was his final round of happy birthday, which became the loudest yet, largely because Dumbledore was present and began conducting the entire school. The headmaster bellowed at the top of his voice. Remus also received cards, one from the whole of Gryffindor House, another from his parents along with a big crate of butterbeer. At some point, a cake was produced, with red and gold Gryffindor icing, and 12 pink candles. When Remus cut it open, all the while encouraged to make a wish, but not able to think of one single thing he wanted, he was amazed to find that it was made of 4 different flavors: a quarter chocolate, a quarter lemon drizzle, a quarter Victoria sponge, and a quarter coffee and walnut. "Like your toast." Sirius was thrilled at the expression of surprise on Remus' face. "Thought you might get bored if it was all one flavor." "Wow, thanks. So what do you want to do for the rest of the evening?" James asked. "It still looks light enough if you did want to go and watch the..." "He doesn't, James. Bloody hell, you're going to have to start developing some other interests, mate, you're getting boring." "I don't mind if you want to go and watch the Quidditch practice," Remus said. "You've already done plenty, honestly. 3 songs in one day, what more could a 12-year-old ask for?" James shook his head, nobly. "Sirius is right, it's your birthday, we'll do something you like doing." They were all quiet for a little while, before James cleared his throat. Lupin? What do you like doing?" Remus thought. He could easily give a list of things he did not enjoy doing: homework, flying, potions. No one had ever asked him what sort of things he did enjoy. "Reading," Peter said, trying to be helpful. "You read a lot." "Do I?" Remus hadn't thought about that, but it was true. Since Christmas he'd finished all his set texts for the year plus a few books checked out from the library. "Oh yeah, great." James rolled his eyes. "Happy birthday, Lupin, let's start a book club." Sirius sniggered and Peter looked annoyed. "Well, I don't know. Other than reading, you seem to really like detention, Remus." Remus laughed at that, holding his hands up. "Sorry lads, I reckon I must just be really boring." "What about when you disappear off?" Sirius asked, suddenly. Remus balked. "What do you mean?" "I told you, I've been sick, I go to the hospital wing." Sirius waved a hand. "No, not then. Sometimes you go off after lessons, or while we're watching Quidditch." "What are you doing?" Remus felt heat rush to his cheeks. He'd been wandering off by himself less, but clearly his friends had still noticed. They all looked at him, expectantly. He bit his lip. "I just sort of walk around," he said, lamely. "Where, though?" Peter asked. "On the grounds. Everywhere." Remus shrugged. "I just like to look about. So I know where stuff is." He pulled the map out of his back pocket, thinking quickly. "I started adding stuff to the map they gave us at the beginning of the year, and whenever I see something interesting I put it in." James took the map and unfolded it. The 3 boys peered over to see. They were quiet for a while. Sirius looked in awe. "You've added all of the portraits, and labeled them and everything." My spelling's rubbish." Remus fumbled over his words. James' face was scrunched up. "What's that?" He pointed at a mark Remus had made on one of the staircases. "One of the trick steps," Remus said. "That's the one you can sink into. That one." He pointed to a mark on a different step, "is the one that vanishes. The staircases with arrows are the ones that move. I color-coded so you can see where they end up." "Merlin." Peter exhaled. "Do you have any idea how much time this would save me? I swear I get trapped on the wrong corridor twice a week because of those damn stairs." "And me," James said. "Stop getting to lessons on time." Sirius said. "Please try to recognize the extremely important implications of this map. The possibilities now available to us for practical jokes." A smile spread across James' face, then Peter's. Remus snatched back the map and folded it. It's not finished yet. There's loads to do. I wanted to do some spells on it, once I figure out how. What sort of spells? Sirius asked. Remus hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his friend's interest, but he really wanted to work the map out for himself, as silly as it sounded. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Remus still had a desire to prove himself. Just some improvements, he said. You'll think it's silly. No, we won't, Peter said earnestly. We can help. I suppose, it's my map, though. Of course it's your map, James soothed. Like the cloak is mine, right? But in the service of mischief. It belongs to the Marauders, Sirius finished, eyes twinkling. It's the Marauders map. But it's still mostly yours, Lupin. We'll put your name first in everything. Not sure if we want our names on it, Peter said with a wince. Our nicknames then, Sirius said. We don't have nicknames, Remus pointed out. He was actually relieved. He'd been starting to wonder if it wasn't just some private insanity of his tracking and logging everything in the castle, getting it down, making sense of it. Although, James, Sirius and Peter seemed less interested in the satisfaction of the task, and more keen on planning their next prank with it. The rest of the evening was spent under the cloak, roaming the halls. The cloak, in Remus' opinion, wasn't strictly necessary, as they were planning to be back before curfew. But James and Sirius never missed an opportunity to turn even the smallest trip into a full-scale mission, and Peter enjoyed sneaking about unseen. Remus realized more fully why James had insisted on it, however, when Sirius produced 5 dung bombs for them to entertain themselves with en route. They crept up behind unsuspecting snogging couples, and dropped them into the pockets of older students hurrying to the library. Remus showed them what he'd worked out so far, the passages and shortcuts he'd discovered, and even a few of his hidden places, not all of them, just in case. He even told them his plan to put some kind of tracking spell on Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, so that he'd be able to see her coming. They loved the idea. Why stop there? Sirius whispered, as they turned a corner back to the common room at the end of the night. Why not track everyone? Everyone. Yeah, then we'd know when anyone was coming, and we could get away with anything. I dunno, Remus replied. What would happen when his friends saw him traveling down to the Whomping Willow every month? How long before they decided to follow him and got themselves killed? For the first time, Remus realized that the map was not as harmless as he first thought. Unfortunately, James and Peter were busy agreeing with Sirius, saying it was an excellent idea, already imagining being able to see what Dumbledore was up to, or where Snape was lurking. Remus firmly believed that given enough time, Sirius Black and James Potter truly could do anything. It was just who they were. He only hoped that it would be a long time yet. First year, revision. Time seemed to speed up after Remus' birthday. The days lengthened and spring rushed into the castle, flooding it with sunlight and fresh air after the long winter. Exams loomed, and Remus had finally delved into some of the heavy werewolf books, spending more time in the library. Instead of planning new schemes and pranks, the Marauders found their evenings devoted to practicing spells and quizzing each other on potion ingredients. Sirius and James took the exam seriously. It was a competition to them. It didn't bother Remus even if he wasn't getting top marks in everything. He was still doing better than he ever had before. He was glad his family didn't pressure him. The pressure on Peter was all too evident. He wasn't a bad student by any means. In herbology and astronomy he even flourished, often beating James. However, he was still very nervous, and it tended to affect his wand work, making his incantations sloppy. Peter didn't talk about his family much, but received a lot of letters from them. Remus noticed James was always careful around the subject. How much do we need to pass the year? Peter would ask with a look of desperation on his round face, at least 4 times a day. Peter, calm down, James would say. You know all the theory backwards now, it's just putting it into practice. I don't blame him for being a bit twitchy, Sirius whispered to Remus when the other two were out of earshot. There have been at least 12 squibs in the Pettigrew family, and that's just this century. Squibs. Non-magical wizards, Sirius explained. You know how Muggle families sometimes have magical kids? It works the other way too. No one likes to talk about it much. My great-uncle actually had this mad theory that Muggles were swapping their children with ours so that they could infiltrate the wizarding world. Completely bonkers, obviously. Right, Remus said. So that's why Peter's magic is a bit wonky. I dunno. Sirius shook his head. Maybe. I'm not sure if they can actually prove that squibbishness runs in families. But it's the reason the Pettigrews aren't in the Sacred 28. Remus fixed Sirius with his most withering look. You know I don't know what that is. The Sacred 28 are the purest of the pure bloods. The last remaining untainted families. Their words, not mine. You know I don't believe any of that blood purity rubbish. Remus raised an eyebrow. Bet the blacks are top of the list. Actually, Sirius replied, the abbots are first. It's alphabetical. Remus went back to his potions revision. Something was worrying Remus far more than passing the year. As Madame Pomfrey had predicted, since he had turned 12, his transformations had become much worse. There was no explanation for this in any of the books he read, other than some vague words about adolescence and puberty. He was spending longer stretches in the hospital wing, and it was getting too hard to explain away. His friends now wondered aloud about what on earth could be ailing him, sometimes suggesting he was putting it on to get out of lessons, other times teasing him about being contagious. Whereas before he might have come away with a few teeth and claw marks, the kind you'd get from a playful puppy who meant no real harm, Remus awoke with deep, furious gashes which bled copiously until Madame Pomfrey arrived to staunch them. The agony of the transformation itself reached almost intolerable levels, and he often felt queasy for hours before the moon rose. How on earth he was going to get through the summer at home was beyond him. Sirius clearly wasn't looking forward to the summer either. He grew uncharacteristically quiet whenever the upcoming holiday was mentioned, eyes clouding over, and the color leaving his face. James invited all of them to stay at his for as long as they wanted, but Sirius remained pessimistic. You know they'll never let me, he sighed. Cheer up. James slung an arm around his friend. They sat together on the big couch in the common room. Peter was in an armchair concentrating on turning a banana into a slipper. It wasn't working. Remus was lying on his belly in front of the fireplace. He had a cut on his back that wasn't knitting together properly, even after Madame Pomfrey's ministrations, and had found that this was the only position which was comfortable. Sirius plainly didn't want to cheer up. They won't though. Bellatrix's bloody wedding is in June. You can bet I'll have to be around for all of it. We got an invite to that, Peter said, looking up from his slipper, which was still bright yellow and looked unpleasantly squishy. Probably see you there. Yeah, great. Sirius exhaled so hard his hair fluffed up over his forehead. If I haven't been turned into a newt, or cursed into a portrait for the summer, they actually did that to Andromeda once. She's never been the same. After the wedding then we'll work something out, James told him. I'll break you out of there, if I have to, I solemnly swear. Sirius grinned at James and James grinned back. Their body language mirrored perfectly and Remus felt a pang of loneliness. James obviously knew a lot more about Sirius' family. They talked a lot at night, the pair of them, sometimes putting silencing charms around their beds so as not to disturb the others. You too, Lupin, James was saying. Remus lifted his head from his thoughts. He arched his back carefully and tried not to grimace when the pain split down it like a bolt of lightning. You should come and stay over the summer. We've got loads of room, and Mum doesn't mind. Can't. Remus shook his head, turning back to his book. His back was on fire. I have stuff to do with my family. Eventually though, James said. Both of you are coming, I'm making it happen. Remus smiled, but knew he would never stay at James' house. During summer, the full moons were due at the end of each month as they always were. I think I've done it. Peter gasped, holding his bright yellow slipper aloft. Well done, Pete, Sirius said. Try it on to see if it fits. Remus sat up. As he straightened, he felt a warm slither of blood run down his spine and soak into the waistband of his trousers. He stood up, quickly. Yurg. Peter yelped, withdrawing his bare foot from the slipper, covered in sticky banana slime. James burst out laughing, his glasses falling askew. He was joking. Pete. You've got to stop doing stuff just because we tell you to. Lupin. Sirius looked up. Remus was dithering on the rug. He had to get to the hospital wing right away, but he had no idea how to explain himself. Yeah, just think I might go for a walk. Where? It's almost curfew. Sirius' face lit up. What are you planning? No, nothing. We'll come. James stood up too. I'll get the cloak. No. They all froze, even Peter, who was halfway through picking banana strings from between his toes. Remus stammered, don't feel well. I just want to go to Madame Pomfrey, that's all. All right, mate. James held up his hands. Calm down. Want us to come with you anyway. I'll go, Sirius said, quickly. He stood up and took Remus by the elbow, steering him towards the portrait hole before the other two could say anything. Sirius, Remus started, once they were out in the empty corridor. It's all right, Lupin, I'm just walking you there. Won't go in with you or anything. Remus nodded and started walking, as quickly as his sore back would let him. When they finally reached the hospital wing, they stood outside awkwardly for a moment. Hope you feel better, was all Sirius said. Can we come and visit you tomorrow, if you're not out? I suppose so. Remus said, wearily. He tried to shrug, then winced. Look after yourself, Lupin, Sirius said, before turning and hurrying back the way they'd come. Remus shivered, alone in the cold corridor, then pushed open the hospital door. First year, end of term. Remus would never tell anyone, but he enjoyed the Hogwarts exam period. There were no lessons for a whole 2 weeks. While everyone else ran around like headless chickens, Remus was relaxed. The same could not be said for the rest of his classmates. Lily Evans had taken to ambushing other students in the library and common rooms, demanding they quiz her on the 18th century goblin riots. Peter was constantly muttering under his breath, and wringing his hands. Marlene McKinnon and Mary McDonald, two Gryffindor first years Remus usually tried to avoid, kept bursting into fits of hysterical giggles from the nerves. James and Sirius acted with more bravado than ever, setting off flameless firecrackers in the corridors and performing vanishing spells on unsuspecting students' book bags in the library. Remus couldn't tell if the two of them were just responding to the general atmosphere of anxiety, or whether they were expelling their own nervous energy. The older students had no sympathy for their younger counterparts. Frank Longbottom gave out more detentions during the last week of term than he had all year, and even threatened to take 50 points from Gryffindor if James and Sirius didn't stop levitating inkwells in the common room. They had gotten off easy. Bellatrix Black had cursed half the Slytherins one evening for talking too loudly while she studied for her newts. They could 1D&T speak for 3 days. Madame Pomfrey had to grow their tongues back. Their first exam was Charms, which had Remus off to a good start. All they had to do was bewitch a coconut to dance an Irish jig, which he privately thought was easy. He, James and Sirius managed without a problem, though Peter's coconut at first refused to move, then lost control and spun off the desk, smashing into the stone wall. Transfiguration went almost as well, though it was a trickier subject. Their task was to turn a stag beetle into a pepper shaker. Sirius completed this in minutes, barely concealing his pride as McGonagall commented that it was the best example of small-scale transfiguration she'd ever seen from a first year. Remus' shaker wasn't too bad, though it was still shiny and black, whereas Sirius had somehow managed to make his glass. James attempted porcelain, and seemed to have done well until McGonagall tried to shake some pepper out of it. Wings spread out and it flew out the window, causing Marlene and Mary to shriek. Peter's pepper pot still had legs and antlers, even after an hour. Herbology and history of magic were both written exams. Remus surprised himself by writing the longest history essay in the class. He had to ask Peter, sitting next to him, for extra parchment. Apparently there was plenty to be said about the goblin riots after all. Potions was easier than he expected. They had to brew a cure for warts without instruction. Having a good memory from years of practice, Remus knew he had all the ingredients and quantities right, even if his preparation skills were lacking precision. Between exams, Remus enjoyed his last weeks of freedom, either wandering the halls and adding to his map, when he was alone, or eating ice cream outside by the lake, when the others were with him. He'd recently found a corridor that smelled vaguely of chocolate, but couldn't work out what that meant. It was nowhere near the kitchens. The days were much warmer now, and as June opened up and the testing came to a close, the Marauders' minds turned to mischief. It's got to be big, James said. He was always making grand statements like that, waiting for someone else to come up with an idea for him to approve. Our last hurrah. Not our last, Sirius said, picking at the grass. We'll be back in 2 months. You lot might be, Peter worried. I know I failed everything. James waved a hand. It was too warm and lazy a day to spend worrying. They were lounging in their new favorite spot, near a tree by the lake. Peter was sitting under the shade cast by the branches because he was fair and burnt easily. James and Sirius had stripped off their robes and rolled up the sleeves of their white uniform shirts. Remus laid in the sunshine with his robes on to cover his freshest injuries, enjoying the warmth sinking into his aching joints. He liked this spot because that whomping willow was behind them, and he didn't have to look at it. Have we got any dung bombs left? Remus asked, squinting at the blue sky, then closing his eyes to look at the patterns burned into his retinas. A few. Not enough for a big send-off, though. How big are you thinking, exactly? Bigger than dung bombs, James replied, cleaning his glasses, as he often did when he was thinking. Big enough so that everyone knows it was us. They'll know it's us. McGonagall always knows, Sirius said, skimming a stone. Across the lake. It bounced 5 times. They might think it's the Pruitts, James said. They've been beating us all year. Nothing beat the Pixies. Sirius said. He threw another stone. This time, on its 4th bounce, a long, silvery tentacle rose from the water and batted it back towards him. And the aging powder was pretty good, you have to admit, Remus added. And the rain cloud. Peter piped. They all fell quiet. Remus sat up. They hadn't talked about that incident at all since January. Peter gnawed his lip, realizing what he'd done. Sirius shook his head, changing the subject. Anyway, the point is, the 4 of us have had more detentions than the rest of Gryffindor combined this year. What more do you want us to do, James? Sign our work. He pulled back his arm to throw the stone back into the lake, but James leapt up and grabbed his shoulder, causing him to drop it. Oi. Sirius frowned. What are you playing at? Exactly. James told him. We sign our work. We do. Remus wished he hadn't stared at the sun for so long. His eyes were fogged over and he was starting to get a headache. Sign our work, James repeated, as if he was making perfect sense and they were all too thick to get it. We put our mark on Hogwarts, literally. Are you talking about defacing school property, Potter? Sirius asked. I might just be black. James wiggled his eyebrows. Well, I say, old man. Sirius grinned, adopting an even more plummy, aristocratic accent than usual. What do you say, old bean? I say it's a simply ripping idea. Oh, spiffing. Good show. Rather. Remus and Peter shared a look. This sort of thing was happening more and more. James and Sirius would get caught up in one of their own plays and leave the others behind. Remus stood and went over to sit with Peter. Any idea what they're on about? He asked the smaller boy. Peter was red in the face, his forehead creased, thinking deeply. They want us to write our names somewhere. On the walls, maybe. What? Remus said, like, carve it into the stone or something. That's a bit permanent, innit? It's all I can think of. Peter shrugged. James says he wants it big, and the walls are the biggest. Oh. He jumped up. Lads, he squeaked. I've had an idea. Blimey. James and Sirius stopped at once. James had Sirius in a headlock, and Sirius was grabbing James' ankle. Are you feeling okay, Pettigrew? Asked James. The lawn. Peter continued, pacing as he thought out loud. It's the biggest canvas, and it wouldn't have to be permanent. If we used a quick GRO potion. Remus sighed. Why wasn't anyone making any sense today? And so all four of them found themselves back out in the grounds after dark on the last day of term. They'd had 2 weeks to plan it, hoarding supplies from the greenhouse and learning various color-changing incantations. In the meantime, they learned that they had all passed their exams, even Peter. Remus had come first in history of magic, and second in charms, to Lily Evans, which he tried not to let bother him. Ouch. That was my foot. I can't see a thing. It's dark out, idiot. Can we take the cloak off now? Yeah, I think so. They had dragged a heavy sack of hydrangea seeds all the way down from the tower. Well, Remus and Peter had. Sirius and James decided that they would lead the way. Right, James said, businesslike, hands on his hips. Did we agree to write love, or from? From, Peter said. I prefer love, Sirius said. Ah, course you do, Black. James ruffled his hair playfully, causing Sirius to duck and pull a face. Love it is, then. Men gentlemen, to work. An hour later, the sack of seeds was empty, and Remus was following the trail the others had left, drizzling the quick GRO potion over the ground. Are we sure we spelled everything right? James scratched his head, messing up his hair even more. Too late now, Sirius said, wiping sweat from his brow. Look, we'd better go, sun's coming up. He pointed to the sky, which was beginning to glow pink. The color-changing spell, quick. I did it already, Remus said, finishing the last of the potion. While they were still in the bag. Good thinking, Lupin. Sirius slapped him on the shoulder. Knew you were the logical one. The logical one? Remus asked. Let's not go in yet, James said. Look, we can watch the sun rise. So they did, awestruck, as the huge orange sun climbed over the horizon, flooding the Great Lake with golden light. Then it rose higher into the parchment-colored sky. Next year'll be even better, lads, James told them, his glasses reflecting the sunlight. He threw his arms around Peter and Sirius. Remus stood slightly off to the side, content just to stand with them. They headed back to the castle in a strange mood, and almost forgot to put the cloak back on. At Gryffindor Tower, James and Peter tried to sleep, but Remus couldn't. For one thing, Sirius had finally begun packing loudly. He'd been putting it off for a week, and now had to quickly and carelessly throw his things into his mahogany trunk. The trunk, like many of Sirius' things, was embossed with a serpent. For another thing, Remus didn't want to sleep. His last few hours at Hogwarts were draining away rapidly, and he didn't want to miss any of them. He sat on the windowsill and watched their prank developing in the grass below. The seeds were already taking root. They twisted and writhed below. Looking good. Sirius came over to watch. He'd apparently finished packing, though his trunk didn't look like it would close properly. Lupin pressed his forehead to the cool glass and sighed deeply. It was a really good prank, they ought to be proud. McGonagall would throw a fit. Dumbledore would probably like it. There was no need to feel so gloomy, it was only 2 months. 50 feet below, the hydrangeas finally bloomed, and Remus' heart skipped a beat. The gaudy flowers flashed in Gryffindor colors, bright crimson and glimmering gold, blaring out their wonky-lettered message. The Marauders were here. Summer, 1972. Dear Remus. How's your summer so far? Mine is rubbish. Last week was Bellatrix's wedding. At least she won't be at Hogwarts next year. Regulus and I were groomsmen and had to wear green dress robes. Definitely not my color. My whole family was there, it was awful. You should have seen what Bella did to her hair, she looked completely mental. I wish we could do magic out of school. I've been researching curses and Dad's library should have some excellent stuff for Snivellis next year. James says his parents are letting me stay with them this summer. My parents won't let me go to the Potters, but they might let me stay with the Pettigrews, so I'm getting Pete to invite me. James said he'd invite you too, I hope you can come. It'll be great, just like school. See you soon, Sirius O'Black. Dear Remus. Hope you're having a good summer, and the muggles aren't getting you down. Mom and Dad say you're more than welcome to come for a visit. Sirius is trying to wrangle the whole summer, which would be brilliant. If you can come, reply to this owl ASAP. Mom says she'll write a letter herself if your parents want her to. Best, James. Dear Remus. James and Sirius say they've tried to get in touch with you, but you haven't replied. I told them maybe you couldn't afford an owl. You can just tie the letter to the foot of my owl, if you want. Hope you can come to visit. Peter. Dear Remus. Are you alright? We haven't heard anything from you. I'm at the Potters now, it's great. His parents are really nice, nothing like mine. James is being a bit of a pain. He thinks we're both getting on the Quidditch team this year and keeps getting me up at 6 to practice flying. It's sort of fun though, and if Gryffindor needs a beater then I might try for it. I can't wait to show you my broom. You can have a go on it if you want. You might like flying better if you have decent equipment. If you really can't come, are you going to Diagon Alley for your school things? Maybe we could all meet there in August. Hope you're okay. Sirius O'Black. Dear Remus. It's not the Marauders without you, please come. We've got loads of room, and Mum doesn't mind. I've been training Sirius and Pete for Quidditch next year. I reckon that if we get you over your problem with heights then you might make a decent beater. You're probably the strongest of the 4 of us, so I reckon it makes sense. Sirius wants to be a beater too, he can show you how to do it. I'll even see if we've got my old broom still lying around in the shed, and you can have it. James. Dear Remus. Please come and save us from James' reign of terror. I don't even want to be on the Quidditch team. Peter. Dear Remus. I hope you're getting these letters. We're starting to get worried about you. We all went to Diagon Alley together, and it was great. James' mum bought us ice creams and let us go wherever we liked. We probably spent about 3 hours in quality Quidditch supplies. I really wanted to get out into Muggle London and find a motorcycle shop, but we weren't allowed to leave the alley. Are you having a good summer? What have you been up to? Write soon. Sirius O'Black. Dear Sirius. Please tell the others not to send any more letters. I don't have time to read them, and my parents are getting annoyed by all the owls. See you on the train. Remus. Second year, Regulus Black. Remus gripped the handles of his battered old suitcase with white knuckles. His stomach turned excited somersaults as he navigated the bustling crowds. He ran at the barrier this time, leaving the Muggle side behind. He wouldn't have to see it again for 10 months. A terrible nightmare had plagued him for 2 months that he would arrive at King's Cross and be unable to get to platform 934, that none of it had been real, magic, wands, wizards, or his friends. These thoughts evaporated from his mind instantly when he saw the impressive black and scarlet train, the witches and wizards in long robes and pointy hats, the owls, toads, cats, and little bits of magic performed by bystanders. What he wanted to see most of all, though, was familiar faces. Let you come back, did they? The owner of the cold voice had a familiar face, but unfortunately not the one Remus had been hoping for. Standards must really be dropping. Get lost, Snivellus. Why did the first person he spoke to have to be Snape? Remus squared up, turning to face the Slytherin boy with his meanest look. Severus recoiled, slightly. Remus knew how he looked. He'd had 2 months turning into a violent beast without the care or precautions of Hogwarts. His father had taken off too much time from the ministry having to protect his son from himself. St. Mungos had been risky, in case anyone caught onto his condition, but necessary more than once. Remus was wound as tight as a bear trap and ready to throw a punch at the smallest provocation. Oi, Lupin, another voice rang through the crowd. A boy with glasses and jet black hair sticking up at all angles was leaning out of one of the carriage windows, waving madly at Remus. Remus forgot Severus, and waved back. He clutched his suitcase and hurried onto the train, pushing past other students to reach the carriage where his friends were waiting. Lupin. Peter jumped up and gave him a hug. Remus patted him awkwardly on the arm. "P.I. lads," Remus said, his cheeks aching from smiling as he sat down. "How's it been? We should be asking you," James said, punching him in the arm. "Not one OW1 all summer. You know I'm practically a Muggle over the holidays," he said. Being just a poor half-blood, and all. This was definitely not true, but he didn't know what to say. There was a quiet noise of disgust from the corner. Remus looked up, frowning. Sitting on the seat beside Sirius was a younger boy he hadn't noticed, with the same blue eyes, long dark hair, and unmistakable black cheekbones. "This is Reggie." Sirius nodded to his younger brother. "Say hello, Reggie," he said, as if showing off a parrot. "It's Regulus," the boy replied in a high aristocratic voice. "Hi Regulus." James offered a friendly hand. "I'm James." Regulus looked at his hand as if it was filthy. "Potter." Sirius slapped him. "Stop being a git. These are my friends. I didn't want to sit here." Regulus stood up, stony-faced, and exited the car. The door slammed shut behind him. "Wow, he really has that black family charm," James said. Sirius sighed. He propped a foot on the bench opposite and leaned against the window pane. The whistle blew and the train pulled out of the station. "He's totally brainwashed," Sirius muttered. "Says I shouldn't have been gone all summer. Reckon he'll be in Slytherin, then?" James asked. "I won't speak to him again, if he is. I'd even rather he was a Hufflepuff." They gathered speed outside London. He was relaxed in the knowledge he was really returning to Hogwarts. He yanked open his suitcase, dug through the second-hand books, and grasped his wand for the first time in months. The summer had been incredibly dull. He'd had to lie low a lot. Remus felt as though he had passed whole days sometimes without speaking to anyone. The difficult full moons were another reason he was relieved to be returning to Hogwarts, where Madame Pomfrey, the school's Mediwitch, was qualified to handle the peculiarities of his condition. Underneath his Muggle clothes, Remus was almost totally covered in bandages and plasters that pulled and chafed when he moved. He planned to slip off to the hospital wing as soon as he could after they arrived. Sirius and James were busy telling Remus about their own summer, with Peter joining in here and there. He was keen to make it clear that most of the time it had been the three of them. It sounded as though they'd all had a spectacular time, even if there was a lot of Quidditch. James' parents had a cottage by the seaside, as well as what James called their usual home near London. The three boys had camped on the beach, fished, flown kites, and plotted pranks for the year ahead. They chattered for so long Remus felt like telling them to shut up. He felt a bit better when the trolley came round. James and Sirius pooled their pocket money and bought enough to feed half Gryffindor House. Remus had no complaints as usual, he was very hungry. Remus was glad he had stuffed his face on the train, because he had forgotten how drawn out the sorting ceremony was, especially when you weren't taking part in it. Regulus was indeed sorted into Slytherin, which came as a surprise only to Sirius, who Remus heard gasp. The younger black brother scurried over to join his peers. This included Narcissa, who was now sporting a silver prefect badge to match her sleek platinum hair. Severus patted Regulus on the back, sneering at the Gryffindor table. "What is his problem?" Peter sighed as the food finally appeared. "You'd think he'd get over a few stupid pranks. More like he needs to get over Evans," James said, insightfully. They all looked at him in confusion. "Oh come on, it's obvious. Zero else Nivellus is madly in love with a certain carrot-topped Gryffindor." He winked at Lily, who turned her back on him to continue a conversation with Marlene. "So because we got the bird he fancies, he's going to be a pain for the next 6 years?" Sirius asked. "That's gonna be real fun. Second year, Hogwarts is home." Madame Pomfrey was horrified by the state of Remus' battered frame when he finally went to see her. She wanted to observe him overnight, but he refused. The full moon was 2 weeks away and he wanted to sleep in his own bed as much as possible. He walked back to the common room slowly, though he was feeling better than he had in a month. Madame Pomfrey had given him a potion that made him feel loose and lightheaded. There was no chance of a quiet afternoon, though, for when Remus reached the dormitory he found James and Sirius sitting on his bed. "Remus!" James shouted. "Want to play with the new gobstones we got from Diagon Alley?" "What is Diagon Alley?" Remus asked, though he thought he had some idea from the summer letters. Sirius' eyes widened. "Bloody hell, Lupin," he tut. "It's a wizard street, in London. Muggles can't get in like Hogsmeade. How can you have never been?" "Oh, right." Remus had never shopped for non-second-hand supplies. Sirius' eyes darted to the fraying cuffs of Remus' black school robes. His own were brand new, immaculately finished and cut better than everyone else's. "Next summer," he said firmly, "you have to come to James' place and stay. We can take you to Diagon Alley, you'll love it." "You know I can't," Remus said quietly, not making eye contact. "We'll sort it," Sirius said, with confidence. "Talk to Dumbledore, McGonagall the Minister for Magic, if we have to." Remus forced a smile, pretending that he believed Sirius. "Yeah, great. Thanks, Black." During the next few weeks Remus devoured books from the library like a starving man. He spent most of his time getting ahead on his reading and homework. He also had to have a number of conversations with James before he could convince him that he had no desire to be on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Remus was content to sit in the stalls with his book, occasionally glancing up to watch the other three boys flitting back and forth on their brooms. They were all good, but it was obvious even to Remus that James was the best of all. He didn't even look like he needed the broom. The black-haired boy soared like a kestrel with smooth turns and nauseatingly sharp dives. Remus hadn't attended many Quidditch matches in his first year, but felt sure James would earn a place on the team. Sirius was showier in his flying technique. He didn't lack James' skill so much as his discipline. He got bored easily. Though he could go fast when he wanted to, he was more interested in looping and swerving than catching quaffles or repelling bludgears. Sirius needed James to shout at him every few minutes to keep focused on the game. Peter was competent after a summer of drills, but slow over long distances. James decided he might be better off as a keeper. You're acting as if you get to handpick the whole team, Sirius huffed as they headed back to the castle after one practice. They ought to let me, James said. I'm better than at least half the current team, and you're better than both beaters. And I know tactics. Just try not to be too shocked when they don't make you captain. Sirius rolled his eyes. You're still a second year. There weren't any second years on the team at all last year. Have some faith, Black. James winked, throwing an arm around Sirius' shoulder. They strode ahead together, brooms in hand. Remus lagged behind, weighed down by his books. He had to admit, he would be surprised if James didn't get exactly what he wanted, just like he always did. Second year, brotherhood. Remus didn't have any siblings. His problem took up all his parents' resources. Either because they didn't think it was safe, or just because they didn't have the time or money for more children. Remus was an only child. James, too, was an only child, and this went at least some way to explaining why he was so cocksure and demanding. Sirius talked about Potter's parents as though they were saints, but they clearly spoiled their son rotten. Peter had a sister who was a good deal older than him and had already left Hogwarts. She'd been in Hufflepuff, but Peter didn't talk about her very much. She was studying at a Muggle university, which was apparently the height of bad taste. So perhaps none of them really understood what was happening between the two Black brothers, which might have been why they didn't take it very seriously. It began the morning after the sorting. During breakfast, Regulus had received a gift from his parents, a brand new eagle owl. This was his reward for getting into the right house, which they found out because Severus gleefully read the letter aloud within earshot of the Gryffindor table. Sirius stared at his porridge, not rising to the bait. Remus looked over and saw Regulus trying to snatch the letter away from Snape. Didn't your parents confiscate your owl again? Peter asked. Sirius nodded. Said I can have it back when I remember my duty to the family and start acting like a true Black. I don't care. I don't need an owl. What exactly is your family duty, again? James asked loudly, so the Slytherins could hear. Go round with creeps like Snivellus and Mulciber. Yeah, Sirius replied, just as loud as James. Creeping is a key aspect of my noble heritage. And picking on kids smaller than me, of course. Cheating, lying, and cursing my way into power. Peter edged away. Well, mate, I'm sorry to break it to you, James said, but it doesn't sound like you're a Black at all. Goodness. Sirius' hand flew to his face. Then what on earth am I? It's obvious, James told him. You're a Marauder. Sirius and the Gryffindors sitting nearby laughed. Remus saw Severus' hand reach for his wand, but Regulus nudged Snape with his elbow, muttering, it's fine. Remus was sure he was the only Gryffindor who heard it. Come on, Snape sneered. We'd better get away from all this filth if we want to keep our breakfast down. Snape swept from the room, followed by Mulciber and a new first year called Barty Crouch. Regulus held back, glancing nervously between his new friends and his brother. The new owl sat perched on his crooked elbow, surveying the scene with a condescending look. Regulus edged toward Sirius. You can borrow it, if you want, he said, quietly and quickly. Then he added, with a disgusted look, I never asked her to send me anything, but you know what she's like. Yeah, snorted Sirius, I know. They both looked at each other for a while, and Remus couldn't tell if they were staring each other down, or trying to find the words to say something very difficult. I'm sorry, okay you knew I'd end up in SLYTH Regulus started, but Sirius got to his feet. I don't want your owl, he said, stiffly, looking right into his brother's eyes. If I need to send a letter, I'll borrow James. He pushed past Regulus and made to leave. James, Remus, and Peter hurriedly got up and followed him. Remus glanced back at Regulus, who looked grim. Remus didn't think about Regulus very much after that. The line in the sand had been drawn, and it was their duty as Marauders to support Sirius. Besides, they were all much too busy once lessons began. Remus threw himself into his studies. He read along eagerly, answered as many questions as he could in class and completed his homework as soon as it was set. In everything except potions, he was a model student. He had never forgotten what he'd read the year before, about people with his problem. They did not do well, once they'd left school. Those stupid enough to sign the register were excluded from almost any skilled wizarding work. He would have to be the best of the best, and even that might not be enough, but he had 6 more years to try. There was another element to his academic aspirations. Remus had learned during his very first term at Hogwarts that being a half-blood meant that he was slightly less trusted than other wizards. The Slytherins, in particular, targeted students with any kind of Muggle heritage. Marlene McKinnon, whose father was a Muggle, had perfected the bat bogey hex before anyone else in their year group, as a means of defense. Lily Evans was protected from torment whenever Snape was nearby, but it was clear that plenty of the students thought she was rather full of herself, considering the circumstances of her birth. Of course, there would always be one insurmountable obstacle for Remus, and in September of 1972 it came towards the end of the month. Remus had been dreading it as always, and in the days beforehand remembered to mention that he wasn't feeling well in order to prepare his roommates for his impending absence. Truthfully, he had never felt better. Though the transformations had worsened, and the days required to recover had lengthened, Remus also found that as the moon waxed and gathered strength, so did he. He was ravenously hungry, but his senses were sharper, and his magic thicker and heavier. He barely had to sleep at all. Instead he'd sit up half the night reading voraciously, trying to ignore Sirius and James' furtive whispering in the next bed. Remus arrived at the hospital wing promptly, and Madame Pomfrey and McGonagall once more escorted him down to the Whomping Willow. They were quiet as they made their way across the grounds, but once Remus was locked into the shack for the night, they started talking. He listened to their voices as they traveled back down the long passageway. He only heard them because his hearing was better on a night of the full moon. Covered in injuries, I cannot, in good conscience, allow him to return home to the same situation. I understand, Poppy. It is a difficult matter. When Remus' father crossed Greyback he made things very hard. We have to tread carefully, very carefully. I shall speak to Dumbledore. He's such a quiet little thing, never complains, even when he must be in such a lot of pain. After that, Remus didn't hear any more. They had traveled too far down the passage and his own screams drowned them out. In the morning, Remus came back into his body gasping as if he'd just been born. There was not an inch of him that didn't hurt. His head throbbed, needles stabbed behind his eyes, his neck and shoulders felt like snapped elastic. It hurt to breathe. Every heave of his chest caused pain to shoot through him. He was sweating heavily though the air was cool. There was a deep gash across his belly. He had lost a lot of blood, and it was still bubbling up. He half crawled, half dragged himself across the room to a box of emergency medical supplies kept under the floorboards. He pulled out some gauze, using his remaining energy, and pressed as hard as he could against the dark wound. He cried out from the pain, but kept pressing. His breathing grew shallow, and he felt dizzy. Stay awake, he urged himself. Stay awake or you'll die, you idiot. Die. Then, a tiny voice appeared in the back of his head, out of nowhere. It would certainly make things easier. Remus shook his head, dazed. The voice was very kind and soft like a mother. He pressed harder, grunting with effort. What if he did just close his eyes? He let them shut, exhaling softly. Remus. Madame Pomfrey's polite knock arrived on time as always. He didn't have the strength to answer. Remus. The The door burst open. The Mediwitch aimed her wand at his open wound and stitched it together in a matter of seconds. Then she felt his chest. Broken rib, she murmured. She flipped her wand once more and Remus felt an odd pop in his torso. Suddenly it didn't hurt to breathe anymore. She tugged a blanket over his shoulders and pulled him into a hug. We can't lose you, Remus, not while I'm still at Hogwarts. Remus began to cry. Wolf face, dog face. Remus spent 2 days in the hospital wing. The wound on his stomach was not the only one he had inflicted that night, though it was the worst. Madame Pomfrey's spell had been enough to stop the bleeding long enough to get him out of the shack, but he needed rest and quiet. She gave him sleeping draughts regularly, and he drank them without complaint, preferring not to be awake. The Marauders tried to see him, but at Remus' request Madame Pomfrey turned them away. It was late Friday morning when she finally let him go. I'll send a note to your professors, let them know not to expect you. You're to go straight to your dormitory and lie down, understood? He walked to the tower slowly, taking a different route than usual. On his way, he thought about the map. He ought to start working on that again. He had read about more secret passageways that he wanted to see if he could find. Once he reached the dorm, Remus crawled onto his bed, drew the curtains and laid on his back. Beams of sunlight shone through the joints of the fabric. It was still warm for September, and someone had thrown the windows open, filling the room with cool air. Breeze sucked in the drapes, then billowed them out. Lupin. A sharp voice shattered his calm. Sirius ripped back the curtains, flooding the small space with light. Ugh, what? He shielded his eyes. Remus, I have to tell you something. Remus was too tired to sit up. He sighed. Well, it's James. Sirius said. He wants to talk to you. It's, blimey, this is hard to say, Lupin. What you on about? He knows. And he wants us to confront you. Remus sat up, abruptly. He knows what? He asked, knowing exactly what Sirius was referring to. About your, you know. Where you go. Every full moon. Sirius shook his head. James worked it out, the balmy idiot, and now he's decided we all need to confront you about it. I'm really sorry, I tried to get him off it, but you know how he is. Yeah, Remus croaked, leaning forward rather suddenly. He held his head in his hands. This was it. He was about to lose everything that meant anything to him. It's okay. I think it's going to be okay, Sirius said. How? Remus lifted his head. Might as well start packing now. No, don't. Look, he wants to talk to you about it. He's not going straight to Dumbledore or anything, doesn't that mean something? But Remus had already got up, opened his trunk and begun emptying things into it. He might have to leave straight away, they might not even give him time to pack if he was arrested. Would they let him keep his wand? It had belonged to his father, so it was rightfully his. Remus. Sirius grabbed his shoulders. He flinched, but only because he expected it to hurt. Sirius' blue eyes bored into him, and he tried to look away. Just wait, okay? Just wait and see what James says. He's your friend. We're Marauders, all of us. That's rubbish. Remus shoved him away. Complete rubbish. You two are the Marauders, you and him. Me and Peter are just your charity cases. He seized his pajamas from the end of the bed and flung them into his trunk. Sirius was speechless. His mouth twitched once or twice, as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't quite manage it. Just wait, he finally said, hoarsely, walking out of the room. Just wait and see what he says. Second year, potions, again. Despite all his talk, Remus did wait. He could see that he had many options, other than to go directly to Dumbledore and ask to be sent home and, truth be told, he wasn't exactly sure where Dumbledore's office was. He hadn't got that far with the map. The map that he'd better leave behind, now that he thought about it. Sirius and James could finish it. He wouldn't need it anymore. He wasn't tired anymore. He sat on his trunk fidgeting for what felt like hours. Lunch was starting, but what if they wanted to talk to him right there in front of everyone? He stayed put. He wasn't hungry anyway. He tried to read, but could concentrate long enough. Remus' mind kept wandering back to his conversation with Sirius. Once the initial terror had passed, he could see that Sirius was trying to be kind. After all, he'd already proved he had no intention of telling anyone else. He'd given Remus a fair warning, which meant a lot. On the other hand, just because James was Sirius' best friend didn't mean he had to be loyal to Remus. They were just dorm mates, not his close. Remus didn't play Quidditch, wasn't from a good family, had no money. Would Potter's perfect reputation allow him to associate with a dark creature? Sirius himself couldn't even forgive his own brother for being in a different schoolhouse. Just after the 4 o'clock bell rang, Remus heard 3 sets of footsteps tramping up the stairs. He stood up, bracing himself. James entered first, looking very serious and somehow older than all of them. Sirius came in behind him, his expression inscrutable, no trace of the emotion from earlier. Peter was last, looking as usual very uncomfortable and out of his depth. Remus, James said, straight away. They all stood facing each other, the room feeling very small, even with the window open. Hi. Remus tried to keep his eyes on all 3 of them at once. How are you feeling? Fine. Look mate, I'll get right to it, okay. James ran his fingers through his hair. We've noticed, well we couldn't not notice that you're away a lot, in the hospital wing. Every month, pretty much. Peter was nodding sycophantically behind him and Remus felt a surge of hatred rise out of nowhere. He focused instead on meeting James' eyes. Alright, Remus said, sullenly. Yeah. James nodded, as if they were having a perfectly normal conversation. Every month, around the full moon. He let it hang in the air. Remus grew impatient to get it over with. Just say it, James. Are you a werewolf? It came out in a rush, and James' gaze finally dropped, as though he was embarrassed to have asked. Remus glanced at Sirius, who was still staring at him with a look of determination. Peter was gnawing his bottom lip, eyes darting between Remus and James. Remus squared his shoulders. Yeah. He jutted his chin forward, as if daring James to jinx him. James exhaled. Right. That it. Yes I mean, bloody hell. James ran his hands through his hair again, turning to the others for support. It's okay, Remus said, his voice hard. I'm off. Just let me go and tell McGonagall. Off. Back home, I suppose. You can't leave Hogwarts. James' glasses had slid down his nose and he hadn't even noticed. I can't stay if everyone knows, Remus explained, as calmly as he could. We won't tell anyone, Peter squeaked. Remus looked at him in surprise, not expecting him to be the one defending him. James nodded. We won't, he confirmed. Remus shook his head, not allowing himself to hope. This isn't a game. Keep the secret, or whatever. If other people find out, I will have to leave. It could be worse than that, they might. We won't let it happen. Sirius stepped forward. Will we? He turned to Peter and James on either side of him. They both looked serious and frightened, and shook their heads firmly. Trust us. James said. Please. Remus agreed to give them a month. Or they agreed to give him a month, he wasn't sure. It wasn't clear who thought who was more dangerous. After that, every moment was filled with awkwardness and a new kind of shyness that hadn't been there before. They think I'm a monster, a voice in Remus' head chanted, over and over. They think I'm going to murder them in their beds, they think I'm evil. Had he really proved he wasn't? For a whole week, they didn't talk about it. Not a word, not even a whisper. Remus had felt sure they would all badger him with questions, James especially, but after the confrontation no one wanted to bring it up again. In front of everyone else they acted the same. James was loud, Sirius was witty, Peter insecure. But when they were alone together the four of them were quiet, thoughtful, and too polite. The nightly conferences between James and Sirius became even more frequent. Unexpectedly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, it was Severus Snape who ended up reuniting the Marauders. It was, of course, during a potions class. This term, they were embarking upon pleasant dream potions, which would take some weeks to brew. You'll need to come back regularly in the evenings to check on your potions progress. I shall be marking you on persistence and attentiveness. To that end, I think it's best if you all pair up so that you can take it in turns, Slughorn told them. There was a general flurry and chatter as students began to pick their partners. Remus resigned himself to sharing with Peter, as usual. Above the commotion, Slughorn raised his voice again. No, I've learned my lesson. He gave the Marauders a severe look. You may not choose the same partners you had last year. Sirius and James looked at each other, then at Peter and Remus, sizing them up. Remus cringed. In fact, Slughorn continued, I think I shall assign the partners. Fortunately Slughorn was tactful enough not to put any of them with Snape, though Peter ended up with Mulciber, who towered over him, twice his size. The professor split up Mary and Marlene, placing them with the boys. Remus was asked to pair up with Lily Evans. He didn't really like her. She was nosy and tried too hard to be nice. Plus she was best friends with Snape, who was now staring daggers at him from across the room. Remus hadn't forgotten the incident from first year, when Lily had stopped Snape and Mulciber from attacking him. He also hadn't forgotten her general disdain for his friends. Every encounter he'd had so far with Lily had been unpleasant for Remus. She seemed to recognize his dislike, and smiled at him nervously. Hi Remus, are you feeling better? Better keep well back, Lily, Snape hissed from the desk he was sharing with another Slytherin girl. Loony Lupin might be contagious. Please be quiet, Sev. Lily gave him a hard look. The greasy-haired boy's lip curled. Just don't want anyone else coming down with Lupin's mysterious ailment, do we? Let me know if you need anything, Lily. Lily tossed her mane of red curls and opened her textbook with an elaborate flourish. We need 8 rat tails, finely diced. Do you want to do that, or shall I? I'll do it, Remus replied. I'll start weighing the rosemary leaves, then. They worked quietly for a while, and it might have been all right if they were at another desk, but Snape was close behind them the whole time, casting spiteful glances at Remus and speaking just above a murmur. Of course, Loony Lupin is quite apt, he said to the girl he was working with. I've seen him, wandering around the castle on his own, lurking in dark corners like he's mad. You may recall he actually attacked me last year. I don't know why Dumbledore allows someone clearly dangerous to stay. Remus felt his ears turning red. Just ignore him, Lily whispered, though she sounded annoyed herself. He's having a bad time at home and blames it on everyone else. Remus returned to his rat's tails. Once they had prepared their ingredients, it came time to stir. Remus was starting to get along with Lily now. She was patient and didn't act like she knew everything, the way James and Sirius did. I'll stir, he said. He rolled up his sleeves and grabbed the wooden spoon. Urg. Look at him. Snape's cloying voice rang loud enough for half the class to hear. Remus realized everyone was looking at his bare arms. He yanked his ropes down to cover the marks. What sort of disease? Shut up, Severus. Lily barked. Remus wished he knew how to apparate. He'd give anything to be able to curse Snape. The Marauders had heard too. Sirius and James raised their heads from their cauldrons. Oi, Snivellus, what are you saying about our mate? Oh, stay out of this, Potter. Lily groaned. You'll only make it worse. Silence, please. Slughorn boomed. You're not first years anymore, I should think you're able to concentrate on the task at hand. Everyone fell quiet. Remus was gripping the stirrer with all his might. I'm sorry, Remus, Lily whispered, looking genuinely upset. He's such a, I don't know. Look, I've got these. She held out her hand, covertly. Remus looked down. She held 2 grayish round things that looked like bullets, or tablets. What? He asked, gormlessly. He was annoying me last week, showing off about how good he is at potions. I know it's petty of me, but I wanted to teach him a lesson, so I made these. Then he had this thing with his mum and I felt sorry for him, so I didn't use them. But now. Evans, Remus said, what are they? Just something I've been playing around with in Slug Club. Lily said, smiling. Remus noticed that she was actually strikingly pretty. He'll react with his potion. It'll be really good. He stared at her, awestruck. But you're such a swat. She smiled wider. Some of us know how not to get caught. She shoved the pills into his hand. You do it. Toss them in when he's not looking. Oi, Potter, she shouted across the room. James' head snapped up, his glasses foggy from the steam of his cauldron. Hey. Snape had looked up too, glaring at James. Remus moved quickly, pretending to yawn and stretching his arms out, his right hand reaching over Snape's cauldron. He dropped in the pills, just as Lily said. Oh, nothing. Just wondering how you can see with your glasses like that. She turned back to her work. Both Snape and James stared at her in confusion. Remus' admiration only grew when Snape's cauldron exploded behind them. A mass of foaming purple bubbles spilled over the brim, all over Severus. And his partner. The whole class laughed, and Snape turned white with rage, his nostrils flaring. Oh dear. Slughorn bustled over. A bit overeager with the beetle husks, Severus. It wasn't me. Snape fumed, purple bubbles settling in his hair. He did something. He pointed at Remus, who winced. He must have. Did you see Mr. Lupin tamper with your potion? No, but... Come now boy, Slughorn laughed, throwing him a green tea towel. We all make mistakes, even you. Severus spluttered, and Lily struggled to keep a straight face, eventually having to turn around, her shoulders shaking in silent hysterics. After the lesson, the Marauders piled on Remus in the hallway, whooping and cheering. You did it, didn't you? Brilliant. How did you do it? You're no good at potions. Remus neither confirmed nor denied. Over James' shoulder, he saw Lily flash him a quick smile, before hurrying away up the stairs. Didn't I tell you? Sirius proclaimed brightly, throwing an arm around James and another around Remus. He's still a Marauder, no matter what. Second year, after hours. Once the ice had been broken, the questions came flooding in. That evening, after dinner, all 4 boys sat on Remus' bed. When did it happen? Does Dumbledore know? Have you ever, attacked anyone? What's it like? Where do you go, when it happens? Remus gnawed his lip. He'd never talked about his condition before, except for his conversation with Madame Pomfrey last year. He tried to work out where to start. I was 5 years old when it happened. I don't really remember much before that. Yeah, Dumbledore knows. I don't think I've ever hurt anyone. I think I'd probably know, if I did. So when you turn, you can remember what it's like? Sirius asked, eagerly. Being a wolf. Not really. Remus thought hard. Maybe I can remember feeling stuff, but I don't think I have a human brain while I'm like that. It's more like a really bad dream. I always thought werewolves were more. Peter looked at him thoughtfully. Scary. Remus flinched. He wasn't used to hearing that W word quite so much. He never said it, himself. Have you ever met? Sirius began, but James gave him a sharp look. That's enough, Black, leave him alone. They eventually split off to start their homework, and James went for a fly around the grounds before it got dark. Quidditch trials were coming up and he was becoming more obsessed by the day. He tried to get Peter and Sirius to go with him, but they begged off. Bloody slave driver, Peter muttered, as he left. I've told him I'm not even trying out. I think I probably will, Sirius said. They need a beater, anyway. Homework was eventually cast aside in favor of a particularly aggressive game of exploding snap between the three of them. Later, after lights out, Remus sat up reading a muggle paperback Sirius had lent him. It was just getting exciting when he heard the telltale creak of the floorboards that meant Sirius was paying James a visit. He heard the curtains rustle, and low whispering, before a sudden unnatural void of sound which meant someone had cast a silencing spell. Remus scrunched into his duvet and focused on his book. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that he heard the silencing spell being recalled. It was as though he had been deaf in one ear and could hear again. He listened to the curtain rustle and Sirius padding softly back across the room. This time, however, his footsteps came closer, and much to Remus' surprise, his own bed curtains opened. Sirius' long, pale face peered in on him. Hey, he whispered. Hi. What's up? Saw your wand light. Sirius nodded to it. Can I come in? Alright. Sirius slipped in easily, kneeling on the bed in front of Remus, who set his book aside. Sonoro qui size, Sirius whispered, casting the soundproofing charm. How's the book? Good, Remus replied. What's up? He repeated. Where do they put you? Where do they put me? When you transform. There's this old house. McGonagall and Pomfrey take me there every month. There's a passageway to get there under the Whomping Willow. Does McGonagall watch you? No. It's too dangerous. They use spells to keep me locked in. Sounds horrible. It's not as bad as back home. They have a cell for me there, with a silver door. When I was too little they put me in a cage. Sirius asked sharply, a cage? Remus was surprised by his reaction. It was to keep everyone else safe. And I can only have been the size of a puppy. Cub. Sirius corrected him. A baby wolf is a cub. Dogs are puppies. Right. So where did you get bitten? Sirius had swapped concern for curiosity. Oh, Remus slowly lifted his shirt at the hem. He barely noticed the bite mark anymore, though it stood out as much as ever. It was huge. Evidence of an unbelievably large jaw. One could count every tooth, if they were so inclined. Oh wow, Sirius breathed. Somehow Remus felt as if he'd earned his approval. Friday, October 13th, 1972. So what exactly are we doing here? James whispered. And why did we have to bring the stupid cloak? Sirius' voice was muffled under the fabric. It's ours until curfew. I'm hot, Peter complained. Shut up, all of you, Remus ordered. I'm trying to concentrate. Concentrate on what? Ouch. Remus kicked Sirius in the shin. I said shut up. Bloody oink, Sirius muttered, but he was quiet after that. Remus sniffed. It definitely smelled like chocolate. The whole corridor only a faint whiff, as you turned the corner, but richer and sweeter the further you walked towards the statue near the middle. The scent had been driving Remus mad for weeks since he noticed it late last term. It had to have something to do with the statue, a witch with a hunched back and eye patch. It was a horrible portrait. He hoped that the artist had just been particularly unkind, and the poor woman hadn't really looked like that. Have you brought us here to meet your new girlfriend, Lupin? James smirked. Why'd you keep sniffing like that? Sirius asked. I don't want to be this close to you if you're getting a cold. Can't any of you smell that? Smell what? Chocolate. Definitely chocolate. Chocolate? Where? Peter perked up. I can't smell anything, said Sirius. Me neither, said James. It's coming from the statue. Remus was unperturbed. He reached out and touched the stone carefully through the cloak. What? Reckon the old Bint's hump is packed with sweets or something. Sirius sounded irritable. It bothered Remus that he and Peter got dragged along on all sorts of stupid missions by the other two, but if James and Sirius weren't in charge then they acted bored. No, Remus said. I reckon it's one of those secret passages from a book I read. Really? Now Sirius was paying attention. So your sense of smell. Is that a special thing you can do? Wondered James. Yeah. Well, it doesn't lead to the kitchens, Peter said, knowledgeably. They're on the ground floor, a Hufflepuff told me. How can we get in? Asked Sirius. Password. James suggested. Like the common room. Scallywag. Peter shouted at the witch. Nothing happened. I didn't mean it would be the exact same password, Peter. James rolled his eyes. He seemed to be having less patience for the smaller boy lately. Alohomora. Sirius suggested. Remus tried the unlocking spell, but nothing happened. Isn't it something else for revealing unseen entryways? Said James. Oh yeah. Sirius nodded. Descendium. He tapped his wand on the witch's hump. The hump opened and slid away to leave a gap big enough for them to file inside, one at a time. The smell of chocolate grew stronger, and also the smell of earth, fresh air, and strange people. When they had all gotten inside, the hump closed behind them. Lumos, they all said in unison. They threw off the cloak. James folded and tucked it under his arm and assumed leadership. And then, he said, holding his wand out to light the dark passage. Let's go. They all followed. Remus didn't mind, he'd done his bit. It was a long walk down a flight of cold stone stairs. The tunnel was earthy and damp. The scent grew stronger, and when they finally reached the end, there was another staircase, leading to a wooden trapdoor. James pushed open the door, and poked his head through. They all held their breath as James' torso disappeared up into the unknown. I don't believe it. He laughed above them. You have to see. He vanished altogether. Sirius scurried after him. Remus went next, while Peter dithered behind. Where are we? Sirius was staring around the dark room. They were surrounded by neatly stacked boxes and crates. The smell of confectionery by now was overwhelming. I think we're in Hogsmeade. James said. This is the storeroom at Honeyduke's. The sweet shop. Remus asked. Sirius opened a crate containing at least 500 boxes of chocolate frogs. Remus had heard all about Hogsmeade from the other boys they'd all visited on family holidays before. It was one of the only entirely magical villages in Britain. Older students were allowed to go on their weekends, and often brought back paper bags bulging with sweets from Honeyduke's. Standing in the cellar at that moment, Remus could not have been happier with the outcome of this mission. They finally coaxed Peter up, and spent a good hour exploring the shop, marveling at their own brilliance. They swiped a little bit of everything as they went. James slipped a bag of sickles and galleons from his robes and left them on the counter before they left. The Marauders returned to the Gryffindor common room with their pockets heavy and huge grins on their faces. A prefect took points from all of them for missing curfew, but they couldn't care less. When they all lay in bed hours later, pretending not to have stomach aches, Sirius said cheerfully, that's definitely going on the map. Second year, Quidditch. I've had enough, Peter said. Remus sighed. He knew the feeling, but there wasn't much point whinging about it. I really have. Peter reiterated, his voice high. I know you have, Remus replied. They've dragged us into all sorts of stuff, got us detentions, and I never complained. Well, you did a bit. Remus raised an eyebrow. Peter nodded. Okay, I did sometimes, but I always did as James said. And Sirius, even though he's horrible to me. Yeah, well. Sirius is horrible to everyone, Remus said. Well, this time I've definitely had enough, Peter continued. They've gone too far. We're just being supportive, Remus said, leaning forward on the wooden spectator stands. Thought you liked being supportive. Not, Peter grimaced, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Remus was inclined to agree, even if he wasn't going to whinge about it. At least Peter actually liked Quidditch. They looked out on the quiet pitch, grass thick and green under a gauzy veil of early morning mist. James and Sirius were presumably still in the changing rooms with the rest of the Gryffindor Quidditch team hopefuls. Remus and Peter were both huddled in the stands, wrapped in their scarves and hats, waiting for the trials to begin. They had been there for at least an hour already, too early even for breakfast, because James had wanted to practice beforehand. They might have said no, and slept in instead, letting the other two go early if they wanted. But Peter was right, they always did as James said, he was just too good at convincing them. Remus yawned again. Oh, hello, Remus. Lily Evans came up the stairs, smiling tiredly. Hi Peter. Morning. Remus nodded back. Hello, Lily, Peter yawned. Chilly, isn't it? Here to watch the Quidditch trials. Yup. Should have known James would be having a go, Lily said wearily. James' Quidditch fanaticism was not restricted to the Marauders' dorm room, everyone who'd ever met him knew how keen he was. Sirius, too. Remus said. Well, never one without the other, Lily said. Who are you watching? Peter asked. Marlene, Lily pointed at the far end of the pitch, where the Gryffindor Quidditch team and new applicants were gathering by the goalposts. Remus could just make out Marlene McKinnon's pale blonde ponytail. She's going for Peter. That's the position Siri, Peter started, but Remus kicked him quickly in the leg. Lily looked at them, and opted to change the subject. Remus, can you check on the pleasant dream potion tonight? I'm really behind on my astrology end. I wanted to talk to Professor Astor. Can't, Remus replied. We've got detention. Oh. What for? Levitating the tables and chairs in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, Peter said. Really? Lily asked. I didn't hear about that. We haven't done it yet, Remus said. We're going to later while everyone's at lunch. But I expect they'll know it was us and we'll get the detention shortly. Lily tut. What did I say about getting caught, Lupin? She grinned impishly. Remus gave her a small smile back. Lily really wasn't that bad. It was pleasant to see her without Snape, who usually loomed nearby like a vampire bat. Reeking of gloom and disapproval. There was finally movement on the Quidditch pitch as all of the hopefuls were put through their paces. James couldn't fail to impress, he was on top form that day. He swooped and dived and twisted in midair as if he were swimming, not flying. Remus heard Lily's sharp intake of breath as James attempted a particularly tight turn. How does he fly like that? She said. He's really good. He is, Peter said. I've known him since we were 5 years old and he's never fallen off his broom. Not once. No wonder he thinks he's untouchable, Lily muttered. The rest of the would-be chasers took their turns, but it was obvious that James was the best choice. Next it was the beater Sirius, Marlene, and the burly fifth year were handed their bats and took to the sky along with 6 Bludgers. It was horrible to watch. Remus' nerves were set on edge as the brutal red cannonball shot towards his friend's head and body. Sirius deftly avoided the Bludgers and knocked a few out of the way, but Marlene was unstoppable. She flew circles around her competition, swinging her bat with machine precision and sending the Bludgers flying across the pitch every time. Bloody hell, Peter exclaimed. Didn't know McKinnon had it in her. Her brother plays for the Cannons, Lily said, looking smug on Marlene's behalf. She's been training with him all summer. Sirius has been too, Peter defended his friend. He and James were at it constantly, weren't they, Remus? Remus didn't reply, even to remind Peter that he had not spent the summer with them. He was too busy being embarrassed for Sirius, and wishing Marlene McKinnon didn't have to be so bloody good at whacking Bludgers, or at least wishing that there were 2 positions open for Peter. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. He hated Quidditch, and if Sirius and James were both on the team then it meant he'd have to spend a lot more time shivering in the stands. He'd been secretly waiting for James or Sirius to fail at something for ages, as proof they weren't utterly perfect in every way. However, now that the moment was here, Remus felt guilty for thinking it. Sirius was sure to be crestfallen. Here they come. Lily jumped up and ran down the steps to meet Marlene. Remus and Peter followed her slowly. I got in. Marlene was grinning, her face pink with pleasure. She and Lily leapt up and down. James looked incredibly pleased with himself too, his hair sticking up wildly from the wind, glasses slightly askew. Sirius had a face like thunder. Peter took a step back just at the sight of him. Well done, McKinnon, Sirius said, gruffly. Thanks, you were really good too, Sirius, she said, nervously. He grunted, not looking up. James looked at him sideways and made an apologetic face at the girls. He extended his hand to Marlene. See you next week for the first practice. Yeah, great. She smiled at him brightly. See you, Potter. The 2 girls set off back to the castle, chattering away excitedly. Sirius, mate, it's not the end of the world. James turned to his friend. I know. Sirius kicked a tuft of grass. You could have been on the reserve team if you wanted, Singh did offer. I know. I don't want to be on the bench. Shall we go for breakfast? James sighed, looking at the other 2 for support. Peter nodded enthusiastically. Well done, James, Remus said, pointedly, looking at Sirius as he said it. You were amazing, congratulations. Cheers, Lupin. James grinned. His eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, and his face lit up as if that was his face's natural state. Yeah, Peter said, punching him on the arm. Nice one, Potter. Thanks. They walked back to the castle. Sirius still wasn't speaking, and walked a few steps ahead of the rest of them. James jogged to keep up. You can try again next year, Ardell will have left by then, he told me he was dropping out to focus on his newts. Sirius walked even faster, broom still under his arm. He didn't join them for breakfast, nor was he in the common room afterwards. James was waylaid by most of the other Gryffindors, who, by now, had heard from the team that he was the new chaser. A gang of 4th-year boys pulled him over to talk strategy, and Peter went too, basking in his friend's glory. James always had plenty of shine to share. Remus wasn't a fan of the spotlight, and took the opportunity to look for Sirius. He wasn't in their dorm, which was to be expected. Remus, luckily, had written a book on hiding places, and it wasn't long before he found him, curled up in an enclave hidden behind a tapestry depicting a unicorn hunt. Gee away, Lupin. Sirius' voice was thick, as though he'd been crying, though his face was dry. You can't cheer me up, okay. I'm not here to cheer you up, you prat. What you sitting here moping for? Your best mate just had all of his dreams come true at once, go and be a good sport. You wouldn't understand, Sirius sniffed. Maybe not. But I do understand that James really wanted to be a chaser. He worked really hard for it, and he got it. And Marlene really wanted to be a leader, and she worked really hard too, Evans told us. So she got it. She was just better than you. Sirius gave him a shove, but Remus was stronger. You didn't even care that much, he continued, not as much as James. You only did the trial because he was doing it, but you don't always have to be the same. You still beat him at Transfiguration. You still get the best marks in the year. Everyone likes you. Well, except the Slytherins and, maybe your family, but who cares? Peter's family don't like him either. Sirius let out a weak laugh, despite himself. So stop feeling sorry for yourself and go and say well done. Fine. Good. They both hopped down from the ledge, pushing the tapestry out of the way. The tiny embroidered knights shook their fists at the boys for disrupting their pursuit of the silver unicorn, which whinnied and galloped into a dense copse of woven trees. They walked back to the common room. Sirius shoved his hands in his pockets. Did you all have breakfast? He asked, sulkily. Yep, Remus replied. James saved you some toast, though. He's a good mate. Sirius smiled. Yeah, Remus agreed. He is. They were quiet for a bit longer. Just before they reached the portrait of the fat lady, Sirius looked at Remus. His eyes were still slightly red, but other than that he seemed himself again. I don't try to copy James. Didn't say you did, Remus said. You compete, though. Sirius acknowledged this. And I don't care what my family thinks. Sirius said this so fiercely that Remus backed away. He reached out and touched Sirius's shoulder, warily, as you might try to calm a growling dog. I know, mate, he said. I know that. Second year, a birthday engagement. Friday, November 3rd, 1972. Sirius's 13th birthday did not fall on the full moon, as his 12th had. After the talk he had with Remus, he did act slightly differently towards his friends. For one, he appeared to develop some extra sensitivity towards the two secondary Marauders. The subject of Quidditch was still a sore one, and so on the morning of his second Hogwarts birthday, James had enough tact not to suggest a lunchtime flying session. Breakfast began with a round of happy birthday at the very tops of their voices, as had become tradition for the Marauders by now. The Potters sent Sirius a huge basket of chocolates, while James had ordered him half of Zonko's catalog. Remus was a bit embarrassed to hand over his own gifts, some chocolate frogs and old Muggle magazines he'd gotten his mother to send him. They had ads for motorcycles in the back. Sirius was thrilled. The three pure-blood wizards laughed at the static Muggle photographs. Remus tried to see if Sirius looked any different now he was a teenager. 13 was an important milestone, whichever way you looked at it. Sirius did seem to be holding himself in a slightly different way. Unfortunately, the carefree morning ended there. As they finished their meal and were preparing to get up for their first lesson, History of Magic, their passage out of the hall was blocked. Sirius, a stern voice said. Narcissa Black stood before them. At 15 she was taller than all four Marauders. She was an attractive girl, Remus thought, if a little pinched about the face. She didn't have her elder sister's mad look, and had hair that hung in a gorgeous platinum sheet. She stood before them with her arms crossed, Regulus skulking at her side. Sissy. Sirius nodded in greeting. She flinched, but didn't chastise him. It's your birthday, she said. Well, I was aware. She just rolled her eyes. She didn't have her sister's temper, either, which Remus was glad for. You're to eat with us this evening. Come and sit at the Gryffindor table if you absolutely have to. No, she narrowed her grey eyes. Your mother has given strict instructions. We'll eat privately, in the Slytherin common room, like last year. No. Sirius no longer looked like a mature 13-year-old, but a child, stamping his foot. I want to eat with my friends. You can eat with them any time you want, Narcissa snapped, crossing her arms. Birthdays are family occasions. Regulus was still standing just behind his cousin, not saying anything. Sirius, with a very annoyed look on his face, finally nodded his assent. Once a time had been set for dinner, the two Slytherin Blacks left, and the Marauders stared after them. James looked at Sirius. Bad luck, he commiserated. Want to bunk off lessons? Sirius shook his head. I'll just take a few dung bombs with me to dinner. We can see if the time bomb spell works. James smiled. Perfect, said Sirius. Sirius was gone for a long while after dinner. James paced the dorm room, checking his watch every few minutes and wondering out loud whether he ought to go and stand outside the dungeons and shout. We need to start working on your map again, Lupin, he said, running his hands through his catastrophic hair. Get everyone tagged, so we know where they are at all times. We're a long way off that, Remus replied from his bed, where he was reading about Hogwarts architecture. Still haven't mapped any of the East Wing. I can do some over Christmas. No. James stopped in the middle of the room. You and Black are coming to mine for Christmas. Remus swallowed. James, I can't, you know I can't. James waved a hand, and resumed his pacing. I'll sort it all out with Dad, don't worry. Full moon's on the 20th, I checked. We can all hang out here until then and leave on the 21st. Then James donned his cloak to go looking for Sirius. Peter followed him, leaving Remus behind. When the two other boys returned, it was with a white-faced Sirius. He looked worse than he usually did after an encounter with his family, closed off and utterly joyless. What's up? Remus stood up, concerned. It's terrible. Sirius said. Really, really terrible. Vile. The worst, most unthinkable. He threw himself onto his bed, face down. He's been like this since we found him in the dungeons, James explained, nothing but adjectives. He ran his fingers through his hair again. He'd be bald before he saw 30, Remus thought. Sirius rolled onto his back, staring up at the canopy of his bed. I'm leaving Hogwarts. What? James, Peter, and Remus roared. Usually Blacks attend Hogwarts, but they've decided to tighten the reins. In my case, I'll have to go to Durmstrang. Durmstrang. James was flabbergasted. Not the school where they're rumored to teach dark magic and torture their students, surely. Do Blacks really send their kids to Durmstrang? Of course we do. Sirius heaved a sigh. Noble and most ancient, etc., etc. They want me to have only the best influences. And if I'm not influenced, I'll be tortured. That's mad. That's medieval. That's my mother. Sirius finished. What about Regulus? James asked. He looked as though his mind was working a mile a minute. What about him? Sirius said bitterly. Think he's a black sheep like me. It is supposed to be thorough there, Peter said, meekly. Sirius gave him a look that could shatter glass. I meant, continued James, did Regulus say anything? He was there, wasn't he? Not a word. Sirius glowered, and no one mentioned his brother again. Right, well. James pushed his glasses up his nose. We've got until next summer to make a plan. So, I'd say it's not hopeless. You don't know what hopeless is until you've met my mother, Sirius said. And she doesn't know what a marauder is, James said firmly. Gentlemen. He looked at them each, in turn. Remus could see exactly what was coming. We have a new mission. Second year, assumptions. Remus made his way to the dungeons on Sunday evening. He was alone. Lily had asked him to check on the potion one more time before handing it in the next day. He was guiltily aware that Evans had so far done the lion's share of the work. Sirius's problem had been ticking away in the back of his mind all day. James had charged them all with coming up with a solution by Christmas, but Remus couldn't see what might be done. He sighed heavily, pushing the door to the potions classroom open. To his disgust, Severus Snape was inside already, stirring his own potion. Their eyes met, and Remus froze for a moment, before squaring his shoulders, raising his chin and walking straight over to his own cauldron. He couldn't help but notice that his potion was a slightly different color from Snape's, which couldn't be a good sign. Theirs was a bold, royal blue, much darker than it ought to be. Snape had noticed too. You need to add more lavender, he said, nasally, not looking up from his stirring. At least another teaspoon. As if I'm going to take advice off you. I'm hardly going to ruin Lily's potion, am I? Snape asked. Remus considered this. It was true that despite Severus' generally unpleasant demeanor, the only other thing the Marauders knew about him was that he would do almost anything for Lily Evans. Remus spooned in more lavender and stirred. At once, the potion took on a paler hue, and a dreamy aroma rose from it. Snape made a smug clicking noise with his tongue, and closed the lid on his cauldron. Sev, a voice came from the doorway. Oh, Remus, it was Lily. Remus frowned, thought we agreed I was checking it tonight. Oh, yes, we did. I was just double-checking. Her usually pale cheeks were bright red. Didn't think I'd show up, asked Remus. Well, you do get a lot of detentions. Snape snorted as he left. Remus fought the urge to throw a spoon at the back of his breezy head. Lily had already crossed the room, and was looking into the cauldron. Oh wow, it looks much better than it did this morning. Did you do something? Added more lavender. Nice one, it looks exactly right now. Remus rubbed the back of his head, glancing at the door. He decided not to mention it had been Snape's idea. Nothing left to do, then. Are you on your way back to the common room? Yet. They walked together. Lily was in a good mood. We work quite well together, don't we? She smiled at him. It's a nice change from Sev. You're much more easygoing. Remus supposed that compared to Snape anyone might seem relaxed. What's the thing with you and him anyway, he asked. He's my best friend, Lily answered promptly, as if she had to justify this all the time. We've known each other ages. He's not as bad as you think he is, she said, glancing at him sideways. He can be really kind. And funny. Why is he hang about with Mulciber and the pureblood lot, then? Should we really base our assumptions of people on their friends? Lily looked at him pointedly. What's wrong with my friends? Remus demanded. They're all heirs to pureblood houses, aren't they? They're massive show-offs. I suppose Peter's okay, but it's sad the way he follows them around everywhere. You're wrong about them, Remus said. I mean, you're right about them showing off, but they're not just, there's more to them. Well, then you'll just have to accept that there's more to Severus, won't you? Remus shrugged, noncommittally. Somehow Lily had an immensely soothing presence. Flipperty-gibbet, she said to the portrait, which swung open for them to crawl through. James had not long returned from Quidditch practice and was still in his red flying robes. He sat on one of the sofas flicking Zonkos bursting beans into the fireplace, where they burst in a riot of color like miniature fireworks. Sirius lay on the rug reading a book on hexes he'd brought from home. All right, Lupin. James asked. Remus nodded to Lily and went over to his friends. She went straight up the stairs to the girls' dorm. Dumped us for Evans, have you? James asked. Potions, Remus replied. Right. You friends with her now? Sort of. Remus shrugged. She's all right. Hates you too though. She thinks you're show-offs. James gasped. How dare she? We'll have to win her over. Why bother? Sirius returned to his book. She's friends with Snivellis, she clearly has no taste. Did she really say that? James was asking Remus. About us being show-offs. Well, Remus looked at him, you sort of are, to be honest. He grabbed a handful of the Zonkos beans and joined in flinging them into the fire. He and James soon made a game of who could create the biggest explosion by hitting the embers just right. Forgot to say, James said, once the bag of beans was empty. Got the owl from Dad today, he says we can have you over for Christmas. We just won't take the train so we can wait till the full moon's passed. What? Really? Remus shook his head, wordlessly. He ought to say thank you, but hardly knew how. Just waiting for you now, mate. James nudged Sirius with his foot. Have you sorted it out with your mum? Say you're going to the Pettigrew's again. Not bothering, Sirius replied. Just going to go to yours without saying anything. Sirius was rarely ever in contact with his parents, but since the Dimstrang development, he had been ignoring their owls altogether. Mum won't like it. James chewed his lip. Don't tell her, then. Sirius turned his page. James and Remus exchanged a look. They had to do something about the arrangement soon. The thought of Sirius being in this mood for the rest of the year was grim indeed. Second year, December moon. The Hogwarts Express left Hogsmeade Station for Christmas on Saturday the 16th age of December that year. This meant once the full moon had passed, James, Sirius and Remus had to find other means of getting to the Potters family home. McGonagall, after lecturing Remus on not letting any other students in on his secret, was sympathetic to the Marauders' wishes, and allowed them to use the Flow connection in her office just this once. Remus had heard all sorts of horror stories from fellow students about the Flow network, and it didn't help that he was usually queasy for a few days after the full moon. Sirius received a howler every morning after the 16th demanding that he come home at once. He simply tossed the scarlet envelopes into the fireplace, where Walpurga Black's screams echoed into the chimney stacks. Sirius was always up for a fight lately, and it was just better to steer clear. As the full moon drew nearer, Remus also had a very short fuse. The two boys bickered over anything and everything, and James had to step between the pair more than once. Just right back to her for heaven's sake, Remus groaned on the morning of the 20th, throwing a pillow at Sirius from his bed. He'd been woken early for the third morning in a row by a howler. If you think you can escape your birthright in this cowardly fashion, then you have another thing coming. It echoed through Gryffindor Tower like a banshee. Stay out of it, Lupin. Sirius flung the pillow back at him. How am I supposed to stay out of it when it's in our bloody bedroom every morning? Remus growled. I'm so sorry to inconvenience you. My whole life is only about to be destroyed. Sirius hadn't slept properly in days, but Remus was in too much of a short temper to care. His transformation was only hours away. How about not acting like a spoiled brat for 5 minutes, he snapped. You're so bloody selfish. I'm not asking her to send them. You're just in a bad mood because it's a full moon. Shut up. Remus was on his feet, and quickly swung a punch at Sirius. Mordio. Sirius hissed, aiming at Remus's face. At once, Remus let go, tumbling backwards onto the bed, clutching his forehead. A stinging sensation radiated from the spot Sirius had cursed. You huge git. You deserved it. Remus rolled off his bed. I'm going to the hospital wing, he said. Don't come with me. He glared at James. As he marched out of the room still in his pajamas, he heard James mutter, was that really necessary, Black? Madame Pomfrey healed Remus quickly using the counter jinx, but she was annoyed about it. Who did it? She asked him. If it was Potter or Black then I want to hear about it. I told Minerva it was a bad idea to let you go away for Christmas. Why shouldn't I go? Remus asked, scandalized. Sirius is going. Mr. Black doesn't have your limitations. But we're not going TI1 tomorrow, it's right after the full moon, that's the safest. I'm thinking of your health, Remus. Madame Pomfrey made him stay in the hospital wing all day. She had been working on a new potion that she hoped might make his transformation smoother. She let him borrow some of her books, so it wasn't too bad, but he felt like an invalid all the same. His face was still tingly from Sirius's hex, though the swelling had gone down. At about 1 o'clock, just after lunch, James and Sirius came to see him. Madame Pomfrey gave them a sound telling off, first. Cursing your fellow housemate. Cursing your dorm mate, for goodness sake. And Professor McGonagall has informed me that you know about his special circumstances. One might think you'd have more sense. James made copious apologies, and Sirius, who barely flinched at his mother's obscene chastisements anymore, hung his head looking utterly ashamed. Eventually, Remus guessed that this must have been enough to satisfy the school nurse, who allowed them to see him. They stood at the end of the bed, barely meeting his eye. We're really sorry, Remus, James started. Remus clicked his tongue. You never did anything. James kicked Sirius, who looked up too. I'm really sorry, Remus. When Remus saw the look on his face, he was no longer angry. I started it. Sorry I hit you. Sorry about the howler. Sorry your mom's a nightmare. Sorry you're a werewolf. They both laughed. Will she let you out now? James asked. A few hours still till the moon. Remus shook his head. Nah, she wants to try some new potion. I didn't know there was a cure. There isn't, Remus said, quickly. This is just I think it's to make the transformation easier. Less painful. Does it hurt, then? Sirius cocked his head. Now that the storm had passed, he was back to seeing Remus as an interesting specimen. Well, yet. Remus frowned. He had assumed they knew a lot more than him, having grown up in esteemed, educated pureblood families. For a long time, the pain was the only thing he had known. To his surprise, James and Sirius elected to stay in the hospital wing with him for the rest of the afternoon. They played many riotous games of exploding snap, before Madame Pomfrey sternly told them to quiet down, and they switched to Gob's tones. As the evening drew in, they didn't go down for dinner, but ate the same hospital food as he did. It was the closest thing to family he could imagine. McGonagall came and chased them out, eventually, ready to lead Remus to the shack. He went peacefully, with a soft smile on his lips and laughter still echoing in his ears. Madame Pomfrey's pain-killing potion had no effect, but Remus found the transformation slightly more tolerable all the same. James and Sirius arrived first thing the next morning. Remus was dozing in his bed, having been brought back into the castle at dawn. His face hurt, and he knew it wasn't from the curse anymore. Madame Pomfrey had left a hand mirror on his bedside table, glass down, but he had been too tired to look yet. He was woken by the sharp gasp of breath which came from either James or Sirius, he wasn't sure who. When he opened his eyes, they had both rearranged their expressions into stoic cheer. Remus hauled himself up. It must be bad. He lifted the heavy mirror and turned it towards his face. Ah. The cut looked half-healed already, thanks to Madame Pomfrey's ministrations, but it was still a shock. The stab was hard and black, edged with tender red skin. It stretched from the inner corner of one eye, over the bridge of his nose, and down towards the center of his opposite cheek. He couldn't remember much, but it looked as though he'd almost split his face wide open. My beautiful face, he said, weakly attempting a joke. Now everyone would know. So far he'd been able to hide the worst of his scars under his robes, but he knew it had only been a matter of time before his luck ran out. It's not that bad, James said, quickly. It'll heal really fast, I bet. How did Sirius began, but was interrupted by Madame Pomfrey, who came storming over. You two back again. They stepped back quickly with a fear they never showed for even McGonagall. The nurse whipped the curtain around Remus's bed shut in their faces. Ah, you've had a look, have you? She addressed Remus now, in a softer tone. I know it looks bad, but it'll pale just like the others. Should be barely noticeable by the new year. Remus didn't believe her, even his most faded scars were still quite noticeable. She took a closer look, then smoothed a clear ointment over the cut. Take this with you, she instructed, handing him the jar. Apply every morning and evening. It might itch a bit as it heals. Perhaps we could try trimming your nails down next month? Though I suppose the claws come in anyway. She sighed, sounding frustrated. Your face must have still been irritated even after we got the swelling down. It's fine, Remus shrugged her off. He was keenly aware of his friends on the other side of the curtain, and wanted her to go away. Can I go now? I feel okay. Wouldn't you rather get a bit more sleep? No, he shook his head vehemently. I'm hungry, I want to go down for breakfast. Well, fine. Get dressed and off you pop. Once fed, they went upstairs to pack because Sirius and Remus had left it to the last minute. James, frustrated by their lack of foresight, marched to McGonagall's office to see if everything was ready for their journey. Remus threw some clothes into his trunk, then turned to find Sirius standing directly behind him. What's up? Remus asked, startled. It's my fault, Sirius replied, his voice strangely flat. I heard Pomfrey say so. Your face. I cursed it, then when you transformed you scratched it. Remus raised his fingers to his face as Sirius looked away. It's not really your fault, Remus said. I mean, I scratch everywhere else, too. Bound to happen eventually. Why do you do it? I don't know. I don't remember. You don't remember anything at all? Not really. I know I'm always hungry, like I've been starving all my life. And angry. About what? Remus shook his head. Just angry. I'm so sorry, Remus. Sirius looked sad again. Whatever. It's one night a month. If I punch you, you're allowed to curse me, okay? Sirius looked like he wanted to laugh. Are you saying you were planning to punch me again? Remus threw a sock at him. If you don't sort out those damned howlers, maybe. Traveling by flow of powder was nothing compared to feeling your own spine elongate every month, and Remus wasn't sure what he'd been worried about. He was the second to step out of the fireplace into the potter's lounge, after James. Brushing soot from his shoulders, he quickly hopped off the hearthrug to make room for Sirius, and watched as James was pulled into a hearty embrace by both of his parents. MR and MRS Potter were quite a bit older than Remus had imagined, but both had kind, merry faces that shared familiar features with their son. Mr. Potter's hair was white as snow, but stuck up at every angle exactly like James's. MRS Potter had his winning smile and warm hazel eyes. They both hugged Sirius too, while Remus shrank back, feeling horribly out of place. Finally, MRS Potter turned her sunny smile on him. She nodded at him gently. Hello, Remus, we've heard ever so much about you. I'm so glad you're spending Christmas with us. Remus smiled back shyly, but couldn't bring himself to speak. It didn't matter, James and Sirius were chattering 19 to the dozen with Mr. Potter, who looked like a schoolboy himself, eyes twinkling with fun and mischief. The sitting room, Remus supposed it was a sitting room, as it had 3 sofas and it was the biggest he'd ever been in, with wide, tall windows that let soft winter sunlight reflect off the polished hardwood floors. A gigantic Christmas tree stood in one corner. It glimmered with silver dust, surrounded by a mountain of bright-colored presents. Paper chains and streamers were draped across the ceiling and along the picture rails. Even the magical portraits had decorated their frames with fairy lights. As they were led through the house, for goodness sakes, Fleamont, let the boys put their things away before you start planning whatever it is I know you're planning. Remus found that every room, even the hallways, were decorated with lights, tinsel, and hundreds of festive cards. The Potters must be very popular wizards. They were certainly wealthy. The sweeping mahogany staircase continued up 3 more flights. James's bedroom was big enough for all 3 of them, bigger than their dorm room at Hogwarts, with a king-sized 4-poster bed. Remus was even more surprised to find that there were 4 equally large unoccupied bedrooms for the rest of them. Sirius had already claimed the one next to James, so Remus put his bag in the 3rd room. Come on then, lads. Mr. Potter yelled up the stairs in a booming voice. It's been snowing all afternoon and I've got the toboggans ready. 2nd year, Christmas with the Potters. Remus had thought that nothing could be much better than Christmas at Hogwarts. Christmas at the Potters, however, was an entirely unique experience. First there was tobogganing down the snowy slopes in the back garden, though at over 500 acres, no one could really call it a garden. Peter, who lived further down in the main village, came out to join them as soon as he heard they had arrived. After that, they had an extremely noisy and violent afternoon careening down the hillsides and playing a complex war game with snowball ammunition. Mr. Potter joined in, sprightly for his age and with the considerable advantage of being able to use magic. MRS Potter called them all in for lunch and made them all change out of their freezing wet clothes. They sat by the fireplace, warm and dry, eating hot toasted tea cakes smeared with rich yellow butter. In the afternoon, they wanted to go out again, but Mr. Potter had gone to lie down and MRS Potter didn't want them to go out so close to nightfall. Instead they helped her decorate an enormous Christmas cake with white royal icing and tiny magical figurines, then wrap presents for the neighbors and their house elves. We never got anything for the house elf, Sirius said matter-of-factly, his fingers hopelessly bound up in some spell-o tape. Mind you, Kriaker's a moody git, I doubt he wants anything. They'll take gifts as long as it's something edible, I find, MRS Potter said with a smile. No clothes, of course, that only upsets them. Tell Mum what your lot does to house elves, Sirius, James said, binding his friend's hands up even more. Sirius laughed, lightly. Mounts their heads, he said. Once they're dead. At least, I think we wait until they're dead. Kriaker's the only house elf I remember. Goodness, said MRS Potter. I had rather thought that tradition had died out. Not with the blacks, Sirius sighed. Remus could tell that he was thinking about his transfer again. You're making a lovely job of that, Remus, MRS Potter observed, glancing at the book he was wrapping for MRS Pettigrew. Remus smiled at her, politely, feeling the fresh cut on his face pull at his skin. He hadn't really said anything to either of James' parents yet. He'd never really been to a friend's house before. Sirius, by contrast, was completely at ease, and Remus had never seen him happier. He acted as if MRS Potter was his own mother if he'd liked his own mother, of course. Remus yawned, more widely than he meant to, trying to hide behind his hands. He had only slept a few hours that morning following the moon, and an afternoon of snowball maneuvers had left him exhausted. You'd better go up to bed, dear, MRS Potter said, ignoring the fact that it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Remus wondered if James had told his parents about him. They must know. McGonagall might not have let him come otherwise. Gratefully, Remus got up from the kitchen table and made his way to bed. As he changed into his night things, he couldn't help but steal another glance at himself in the mirror, now that he was properly alone. Perhaps it was having been out in the cold, but the scar looked worse than it had that morning, the contrast harsher with his pale skin. Would his face always surprise him, now? Would he always catch a glimpse of himself in some mirror or shining surface and jump? Would other people be afraid of him? There was a soft tap at the door, just as Remus was about to put on the ointment Madame Pomfrey had given him. It was Sirius. Remus caught his scent before he even knocked. All right, he spoke quietly as he crept inside. He held a pewter goblet in his hand. James's mum sent you this. It's a healing draft, I think. He set it on the bedside table. Oh, thanks. Remus sat down, the effort of speaking making him dizzy. Sorry, Sirius said. I'll leave you. He closed the door. Remus smeared on some of the ointment, then sniffed the goblet MRS Potter had sent. He recognized it as something he'd had before at Hogwarts, which would trigger instant sleep. He drained it quickly, and got into bed. The remaining days before Christmas passed quickly, and Remus was able to really experience Potter family life for the first time. MR and MRS Potter had to be the perfect parents. They were kind and sure, always smiling and full of fun. Remus hadn't known that adults could be that way. He hadn't known people could grow up like that. It was clearer than ever why James was the way he was, brimming with love and blind confidence. It was obvious, too, why Sirius was so drawn to the family. The Potters had an endless supply of love for all James' friends. The 4 boys tramped all over the surrounding countryside in the snow, bundled up in Gryffindor scarves, hats, and gloves. In the evenings they played card games, helped MRS Potter prepare dinner and listened to Mr. Potter telling ghost stories around the fireplace. They made mince pies and paper chains, built snow wizards and igloos, and slept so soundly in their beds at night that not even a howler could have woken them. Unfortunately, it was not to last. While the blacks had stopped sending howlers, they hadn't forgotten their wayward son. They tried their new tact on Christmas Eve, with devastating consequences for the Marauders. They were drinking hot butterbeer and sitting on the hearthrug. James and Sirius were playing gobstones loudly, and Mr. Potter was teaching Remus to play chess. The old man had been horrified that Remus didn't know how, and Remus was surprised to find himself actually quite enjoying the game. The whole room felt warm and safe, heavy curtains drawn against the cold and dark, tree lights twinkling and the fire popping and crackling beside them. The clock had just struck 9, and MRS Potter was keen to send them all to bed, when there was a loud crack outside the window. MR and MRS Potter shared a quick glance, and Remus's ears pricked like a dog. The smell of spent magic permeated the air, like burnt toast. Something dark and unsavory. There was a firm, hollow knock at the door. Weren't expecting anyone, were we, Effie? Mr. Potter frowned slightly at his wife. She shook her head, and they both listened. The Potter's house elf, Gully, went scampering towards the front door to answer it. There were stilted voices in the hall, and Gully came hurrying back. Oh, Mr. Potter, MRS Potter, she's come for young Master Black. She's telling Gully she's his mother. Gully told her to wait there for you. The elf was wringing his hands anxiously at the turn of events. Sirius and James looked at each other. Sirius's face was white, he looked like he might be sick. She wow 1DNT. He whispered. Mr. Potter was already up and out the door. There were raised voices in the hallway now. Remus recognized MRS Black's sharp tone from her horrid letters. Sirius, MRS Potter said, gently. Did your parents give you permission to visit us, dear? He looked at the floor. Don't make him leave, Mum. James stood up. He hates them. They're his parents, James. Sirius. Mr. Potter called from the hall. Sirius got up, and James did too. Remus didn't want to. He wanted to stay by the fire where they'd all been so happy just moments before. But MRS Potter had stood up too, and this was one of those times the Marauders had to present a united front, no matter how frightening Sirius's mother was. They all filed out into the hall. Remus had seen MRS Black once before, the first time he boarded the Hogwarts Express. Back then he'd simply thought she looked very severe, and a little like Sirius. She still looked severe. Her hair was slicked back and pulled up in a high bun which coiled like a serpent at the crown of her head, fixed with an emerald pin. Her eyes were dark, not as blue as Sirius's, but she had that black family bone structure and superior look. She was shorter than Mr. Potter, but still managed to gaze at him as though he was filth on her boot. Her look sharpened as she saw James and Remus appear. Sirius, she said, coldly to her eldest son. You will come with me at once. Creaker. She snapped her fingers in an old, wizened house elf that emerged from behind her robes. Go upstairs and fetch Master Black's things. The house elf bowed deeply, kissing the silver-capped toes of MRS Black's pointed boots, and scurried upstairs. Good evening, Walpurga, MRS Potter said, pleasantly. May I offer you a drink? We were just about to crack out the mince pies, weren't we, boys? MRS Black ignored her, looking straight at Sirius. Put on your cloak. We're leaving now. But mother, Don't you dare speak back to me, she hissed, eyes flashing. Remus wanted to run away. She was worse than Bellatrix and Snape and every nasty person he had ever met put together. The thought of letting Sirius go with her made his insides twist. MR and MRS Potter seemed to be suffering from the same crisis. Walpurga, why not let him stay? MRS Potter tried. I know he's been a bit naughty, but there's no harm done. We can have him for lunch and send him back before dinner tomorrow. They've all been having such a nice time together. MRS Black let out a short, crackling laugh, as if her son's enjoyment was the least of her concerns. She eyed James, her gaze raking over his mess of hair, then Remus, staring pointedly at his new scar. Remus looked at his feet, terrified. She'd know. She'd know straight away. Creaker came scuttling back down the stairs, followed by a very affronted-looking Gully. Sirius's trunk hovered behind them both, packed and ready to go. Walpurga turned. Come along, Sirius. No, he said, quietly, but firmly. Remus wanted to tell him to shut up. Couldn't he see how much trouble he was in? But Sirius was clenching his fists, looking at his mother. I want to stay here, with the Potters. You can't make me. Silencio. Walpurga spun around, pointing her wand at Sirius. He stopped speaking at once. He opened and closed his mouth, and nothing came out. She had stolen his voice. Walpurga, really? Mr. Potter gasped, as MRS Potter let out a shriek, and stepped in front of Sirius. He's just a boy, she said. He is my son, Walpurga said, looking daggers at MRS Potter. And he is heir to the finest house in Britain. He will learn his place. Come, Sirius. Sirius, completely defeated, his mouth a straight line, hugged MRS Potter, then stepped away from her. He gave James and Remus a small wave, before following his mother out the door. It slammed behind them, leaving the rest of them in silence. Remus felt as though someone had taken away his own power of speech. He wondered if James felt as ashamed as he did. Oughtn't they to have stood up for their friend in some way? What would happen to him now? Mr. Potter was furious. Using a silencing charm on her own son. On an underage wizard. It's morally reprehensible. She does worse than that, James said. We'll have to make the house unplottable, Fleamont, MRS Potter said. Make it so we can't be found. You said you were considering it, after the last election. I don't want that dreadful woman in my house ever again. Mr. Potter nodded, darkly. I'll look into it in the new year. Alastair Moody owes me a favor. Bedtime, boys, MRS Potter said, her voice trembling. Try not to worry too much. She hugged James fiercely, kissing him on each cheek. Remus tried to dodge her, but she grabbed him too. PSST. Remus. Remus had just finished brushing his teeth and was making his way down the hall to his room, when James poked his head out and ushered him into his own bedroom. They knelt on the bed together. James withdrew a note from his pajama pocket. Regulus sent this. What does it say? Remus asked. Sirius is home, do not try to contact him. That's all. That's all. James nodded, grimly. Nice of Regulus, Remus remarked, looking down at the note which was obviously very hastily scribbled down. Thought they hated each other. Yeah, well they're still brothers, aren't they? James shrugged. Family ties and all that. Do you think he'll be okay? I don't know. James chewed his lip. I never got to give him his present. He said he never gets anything Christ massy from his lot, just family heirlooms and stuff. Christmas morning after the incident was a subdued affair, though the Potters were keen to make it cheerful. Remus was embarrassed to find a bulging stocking at the foot of his bed when he woke up, and resolved to repay the others next year somehow. There was a tin of shortbread, chocolate frogs from Peter, and a big book of advanced charms from Sirius. James had bought him a book, 2 Conjurer's Cartography, a guide to magical map-making. MR and MRS Potter had gone above and beyond. Under the tree he found more sweets, practical jokes, a beautiful set of quills which he tried to give back. We got the same for James and Sirius, dear, don't be silly, and a brand new pair of pajamas. The Potters' extended family began arriving for Christmas lunch at midday, as well as the Pettigrews, who brought with them Peter's elder sister, Philomena, and her muggle boyfriend. Remus was introduced to everyone as a friend of James, and generally ignored, except by one tiny, ancient wizard who was red-nosed and merry from all of the drinks Gully was passing around. Lupin, you say? Not Lyle Lupin's boy. Remus gaped, unsure what to expect. Yes. Is he here? The wizard grinned, looking around. Excellent fellow, haven't seen him in years. No. Remus replied, with an apologetic shrug. Bloody shame. The wizard cried, spilling some of his drink. Fine jeweler, taught me everything I know about boggets. Temper did tend to get him into trouble, though I told him not to mess about with that greyback chap. Bloody werewolves, ought to exterminate the lot of them. Remus blinked. James looked at him, curiously. Fortunately, Mr. Potter intervened. Darius. Have another drink, old man, leave the young people to their games, Remus swallowed hard and returned to the Gobstones tournament as if nothing had happened. Second year, Sirius returns. Saturday 6 January 1973. Peter, James, and Remus arrived promptly at King's Cross to return to Hogwarts on the Saturday before term began. They peered about for their fourth, but Sirius wasn't there, nor was Regulus. As the train pulled out of the platform, James went in search of answers for why not. He returned with his hands over his nose, where a large boil was beginning to form. Narcissa said it's none of my business, he explained, and sat down heavily. Maybe they're using the Flow network, Peter said. Maybe his mom didn't trust him to get on the train with us. Maybe. James stared out the window, rubbing his sore nose. Remus had never seen him so unhappy. James had been missing Sirius more than any of them, and had been the most excited at the prospect of seeing him once they got to London. Remus and Peter tried their hardest to cheer him up, but it was as if he was missing his right arm. Before leaving, MR and MRS Potter said they would see what they could do about having Remus to stay with them over the summer, too, and he thanked them profusely. It wasn't likely, though, so he didn't get his hopes up. Instead he just tried to be grateful that he was returning to school for a few more months with his friends. Most of them, anyway. Sirius was nowhere to be found at dinner that evening, nor did he appear by the time they were getting ready for bed. James and Remus had brought his Christmas presents back for him, and piled them on top of his pillow, still wrapped in bright shiny paper and ribbon. 3 of the packages were from Andromeda. On Sunday morning, the bed was still empty, and the 3 Marauders tried to distract themselves with homework. Remus finished his and took the opportunity to get started on his Christmas books. James took to pacing the room, then went to ask McGonagall where Sirius was. She didn't know, and even tried Narcissa a second time. She cursed him again. Finally, he went outside to do a few laps of the Quidditch pitch on his broom. Peter went too, with a box of biscuits to nibble on while he watched. Remus stayed indoors where it was warm, reading, or at least pretending to. Now that he was alone, he began thinking about the things Mr. Potter's friend Darius had said about his father. For the first time, Remus considered that his bouts of rage might not always have to do with his condition. He glanced out the window and caught sight of James acting even more recklessly than usual. "What is he playing at?" a voice demanded over Remus's shoulder. It was Lily Evans. "Looks like he's being an even bigger show-off than usual." She was sipping a mug of tea, staring at James on his broom. "Nervous energy," Remus said, turning away. The light from the window would cast his face into sharp relief, and his scar was still very noticeable. "It's not been a great Christmas for him," he explained. "I'm sorry, I know he's your friend. She always said that right after she insulted one of the Marauders. How was your Christmas?" "Great, thanks. You?" "Brilliant." He could hear the grin in her voice. "Mom and Dad finally let me get an L." "Oh, terrific. What about you?" Remus sighed. She wasn't going to leave him alone. Everyone was going to see it anyway. At least Lily was polite enough not to ask any rude questions. "Got some books," he said finally, giving up trying to hide his face. "You like to read, don't you?" she asked. Lily sipped her tea, and continued to watch James out the window. "You know, I think he's just really passionate about it. Quidditch," she said as he did a loop-de-loop through a cloud. Eventually Remus went upstairs, drew his bed curtains together, and settled into Conjurer's cartography. The others eventually came up for bed too, speaking quietly, thinking he was asleep. The exercise had done nothing to calm James down. Remus could hear his rapid heartbeat and smell his anxiety. It was perhaps an hour after lights out that the door creaked open again. Sirius had returned. There was no mistaking his familiar footfall. Remus felt a wave of relief wash over him as Sirius padded towards his bed. A knot in his stomach that he hadn't realized was there beginning to uncoil. James and Peter kept sleeping as Sirius crept into his bed and drew the curtains. Remus lay still. There was something different in his breathing. Eventually curiosity got the better of him and he got out of bed. Remus trod as close to Sirius's curtains as he dared and whispered, "Sirius." "James?" he asked. "Remus." "Oh. I just want to sleep." "Speak tomorrow, okay." Remus padded back to his own bed and closed his eyes, feeling no less concerned. Monday, January 8, 1973. The next morning Sirius had already left before any of them woke up. His presents, still unopened, had been pushed to the end of the bed. His trunk had arrived at some point, and his broom was back on its shelf. James saved him a seat at breakfast, but he never turned up, and they didn't see him at all until their first lesson. He wouldn't miss McGonagall, James said, as they walked to the classroom. He loves transfiguration. When they entered the room, however, they were in for a shock. Another boy sat in Sirius's seat. He was smallish and hunched over, with pale, pointed features and big blue eyes. But the most noticeable thing was how big his head was. "Who's that?" Peter whispered, a little too loudly. The boy turned to look at them. "Sirius." James gaped. Sirius colored slightly, and looked straight ahead as if he hadn't seen them at all. James slid into the seat beside him. "What happened? Where have you been? What did she do to you?" Sirius shook his head. Later, he murmured. The classroom had filled up now, and everyone was whispering behind their backs. Remus couldn't blame them, since he couldn't stop staring either. It wasn't just the size of his head, although that was incredibly disconcerting. It was doubled in size, clearly some kind of jinx, but Sirius also had dark shadows under his eyes, and there wasn't a trace of humor on his lips. "All right, settle down, please." McGonagall entered the room. She glanced at Sirius. Her eyes widened as she recognized him, but she addressed the class. "Your end-of-year exams begin in 3 months, now let's see who's been paying attention." When Transfiguration ended, the Marauders packed up their things and followed Sirius hurriedly out the door. "What happened?" James asked, trying to keep up with Sirius' brisk clip. "Wait until break, okay," was the only thing he said. History of magic was agony. James tried passing notes to Sirius, who sat stiffly, back straight, eyes on the board. For the first time in 2 years, Remus saw him actually reading his history text in class. Something was very wrong indeed. After class, James grabbed Sirius's arm and marched him to the nearest courtyard. He chased away a group of first-year girls doing handstands against a wall with their skirts tucked into their knickers. It was icy cold, though no snow had fallen yet. The sky was paper white and a storm was on its way. Once the coast was clear, James stared Sirius down with deep creases in his brow. "What happened?" Sirius sighed heavily. "What's it look like?" He gestured at his head. Remus had the feeling that neither of them cared he and Peter were there. This was between the two of them. "Your mom did that." "Well, I didn't do it myself, did I?" he snapped. James didn't react, just kept looking at his friend. That was James' secret, Remus realized. He was always patient and never took anything personally. It was probably the only way to possibly be best friends with someone like Sirius Black. Sirius pulled his hood over his head, which had never previously been worn. "Bloody freezing," he muttered. "Aren't you cold?" He glanced at Remus and Peter. Remus shrugged and smiled, pleased to be acknowledged. Sirius leaned against the wall. "It's an Engorjo Skull's charm, for my punishment," he said. "They let me come back, at least. They almost didn't one wrong move and they promised to send me to Durmstrang early. Didn't get my voice back until Christmas dinner. Had to play my part for that. Everyone was there, all of the Sacred 28 except the Weasleys, obviously. Lucius Malfoy really bloody hates me now, but he had to be really nice to me and Reggie Slimy Creep. I got away with wearing my Gryffindor tie until Mum noticed and banished it. Then I, may have set off a few dung bombs during the 4th course." Peter, Remus, and James collectively winced. "That's why, the head?" James asked tentatively. She said seeing as the usual punishments weren't having any effect, she'd try something different. "I tried to get Pomfrey shrink it for me, but she said she wasn't a beautician. Thought I'd done it myself by accident or something." "You could tell her," Remus started, feeling the need to defend the nurse. Sirius shook his head. "Not worth it." "Regulus?" James asked, suddenly. "Is he back too?" "He sent us a note to let us know you got home, but we never heard anything else." Sirius nodded. "Yeah, he's back. Kept his hair. Dad sorted out a Porkea in Hogsmeade. He's still a bit of a tosser, but he didn't choose to be a black either. He just plays the game better than I do. I just wish." Sirius trailed off and said nothing more. Remus didn't know what he'd been about to say, but something about the tone of Sirius' voice made him feel very sad. It made him think, shockingly, maybe he wasn't the one with the worst problem, after all. Second year, Gryffindor vs. Slytherin. Everyone in the school knew about Sirius's dramatic new look by the end of their first day back. James and Peter took to walking either side of him through the corridors, like bodyguards, shooting glares at anyone who dared snigger or whisper as they passed. "It doesn't look that bad," James assured him, watching Sirius stare at himself in the mirror. They were hiding in the empty second-floor girls' loos during lunch to avoid any more staring. James was lying, Remus thought to himself, and Sirius must have known it. It looked really bad. His body seemed so much smaller under the swollen head. Even his eyes appeared larger, making him look young and anxious. The high cheekbones and sharp eyebrows stood out more than ever, giving him a mean, gaunt sort of look. Barely anyone even glanced at Remus' newly scarred face next to Sirius. Still, Remus thought, glumly this would wear off. Sirius's brother was waiting outside the Gryffindor common room later that evening. He was sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up, staring into space. His friend, Barty Crouch, was leaning against the opposite wall, looking bored. He had made a paper airplane and was directing it lazily up and down the hallway with his wand. Crouch and Regulus were as inseparable as James and Sirius. Barty was fair-haired and witty, with a mean streak worse than Snape's. Remus recognized him by his cruel barking laugh before he saw who it was. Regulus stood up as the Marauders approached. Remus felt inside his pocket for his wand, just in case. There you are, the first year said, a tremor of nervousness in his arrogant tone. His eyes kept flicking towards James. Barty's paper plane began circling them all. What do you want? Sirius asked. Just seeing how you are. No different from last night. Sirius shrugged. I didn't see you at dinner. Wasn't at dinner, Sirius replied. They'd sent Peter down to the kitchens to pinch sandwiches and sat in one of Remus's hidden alcoves to eat. Remus was personally enjoying this game, avoiding the rest of the students, even the Gryffindors. Usually James and Sirius would do everything in their power to be noticed, while Remus preferred flying under the radar. Can I talk to you? Regulus addressed his older brother. Sirius spread his arms, as if giving Regulus the floor. I mean alone. Regulus rolled his eyes. No, Sirius said, simply. Barty Crouch's paper plane spun faster over their heads. Peter watched its progress anxiously. Regulus folded his arms. I just wanted to let you know that Mother and Father asked me and Narcissa to watch you. And report back to them. Sirius made a noise of disgust. Regulus continued, not dropping his gaze, and we're not going to. We're both staying out of it, okay? How noble of you, Sirius replied. Regulus rolled his eyes again. I'm telling you, I'm not your enemy, idiot. Nor is Narcissa. You can do whatever you like, that's between you and our parents. Good. Good. The two brothers continued to stare each other down. If it had been James, he'd have broken into a smile, slapped Sirius on the shoulder and all would be forgotten. But Regulus was clearly just as pig-headed as Sirius, and couldn't tell when to end a fight. Ow. Peter let out a yelp like a whipped puppy. Barty Crouch had grown bored of the family drama and dive-bombed the smallest marauder with his sharp paper plane. Crouch was giggling as the plane backed up and prepared for its second attack, when James pulled out his own wand. Incendio, he said, lazily flicking his wrist in Crouch's direction. The plane, wings, now alight, went soaring back towards Crouch with frightening speed. With a cry of anguish, he covered his face, but the flaming projectile fizzled out mid-air. It crumbled into a pile of ash inches from his nose. Let's go, Regulus muttered to his friend. Narcissa said to tell you good luck for Saturday, Potter, Regulus said over his shoulder before they set off for the dungeons. Once the Marauders went through the portrait hole, Remus asked, what's Saturday? Quidditch match. Gryffindor v Slytherin. James replied, promptly. Oh. Remus was no good at keeping up with the Quidditch schedule. He only went to Gryffindor matches, and the last one had fallen on the day after a full moon, so he'd missed it. He tended to tune out when the others started talking about tactics and league tables, burying his nose deeper in his book. I hope you thrash him, mate, Sirius growled, throwing himself into the nearest armchair. Plan to, James said, jovially, sitting on the arm of the chair. As long as she doesn't get the snitch too early, and Marlene's the best beater we've had in years, so. James stopped short, realizing what he'd said. He looked at Sirius. Sirius groaned and stood up. I'm going to bed, he said. Saturday 13th January 1973. It had snowed overnight, but Gryffindor common room was still buzzing with excitement, with talk of how these were perfect flying conditions. Peter and Remus spent half the morning trying to cast long-lasting warning spells on James's kit. Sirius had done one of his early morning vanishing acts, and was nowhere to be seen. Arwen Johnson, the Gryffindor team captain, made the team eat together at breakfast, rather than with their friends. They all sat there looking pale and tired, eating uniform bowls of porridge and fruit, on Johnson's orders. James was the only one in a good mood even though they hadn't got the warming spell to work. Where's Sirius? Lily yawned, as she took a seat next to Remus, who was biting into a slice of heavily buttered toast. Dunno, Remus yawned back, gripping his hot cup of tea as if his life depended on it. Sulking somewhere, probably, Peter said, bitterly. Remus gave him a sharp look. What? He calls me whiny all the time. He'll be here, Remus said, ignoring Peter. He wants to see us destroy the Slytherins. Lily grinned at this. She was decked in red and gold from head to toe. After breakfast they walked to the Quidditch pitch together. The Gryffindor quarter of the pitch was bedecked with red and gold flags and streamers, plus 4 large banners displaying the golden Gryffindor lion. Thankfully someone had cleared the snow from the benches. Lily and Peter wanted to get the best seats at the very top of the spectator stands. Remus was already shivering despite wearing 2 jumpers under his cloak. Cold. Lily glanced at him, as he tried to blow hot air into his gloved hands. Just a bit. Lily pulled out her wand and grabbed his wrists, pointing into his palms. Taladum Vestimentat. A delightful warmth spread through his hands, to the very tips of his frozen fingers. How did you do that? He asked. We've been trying all morning. I think it's in the enunciation. Lily shrugged. She quickly applied the same spell to Remus's cloak, then to Peter's. By the time this was done, the 2 Quidditch teams were gathering on the pitch, which had been cleared enough for them to make a path from their changing rooms. They stood in 2 neat rows, 1 scarlet, 1 emerald. Remus could make out a few of the players, James's unmistakable mop of jet black hair, Marlene's fluffy sandy blonde ponytail. He could also see Narcissa Black, on the opposing team, tall and willowy, her platinum hair woven into 2 neat braids which reached halfway down her back. Of course, Peter was blathering to Lily, we don't actually need to win this one, we just need to keep our points up. As long as we finish with at least 6 goals then we stay at the top of the league. Black's a brilliant seeker, but Slytherin overall are pretty poor. Especially when you look at James, having him's like having 3 chasers in one. Lily was nodding along politely. People so seldom listened to Peter when it came to sport. Remus certainly didn't. He'd attempted to read Sirius' dog-eared copy of Quidditch through the ages, but nothing in it could help him make sense of the ridiculous points system. Madame Hooch blew her whistle below, and the players mounted their brooms. They squatted, ready for kickoff. Still no Sirius. Remus craned his neck, looking around the stands. Even with his excellent eyesight, he couldn't spot his friend anywhere. Surely the head swelling charm had worn off and Peter wasn't right. He couldn't be off sulking somewhere. Wasn't he over his rejection from the Quidditch team? He'd been at every match that year to support James. Just because this particular match was against Slytherin. Madame Hooch blew her whistle again and released the snitch. The players shot into the air like red and green cannonballs. Still no Sirius. Peter and Lily were on their feet cheering with everyone else, so Remus got up too and attempted to look involved in the game. James had possession of the quaffle within seconds of being in the air, and had it through the hoop in under a minute. The red crowds exploded with triumph, but were quickly overshadowed by a deafening noise like a thunderclap. What was that? Lily stared about, wide-eyed, along with everyone else. Even the players on the pitch were startled. Remus looked up and saw that the lions in the Gryffindor banners above them had come to life, and were prowling back and forth across the red material, growling and tossing their heads restlessly. Is that normal? Remus asked, pointing. Lily and Peter shook their heads, speechless, as the enormous lions roared above them. Remus smiled, suddenly. He recognized that magic, playful, and a bit scary. Look. He pointed again. At the bottom of the spectators' stands, nearest the ground, a young Gryffindor in bright red robes was stalking back and forth, waving his wand like a conductor's baton. It was Sirius who else had that confident strut. He had donned an enormous golden wig, like a lion's mane that disguised anything misshapen about his head. Remus thought he could even see a gold tail dragging behind from under his robes. Once everyone had seen him, the crowds laughed, even Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. Only Slytherin didn't. The green-colored portion of the crowd merely glared at the garish show of house pride. James wasn't distracted by the new maskets. He seemed encouraged by them, which must have been Sirius's intention. He scored at least 3 more goals, resulting in 3 more ear-splitting roars while the Slytherins struggled to recover from the surprise. We are Gryffindor. Sirius was chanting, his voice magically amplified. Mighty mighty Gryffindor. The crowd screamed back. Once he got used to all the noise, Remus began to enjoy a Quidditch game for the first time. James was like a red blur on the pitch, darting this way and that, though the other chasers were good too, managing to keep up with his complicated formations and passes. Marlene, bat in hand, was doing a stunning job of not only protecting the chasers and seeker, but aiming bludgeons at the other team, Narcissa in particular. Narcissa Black, however, was in her own league. She had an elegant, smooth flying style that Remus recognized from Sirius' attempts to teach him formal flying. She was quick and always moving, like water. The Gryffindor seeker was following her movements, hoping she would lead him to the snitch, but she kept dodging and making false turns to confuse him, twice sending him directly into the path of a bludger. Narcissa wasn't showy like James, she was efficient and ruthless. Gryffindor had a 100-point lead when Narcissa finally saw the snitch. Remus noticed the moment she caught sight of it. Her posture changed, she didn't look away even once. She hovered for a few moments, glancing behind her to see where the Gryffindor seeker was. He was hanging back, unsure what she was planning. At that moment, Maisie Jackson, one of the Gryffindor chasers, scored another goal, bringing Gryffindor's score up to 130 against Slytherin's 20. The Gryffindors went wild, and Sirius waved his wand more enthusiastically. This time the roaring lions leapt clear through the banners, into the winter air, where they became golden shadows striding over the pitch. The Gryffindor seeker dived away terrified. They vanished just above his head. No, you idiot. Sirius's voice echoed over the cheering. It was too late. Narcissa had taken advantage of her opponent's distraction and scooped up the snitch. She flew above the crowds, holding it triumphantly aloft. The Slytherin crowd burst into applause, sending up green and silver sparks. Black, black, black. They cheered. This was highly confusing, as the Gryffindors were also chanting, black, black, black. As Sirius took his pose before the crowd, James swooped down to land beside Sirius and ruffled his friend's ridiculous mane. The crowd now chanted, Potter, Potter, Potter. Oh well. Peter grinned up at Remus. We lost, but we're still tied with Ravenclaw in the league table. Still going through to the final. Remus couldn't care less. Afterwards they poured onto the pitch to congratulate their team. Remus and Peter both punched Sirius playfully. You never told us. We could have helped. Sirius just smirked and tossed his glorious golden hair. Sirius. A thin voice broke through the crowd. They all turned. Narcissa strode towards them, her emerald robes billowing behind her, and a bright silver medal hanging around her neck. Sirius stood to face her. She gave him a smirk. Take off that obscene wig, she said. He did, rubbing his bare head self-consciously. Narcissa pulled out her wand with one sweeping motion and tapped his head. Creskara. The Marauders, and the crowd of Gryffindors around them gasped. Sirius' head began to shrink, until it was back to its usual size. Narcissa grinned, showing rows of pearly teeth. That's for your help in ensuring a Slytherin victory. Her silver plates whipped around, and she flounced towards her own team. I'm never going to understand your bonkers family, mate, said James. Remus had to agree. Second year, discoveries. After the landmark Gryffindor vs. Slytherin game, it felt as though time was speeding up for Remus. Part of this was down to the balance having been restored to their dorm room. James was once again the hero, Sirius' rebellious streak was back in full flow, Peter was no longer treading on eggshells around either of them, and Remus had no peace and quiet at all, though could hardly complain about it. As if trying to make up for lost time, James and Sirius tore through the final weeks of winter with a renewed zest for pranks and mischief. They spent half of their time under the invisibility cloak, casting hexes at unsuspecting students in the halls, raiding the kitchens and causing upset in the dining hall. At least 3 or 4 nights a week they crept out together with Remus's map to plot the castle, though most of the time they returned with armfuls of sweets from Honeydukes instead. Peter often tried to tag along, but Remus needed all the sleep he could get. Neither his January or February full moons were quite as bad as the December moon that had left his face scarred, but neither were they very pleasant. Madame Pomfrey was relentless in her quest to find a solution. In January she tried vanishing his fingernails, only temporarily, you understand, you'll have them back in the morning, but it didn't stop his claws from growing in once the transformation took hold. Remus was somewhat relieved by this, as she'd had plans to vanish his teeth next. In February, she tried securing his arms and legs with magical manacles to stop him from hurting himself. She was extremely apologetic about these measures. Even more so when she returned in the morning to find that he had dislocated both shoulders, breaking free of the shackles. He was too tired to care very much. Engaging in less pranks than he had the year before, Remus chose to throw himself into his studies. He wanted to come top in history of magic again, and his marks had been getting better in transfiguration, herbology, and astrology. With James and Sirius distracted, he had the chance to be the top in all 3. Charms and potions still belonged to Lily Evans, but he wanted to close the gap between them as much as possible. He spent almost every free hour he had in the library, completing essays and revising. He was using a spell to read faster and was consuming more knowledge than ever before. Lily was often in the library too, and after a few days of nodding politely to each other across the desks, Lily gathered up her things and came to sit next to him. They got along well together, either reading quietly or querying each other on various points. Soon Remus found he was often joined by her friends, Mary and Marlene. At first he was unsure about this arrangement. The 2 MS were generally to be found giggling at the back of the class or fawning over some wizard celebrity in the common room. However, he found both girls took their studies just as seriously as he did, and in fact their interest in wizard pop stars was hardly different from Sirius and James's obsession with their favorite Quidditch teams. Mary was a friendly muggle born from South London. Her accent made Remus feel strangely at home. She had a broad smile and loud, infectious laugh. Marlene was slightly quieter, but hysterically funny, able to mimic almost anyone in the school, including the teachers. Her McGonagall was spectacular. Remus actually cried with laughter. Remus learned plenty of interesting things from them. For one, Mary had a spell for covering up blemishes, which didn't completely vanish his scars, but noticeably reduced their appearance. He'd never thought to look in a beauty magazine for a solution. In return, Remus helped them with history of magic, since he was apparently the only student in the whole school who actually found Professor Binns interesting. Marlene was excellent at astronomy, and showed him how to plot his constellations using some clever mnemonic devices. They walked back to the common room together. When they entered, Remus quickly spied Sirius, James, and Peter huddled in a corner, poring over a thick book. Marlene, Mary, and Lily went to the girls' dorms. The Marauders looked up as their friend approached, and Peter conspicuously covered the book they were reading with some sheets of parchment. Remus craned his neck. What are you doing? Nothing. James said, brightly. Where have you been? In the library, Sirius stated, before Remus could even open his mouth. Okay, seriously, what are you hiding there? Remus pushed. All three looked at each other guiltily, and Remus felt a sting of hurt. He had refused to take part in any pranks for so long that now they didn't want to include him at all. Your birthday. Peter burst out. It's coming up. Oh. Yeah, Remus said. Next week. We're planning a surprise. Peter said, looking pleased with himself. Remus didn't miss James' look of annoyance, and knew at once that Peter was lying. Oh, right. He swallowed, forcing a smile. Well, you'd better not be planning to embarrass me like last year. Oh no, never. Sirius stood up, gathering the book to his chest to keep the title hidden. Are we the sort of friends that would want to embarrass you, Lupin? Yeah, you are. Remus narrowed his eyes. No singing. No big parties. Nothing. That's going to get you into trouble, we know, James finished, standing up too. Hey, why don't we invite your new friends, eh? Do us good to mix with the other Gryffindors, don't you think? Right. Sirius tossed his hair. More like you want a chance to get Evans on her own. James turned pink. Remus rolled his eyes. Second year, 13. Saturday, March 10th, 1973. The Marauders couldn't have been happier to discover Remus' birthday occurred on a Saturday that year. This opened the day up to all sorts of excitement that wouldn't be possible on a weekday. As the day approached, Remus tried to ignore their heavy-handed hints about what lay in store. He trusted them well enough they could be relied upon to make a fool of themselves, but they had so far never made him the butt of the joke. James had been receiving strange lumpy packages bound up in brown paper for the past week, and Remus's only hope was that they weren't presents for him. He'd never be able to return the favor. Remus thought a lot about being 13, specifically being a 13-year-old wizard with a furry little problem. He needed to make sure he was successful enough to be valuable despite his disability. His father had been really clever. He was in Ravenclaw, after all. The Sorting Hat had considered Remus for Ravenclaw too, but changed its mind. That hadn't meant a great deal to him at the time, but now he wondered about it. Why hadn't the hat put him there? As he fell asleep on the night before his birthday, Remus slipped into a dream he hadn't had in a long time. He was lying in a small, pale blue room. It was summer and the sash window was open with the curtains billowing. The window was huge, big enough for a grown man to get through. Remus was frightened. There was someone in the room with him, and they were going to hurt him. It was a monster. His mother promised they weren't real, but she was wrong. There was a monster, and it was crossing the room, coming towards him, and his heart hurt with fear. There was nothing but pain, so much blood, so many tears, and an awful lot of noise. He couldn't move. Another man loomed over him, tall and worried. Daddy. Lumos Maxima. Remus woke with a jolt. Bright, unnatural light sliced through his bed curtains. He just had time to wipe the tears from his eyes before Sirius and James ripped them back, chanting. Happy birthday, Lupin. It's still dark out, you gits. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, willing his heart to stop pounding so hard. It is precisely 1 minute past midnight, Sirius said, and therefore officially your 13th birthday. Where's Pete? Remus climbed out of bed. The room, which had previously been decked out in Quidditch flags and fairy lights left over from Christmas, was now decorated haphazardly with streamers that said on a mission. Come in, up and dressed. James' eyes twinkled. Where are we going? Nowhere, Sirius said, breezily. But you'll want to be properly attired for when your guests arrive. My guests. Sirius grinned. We tried to keep it Marauders only, but so many people wanted to celebrate with you, see. Remus couldn't tell if Sirius was being sarcastic, so he chose not to respond, instead pulling on a pair of trousers and a long-sleeved shirt. By the time he pulled on his robe, there was a sharp rap at the door. Come in. James boomed. Sirius saw Remus's wince and explained, it's okay, we put a silencing spell on the room. Remus frowned. So, whoever's on the other side of that door can't actually hear us. James clapped his hand to his forehead. Sirius groaned and pulled open the door. Peter stood outside, looking very pleased, surrounded by Lily, Marlene, and Mary. They were all clutching cards and packages. I didn't think girls were allowed in here. Remus said, startled. Mary tested it for us last week, nothing bad seems to happen, James explained. James was pulling out packages from under his bed. He ripped them open. It seemed they had raided Honeydukes again. Mountains of sweets were unearthed. Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, chocolate frogs, fizzing whizbees, Drooble's best blowing gum, sherbet lemons, cauldron. Cakes not to mention the haul Peter had brought up from the kitchen, ham sandwiches, egg mayonnaise, coronation chicken, cheese and pickle, packets of Remus's favorite flavor crisp salt and vinegar scotch eggs, sausage rolls, pork pies, cheese and pineapple sticks, plus some perfunctory fruit. Sirius laid blankets over the floorboards and scattered a few plush velvet cushions. Lupin, he said with a wide smile, welcome to your midnight feast. Happy birthday, Remus, the girls chanted. They all sat down, and Sirius turned on the wireless wizarding network he'd eventually opened his gifts from Andromeda, who had sent him a radio. He handed Remus a package. Open this first. It was long and cylindrical, very light and badly wrapped. You didn't have to get me anything, Remus mumbled, untwisting the ends. A poster. Lily furrowed her brow, watching as Remus unfurled the thick glossy paper. It was a huge picture of a Gryffindor lion, like the ones from the Quidditch pitch that Sirius had enchanted. Remus flinched as it roared in his face, and Sirius laughed. Wow. Remus smiled. Thanks. It's amazing. The girls had all got him packets of sweets and cakes, and Lily gave him a book on potions. He looked at her skeptically and she grinned. Can't keep giving Severus a reason to lord it over you. Please don't mention Snivellus's name on this occasion, James said. After that, Lily returned to her jam tart, and didn't talk much. James cleared his throat and looked at Remus. My present is coming later, he informed him. Remus had to admit he was enjoying himself. He had originally hoped James and Sirius would keep the celebrations to Marauders only, but the girls were making it fun. He knew them well now and enjoyed their company. Mary told jokes that made them all laugh, and Marlene's impressions of the faculty members had the Marauders in stitches. Peter even had to go and change his shirt after snorting pumpkin juice down himself. Starting to see why Remus has been abandoning us for you lot, James said at about 1:30, wiping tears of laughter from the corners of his eyes. Suddenly James made a sweeping gesture towards the dorm window. Mr. Black. Mr. Pettigrew. Shall we? By George. Sirius stood, abruptly. Is it time? Make haste. Peter cried, standing up too. The girls and Remus looked at each other. Sirius, Peter, and James went to the window, and flung it open. They were fidgeting from excitement, lack of sleep and too much sugar, and wouldn't stop snickering. Come on. Peter beckoned to the others. You'll want to see. James had produced a collection of bright red objects that looked like a cross between space rockets and sticks of dynamite. His arms were full, and so were Sirius's. Are those? Marlene scrunched her nose. Dr. Filibusters. But won't we wake the whole castle with those? Asked Lily. Get lost if you don't like it, Evans, Sirius snapped, and handed a few rockets to Peter. You promised not to spoil anything. Remus, you're in for a treat. Sirius winked. How many do you have? Mary stared at the rockets. 13, obviously. We won't let any of you get in trouble, James said, his glasses slipping down his nose as he struggled to keep control of his cargo. Don't worry. I'm not worried. Lily folded her arms. I enjoy Dr. Filibuster's fireworks. Remus didn't know why Sirius was being rude to her. Bang. Peter. They all leaned out the window to see the rocket Peter had dropped tumbling towards the ground in a torrent of green and gold sparks. Sorry, Peter looked sheepish. Sirius laughed. No, great work, now we've started we may as well continue, He hurled his own fireworks into the night air. James and Peter followed suit. Soon they all stared in awe at the spectacular display lighting up the starry sky. The fireworks went on much longer than Muggle ones, some bursting 10 or 12 times before fizzling out. They changed colors from red to green to purple to orange, twisting and curling in various shapes, eventually spelling, Happy 13th Birthday REMU without the S. Sirius sighed, irritated. Knew it was too many letters. As well as being dazzling, the fireworks were satisfactorily noisy. So much so that Remus could already hear the other Gryffindors in the tower opening their windows to see whether the castle was under attack. Inevitably, someone began hammering at their door. McGonagall's shrill voice could be heard on the other side. Potter. Black. Don't think I don't know you are behind this. Open this door. James grimaced. Get under the beds, he told the girls. Once they had been reprimanded, promised 2 months of detention and letters home to all their parents, McGonagall, a sight to behold in her red tartan nightie, finally left. Marlene, Mary, and Lily reluctantly returned to their own dormitory. It was 2 o'clock in the morning by then, and the boys decided it was finally time for bed. Happy birthday, Remus, Peter said again before getting into bed, followed by a loud yawn. Remus' cheeks ached as he smiled in the dark. Yeah, Sirius yawned too. Happy birthday, Remu. Second year, what's in a name? Monday 19H March 1973. I have a spot of good news, Madame Pomfret told Remus. I didn't want to mention it in case we couldn't sort things out in time, but you'll be seeing me over the summer. Your parents have permitted me to apparate onto your property at dawn following both full moons this summer. She smiled widely, and he smiled back weakly. Great. He croaked. His arms and legs felt heavy as lead, and he could barely raise his head to drink the potion she was offering him. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and Remus had missed his lessons. He'd been asleep most of the day. Sleep was still the only remedy that seemed to really work. I told Dumbledore I would do it with or without his permission. I couldn't live with myself if you arrived here in September in the same state you did last year. I was thinking of staying at someone's house this summer, Remus tried. My friend James. I'm sorry, dear, Madame Pomfret shook her head, it's just not safe enough. The Potters did get in touch, but we need to preserve your anonymity for as long as we can. I know it isn't much fun for you, but it's better if you stay with your parents. Remus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It would only be 2 months, and the summer was still far away. Stay positive, stay positive. A clattering noise at the end of the ward jerked Remus out of his thoughts. Madame Pomfret frowned and turned to look around Remus's bed curtain. Mr. Pettigrew. What do you think you are doing? Sorry Madame Pomfret. We were just. Pick those bedpans up right now and put them back in the cupboard. And you can wipe that smirk off your face, Mr. Black, give him a hand. Hi, Remu, James peeked around the curtain. Sorry about all the noise. Remus tried to sit up. It's okay. Lie down. Madame Pomfret told him. You've had 3 broken bones, you silly boy. I'm feeling much better. Crash. Mr. Pettigrew, what did I say? Madame Pomfret disappeared, looking very cross. James slumped into the chair beside Remus' bed. Ready to go, he asked, casually. Remus could always count on James not to treat him like an invalid. If she'll let me. Remus nodded to the curtain. Pomfret had vanished behind. How was the match? Smashed it, James said enthusiastically, dropping the snitch into Remus's lap. He ran his fingers through his hair as if to regain that feeling of having just touched down. Made one of the Ravenclaw beaters cry. How nice. How was, your night? Fine, Remus replied, twisting his mouth. They didn't often talk about the full moons and Remus was glad about that. 3 broken bones, did she say? Yeah. All fixed now though, she's amazing, only takes 1 spell. I used to wear plaster casts for weeks and weeks. REMU. Sirius whipped open the curtain. You're alive. I was convinced she was trying to cover something up, the old bat wouldn't let us come over. Anyway, glad we finally got you a nickname since you said you've been wanting one. Peter appeared, looking sullen with his hands in his pockets. No I didn't. Remus frowned. When did I ever say TH? Last year, Sirius said quickly. Remember last year when we said we were going to put nicknames on our map? You've got a memory like an elephant, Remus said. Anyway, he lowered his voice, in case Madame Pomfret was lurking nearby. The whole point of having a nickname was so no one knew who wrote the map. I don't think Remu is going to fool anyone. He's got a point, there, James said. As much fun as it's been. Fair enough, Sirius heaved a sigh. But can we call you Remu until we come up with something better? Without waiting for an answer, he asked. So are we getting out of here or shall we settle down for a rousing game of Snap? I'm keeping Mr. Lupin in for observation overnight. Madame Pomfret returned. Not again. Remus protested. I'm not being deliberately unkind, Remus, the nurse sighed. This is for your health. We'll look after him, James said, earnestly, standing up. Remus waited to see if that worked. James was good with grown UPS, and had even been known to soften McGonagall once or twice, though that might have been more to do with his Quidditch skills. Madame Pomfret was unmoved. I'm sorry, Mr. Potter, but no. We'll stay here then, Peter said. Yeah. Sirius and James said, as one. You'll miss dinner, Remus said. Well, we can arrange something just this once, Madame Pomfret said. All right, boys, but you're to keep quiet. And get on with your homework. I'll not have you using Mr. Lupin here as an excuse for not handing anything in. With a wave of her wand 3 chairs appeared out of thin air, complete with a long pine wood desk, and inkwells for their quills. Remus opened his mouth to speak, but Madame Pomfret read his mind. And no, Remus, no homework for you. Just rest. Remus shut his mouth and lay back down. How was he supposed to keep ahead of Sirius and James if he could one D&T study? Can I read my book? He asked. As long as it doesn't strain your eyes. She left, and the other 3 boys dutifully pulled out their homework and began scribbling. Remus craned his neck to try and see what they were working on. He was up to date with his, but had been doing extra reading and charms in an attempt to defeat Lily in their upcoming exams. James covered his work with his sleeve. No looking, Remu, you just rest. Call me Looney instead. Remus groaned. Anything but Remu. But it suits you, Sirius said, over his quill. Remu. Stop it or I'll bite you. Re-email you. Re-emu. Peter joined in, and all three boys chanted it, trying not to be heard. I have the weirdest name out of all of us. Remus covered his face with the book he was reading. It wasn't fair. James Potter was so reassuringly ordinary, Peter Pettigrew was perfectly respectable, and Sirius Black was the coolest name ever. You might as well call me anything you like, I don't know what could be worse. Looney Renew. James suggested, helpfully. Remoni. Sirius asked. Remoni. He snorted, collapsing onto his desk, shoulders shaking. Looney is actually quite good. Remus thought about it, rolling the name around in his head. It sounded like Looney, but it was nowhere near as horrible. I don't hate it, he said, finally. I love it, James said. Looney suits you. Won't people, you know, catch on? He worried, chewing his lip. Sirius waved a hand. We'll tell them it's after something else. Some hours later, after Madame Pomfrey had brought them all dinner, James had left for Quidditch practice and Peter for detention. Sirius had given up on his homework long ago and was instead attempting to perfect a tentacle arms jinx on himself. Remus was ignoring this. He knew Sirius was pronouncing the incantation with the emphasis in the wrong place, but he wasn't going to tell him, because he wasn't sure exactly why Sirius wanted a tentacle arm so badly, and it couldn't be for any good reason. Eventually, bored, Sirius leaned back on his chair, and propped his feet on Remus's bed. What you reading, anyway? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Remus supplied, turning the page. What's it about? It's yours, he said, surprised. I got it off your shelf. Oh, one of the Muggle ones? I haven't read many of them, to be honest. They were my Uncle Alphard's. What's it about? A man called Gilgamesh. He was a king, but not a good one. He wasn't fully human. He was 2/3 god, so he was stronger than everyone else and his people were frightened of him. So, his people prayed and the gods sent another man who was part animal to help control Gilgamesh. So this beast man killed Gilgamesh. No. They fought each other for a really long time, but Gilgamesh still won. He didn't kill Enkidu, though. He recognized that they were equals. They became best friends and had all these adventures together, fighting monsters and stuff. I want to know more about the beast man. Enkidu was master of the animals, and he was happy living in the wild, but then after he was sent to control Gilgamesh he couldn't ever go back to nature. So he never really belonged. But he had his friend, right? Yeah, but, well I don't want to spoil the ending for you. It's okay, I hardly ever read Muggle stuff. You're missing so much. Remus said. Well, okay then. Enkidu dies. What? Yeah, it's sort of sad, he was my favorite character. But why? To teach Gilgamesh about death, I think. Before Enkidu he was too arrogant to believe anything could hurt him. But after he loses him, he realizes that he's not the master of everything. No one can control death. That's a really depressing thought, Mooney, Sirius said. Remus shrugged. It had all seemed pretty straightforward to him. Second year, Dumstrang. Friday, April 20th, 1972. Remus really ought to be catching up on potions, but Lily had offered to help him over the weekend and he'd been revising Transfiguration all day. It had taken that long to turn an old top hat into a rabbit and back again. Remus finally found the shelf he was looking for, the Wizard's Guide to Wizard Schooling 1700-1950. He hoped that would be recent enough. It was huge, and he had to get up on a stepladder to reach it. Remus just about had purchase on the dusty old leather cover, and was about to pull it down, when another hand reached up and grabbed his wrist. Remus yanked his hand back and almost toppled off the stool, coming face to face with Narcissa Black. Ugh, it's you, she said, distastefully. She was a head taller than him, so they came about level as long as he kept his balance. She didn't release his hand. Give me that. No, I had it first. He tried to pull away, but she had an iron grip. Go away, little boy. What could you possibly want this for? She gave him a hard shove and he toppled backwards, landing painfully on his backside. Narcissa smiled down at him, holding the heavy tome victoriously. Remus scowled. What do you want it for? That's none of your business, she said breezily. Wait. Remus scrambled to his feet, trying to keep his voice down so Madame Pants didn't throw him out again. Oi, Narcissa, wait. He grabbed her cloak. She spun around with her wand raised. Remus grabbed his own wand. They stood like statues for a few moments. He knew she had cursed James and Sirius on several occasions, and that the whole Black family knew all sorts of dark magic. I just wanted to know, he said, carefully, choosing his words. If it was anything to do with Sirius. His getting transferred to a different school. Narcissa lowered her wand, slowly. She regarded him with suspicious interest. Yes, little boy, that's exactly what I need it for. You don't think I'm looking forward to leaving Hogwarts just because that little brat made our family decide to be more strict? I just have to make it to the end of the year, but one wrong move and both of us will have to leave early. Remus gaped. It hadn't occurred to him that the Blacks might be making Narcissa go to Dumstrang too. Narcissa sighed impatiently. Well, I'm not expecting my brat of a cousin to come up with a solution anytime soon, so here I am. She didn't sound angry anymore, just bitter. Now that he was closer to her, Remus could see she had dark rings under her eyes. I want to find a solution, he said, meeting her gaze. He wished he wasn't shorter than her. I've been trying, anyway. Ha, Narcissa laughed humorously. And what have you come up with, little second year? She tapped her black patent heel on the dark floorboards. Well, Remus swallowed. Not much. Narcissa sighed. Her eyes bright with angry tears, which she wiped away quickly. I'm 17 in October. I'm staying here with Lucius and that's all there is to it. I'm not going to Scandinavia to study at Dumstrang. Narcissa composed herself. I shan't curse you, she said, magnanimously. But I'm warning you, I've had just about enough of people meddling with my future. So just keep your nose out from now on. With that, she turned and left, leaving Remus with plenty to think about. Monday, April 30th, 1973. Mooney, what are all these books for? James asked, as he tripped over a pile Remus had stacked near the dorm entrance. They were useless and he'd been planning to take them back that afternoon. Just some research, he replied, not looking up. Where have you been? Plotting. Sirius followed James, stepping over the scattered books his friend was trying to clear up. Plotting? Map or mischief? Bit of both, Sirius said, throwing himself onto Remus's bed. He picked up a book. Wizard Schools Through the Centuries. He laughed. Are you planning to transfer to Bose Batons, Mooney? I'm trying to help you. He kicked Sirius. Someone's got to get you out of this stupid mess. Sirius scowled. I'm doing everything I can. What are you doing? Haven't I had more detentions than anyone else this year? I must get a howler a week. And my lines, don't forget my lines at the Quidditch match. Remus was dumbfounded. How is any of that supposed to help? I'm proving that I'm not the sacred pure blood type. No offense, mate, James put in, coming to sit on the bed with them. But I think that's exactly the reason they're sending you to Dumstrang in the first place. Exactly, Remus said. You're the heir. And the Black family has to keep their reputation no matter the cost. How do you know? Sirius looked uncomfortable. I've been reading. Remus gestured at the books. There's loads of stuff in the library on your family. One of the oldest wizarding houses in Britain, traced all the way back to the Middle Ages, where the family seat was in Inverness in Scotland. I know all of this. Sirius waved a hand. Yeah, but did you know that you aren't the first Black who didn't want to be a dark wizard? Well, obviously Andromeda. Not just her, Lyra Black defied the family's wishes in 1901 to become a professor of Muggle studies, and Delphinus Black was supposed to attend Durmstrang in 1750 but left it for Hogwarts where he had half-blood friends. It just goes to show that you can get out of this sort of thing. Only problem is, I can't find any good details on how they all got away with rebelling. Don't bother, Sirius said, gloomily. Even if you did find out, none of them had my mother to contend with. You know what she's like. She's probably going to make me take the unbreakable vow. She wow 1 DNT. James was aghast. She'd do anything, Sirius said. Remus chewed his lip. The unbreakable vow was dark magic. From what he'd already read about the House of Black, he knew that the library's restricted section would probably have to be his next stop. He'd have to borrow James's cloak for that, and go at night. Knowing that Narcissa was also working on the problem was strangely comforting. Remus knew from her curses that she must be a very accomplished and clever witch, and there was no doubt in his mind that she usually got her way. I'm staying here with Lucius and that's all there is to it. Remus remembered Flitwick telling them that natural, everyday, human love was one of the most powerful types of magic. While Remus didn't personally feel that anything about Lucius and Narcissa was that natural or noble, exactly, he knew that it was more powerful than family honor. It had to be.